Chapter 31. Chapter 31. Welcome to the X-Men. Harry didn't bother sleeping that night since his location was known by non-friendlies and getting caught napping would just be too embarrassing for him. Instead, he spent the night chilling with Goose on his lap and going over the information he had on the X-Men and his own future plans. He had three main goals for this venture. First priority was to remove the blocks on the Phoenix's avatar, the one called Jean. He did promise the Phoenix Force he'd do it after all. He already spent a large amount of time inside his own mind testing how blocking and unblocking mental abilities with Shinix would work, and he wasn't going to do anything until he had a safe way to remove them. It was obvious who was responsible for the blocks, and he figured the man probably had reasons he thought were good, but Harry doubted Xavier would remove those blocks on Harry's word, even if he gave the man his memory of the conversation with the Phoenix. The second goal was to get practical experience in a few of the branches he was working with. Harry was skilled in engineering and programming but had little experience in chemistry and biology. One of the listed professors at the institute was Dr. Hank McCoy, and he was an expert geneticist Harry was eager to work with. Harry's final goal was to see if he could figure out other means of using his mutant power. He was hoping for an ability like that of Mystique's, which was similar to a wizard talent called Metamorphmagus. However, Harry had a feeling simply looking like someone else was not the limit of his mutant power. Thankfully, the Phoenix Force had given him a clue. She said that his mind wasn't strong enough, so Harry had been practicing advanced visualization techniques and mental landscaping. Harry had a very large imagination from all the things he'd seen and read, and even from the games he played, so he put a lot of time and effort into creating different mental landscapes with as much detail as possible as a mental exercise. Eventually morning came and Harry collected the various relics and traps scattered about his room. Even if Mystique and Pietro had attacked him last night, he could have used them to fight back without giving himself away, but thankfully it wasn't needed. That did mean that he broke the TV in the room without reason, but it was a worthwhile sacrifice for peace of mind. Harry set $300 in cash beneath the TV with a note saying he accidentally broke it, and set the keycard for the room on the bed before operating out. The grounds of Xavier's Institute of Gifted Youngsters were completely enclosed by a 10-foot steel fence leading up to an older-style stone entryway with a brass plaque showing the school's name. It looked quaint from the exterior, but that was only if you didn't pay attention to the overlapping field of vision of the security cameras and motion sensors hidden in plain sight around the premises. Harry even spotted several places that appeared to be hidden panels, and he wouldn't be surprised if turrets popped out of them to welcome uninvited guests. The gate to the institute was opened and Harry casually walked in with a suitcase, his backpack, and his pet carrier. The moment Harry approached, he felt the phoenix flames within him reach out, which wasn't surprising. He wondered if the one at the other end felt the same thing. Further up the path, Harry saw a basketball court to his left with several kids playing around. What was funny was that one team was composed of various kids while the other team seemed to be a set of 5 of the same kid. A few of the spectators of the game saw him walking up the road with a suitcase and pet carrier and put 2 and 2 together, so a couple of them smiled and waved at Harry, who smiled and waved back. This place certainly did have a warm atmosphere. Harry reached the entrance, but before he could knock, the door opened and a familiar green-eyed redhead was staring him down. Harry smiled and said, "Hello again. I'm here for a tour. Would I be lucky enough to have you as a tour guide?" The redhead blushed for a moment and said, "No, I was just coming to check on something." Harry said, "Well, if that something is me, you may check it out as long as you wish." She tried to frown in disapproval but was fighting a smirk to do so and said, "You're a pervert, aren't you?" Harry answered back, "If you mean a bearer of uncommon inclinations, I am not, or at least I don't think I am. If you mean open about who I am in general, then perhaps. Besides, having uncommon inclinations isn't something to look down on. Aren't you already inside my head, peeping on my thoughts?" Harry felt the telepathy's presence, but it was different compared to Xavier's. It was not that she was actually intruding, it was more that her mind didn't seem to just fit inside her own head and ended up entering the minds of those within a specific range. She blushed once more and said, "I'm sorry. I'm still having difficulties controlling my powers." Harry smiled back and said, "Don't worry. You can enter my mind anytime you wish to look around, but don't try to read any of the books without asking me for a library card. I happen to know a thing or two about the mind, and if you want someone to bounce ideas off or a different perspective, I'd be happy to lend an ear and maybe a nose." She rolled her eyes and said with a smirk, "I thought you hadn't decided to join yet. Well, I've already found an excellent reason to stick around, so there isn't much of a point to pretending otherwise." The telepath narrowed her eyes and said, "Is that so?" Harry thought to himself, "Yes, I found out how much of a genius Dr. Hank McCoy was and that he teaches here." She blinked at that thought and said, "Oh." Harry smiled and said, "What did you think I was thinking of?" She sighed and said, "Never mind. I'm Jean Grey, by the way." Harry held out a hand and said, "Harry Potter, again, it's a pleasure." She shook it and said, "I'll take you to the professor. He's expecting you." Several other kids of various ages were walking around, which was something that did somewhat surprise Harry. This was a boarding school, but this was also summer, meaning no classes, which meant most kids would be back home with their parents. Jean didn't seem to be able to turn off her telepathic eavesdropping and said, "A lot of kids don't come from families that are accepting of mutants. My own parents, for example, are the epitome of normal and are uncomfortable with me around, so I stay here full time." Harry knew she was sharing stuff about herself to make up for the fact that she was unable to stop herself from violating his privacy, even though he already said it was fine. Harry said back, Then it sounds like you dodged a bullet. I have nothing against those comfortable with living black and white lives, but personally I prefer a little color. He also thought to himself, he wished he inherited his mother's vibrant red head instead of his father's messy black hair. Your hair is fine, Harry, Jean easily said. She wasn't sure what to think about Harry. When someone knew they were with a telepath, their minds often became darker and their fears came to the surface, which made them awkward to be around. She wasn't used to someone so at ease with others invading their mind and treating it just like a normal conversation. That and the fact that somehow, when she purposely entered Harry's mind, the sound of others' thoughts went away. There was something about his mind that felt warm and comfortable to her. She was even tempted to ask for a library card. Harry said aloud, if that is your opinion on the matter, then I am greatly relieved. If you thought I was boring, I might have ended up dyeing my hair blue or something. Jean tried to imagine Harry with blue hair and started giggling. Harry thought if it was funny to her, at least that meant he would have successfully gotten her attention, which would have made it worth it. They arrived at an office and Jean knocked twice before a moment of silence passed and she opened the door. Xavier, Logan, and Ms. Monroe were together once more having a discussion. Xavier said, welcome Harry. And thank you Jean for escorting Harry to my office. She said, you're welcome Professor. See you later Harry. She left and moments later her presence was gone from Harry's mind. Xavier waited for the door to close and said, now Harry, before the tour, I'd like to inform you a little about us and the beginnings of the X-Men. Harry pulled up a seat and patiently waited. He did love a good story. The X-Men were founded 25 years ago and Logan and Aurora were founding members. At the time there was a powerful Shinik entity who called itself the Shadow King, and he was using his vast influence to gather mutants and start a war in the Middle East that would encompass the whole of the world. With the help of an old friend of mine, I was able to gather an opposing team and lead them against the Shadow King's forces and defeat them. With the help of others I was able to beat back the Shadow King on the astral plane and win the day, though the cost of victory was not low. Many of those who fought with me agreed to join me here to open a school as both a home for mutants and a place they could safely train the use of their powers. The X-Men are dispatched to areas where mutants are causing conflict to rescue those who need it and facilitate peace if possible. Harry was rather surprised the Shadow King had been beaten, as a few of the books of Camartage had mentioned him. He was very, very old. Usually the Sorcerer Supreme would handle him, but it seemed rather than make himself powerful, he hid under the radar and gathered a powerful force on the mortal plane to do his bidding. Keeping himself weak enough to avoid detection by the Ancient One worked out, but he ended up losing to a mortal telepath because of it. Still, it was very impressive. Harry brought up the main point which came to mind, you're not exactly on the telly a lot for all the things you say you do. Xavier nodded and said, we do try to keep a low profile, and there are those in the government aware of us who do not restrict our cause or impede our actions, as the government itself cannot afford to take one side or the other on the mutant issue. Harry understood. He certainly knew a thing or two about the value of maintaining a low profile until the time was right. He said, if you're asking me to join the X-Men permanently, I cannot give you an answer, as my life may take me in other directions further down the line. However, if I decide to attend your institute, I would love to go if invited to any party your X-Men decide to throw. Logan smiled a bit and Aurora rolled her eyes behind a small smirk. Xavier nodded and said, I'm glad to hear you'll give it some thought. Now, on to the tour. Xavier's automated wheelchair moved quite fast and Harry followed, with Wolverine next to the professor and Storm following behind them. Harry approved of this. Harry was, for all intents and purposes, an unknown. Outwardly they were escorting him, but it was more likely that they were acting as guard to subdue him should he try anything or perhaps go out of control. A weather sorceress together with an unstoppable metal-clawed warrior could cover most ranges, and even if Harry went all out, fighting them would be difficult. Especially if Charles tried to attack his mind. Harry's defenses and attacks were probably good, but he still wasn't interested in matching them against someone the Ancient Ones considered perhaps the most powerful telepath I've ever encountered. The only reason Harry could even sense someone on that level in his mind was because he had placed several magic triggers in his mind which were invisible to anyone trying to sense them. Those triggers would tag the intruder, which was why Harry recognized Xavier as the Peeper when he first saw him. Those triggers however weren't foolproof though, so Harry had several other fail-safes to work with. Xavier first showed Harry the rooms. The mansion had over 30 rooms and only 50 students, but during the summer many had their own room, while during the school year students usually had roommates. Harry sensed the space in front of him cave in slightly and paused. He was a fast thinker, but pausing was really too good of a cheat not to abuse, so when something unexpected happened he would often pause to determine his options. The indented space was closer to Harry than it was to Logan, so the clawed warrior wouldn't be able to attack it faster than Harry could. There was also the chance it was a prank. Of course, if that was the case, Harry had to respond in kind. Harry unpaused and a blue-skinned teenager with a tail entered the space from the indentation. Harry paused again so he could get a good look at the new arrival, and the smile of mischief on his face told Harry everything he needed to know. Harry unpaused and moved his hand to flick the forehead of the teleporter just as he landed. The smell of brimstone that came from the smoke which followed the mutant through his indentation in space, which told Harry a great deal about his method of travel. The new arrival recoiled at the finger flick and said with a German accent, "Ow, why'd you do that?" Harry deadpanned, "It's a reflex. Happens every time a teleporter invades my personal space." Xavier turned back and smiled, "Ah, I see you've met Kurt. Kurt, this is Harry Potter." We're showing him around today in the hopes he may join us. Kurt gave a fake thoughtful expression and said, I don't know, Professor. Such strange reflexes are sure to cause trouble. Harry put Goose down, took off his backpack, zipped it open and pulled out a smoky quartz. Harry then cast a lumos inside it and made it vanish into his inventory. Once the act was finished he said, flexibility is important, you should be able to handle every situation that gets thrown at you. The lights in the hallway flickered just a bit as the blue demon's vivid blue hair grew to his hips in length and then turned vibrant pink. Harry was cheating a bit since that was 2 spells, but he doubted there was anyone there who'd be able to call him out on it. Thankfully the spell had only affected the electricity a little and did nothing else to the hall. The spell only took a second to reach full effect and Kurt grabbed his now long, pink hair through his 3-fingered gloves and stared at it in absolute horror. His hands were trembling and a moment later he fell to his knees and theatrically cried out, "No!" Harry immediately liked him. Several doors opened in the hallway and they all saw the now pink-haired demon on his knees before a newcomer. Kurt got up and took Harry's shoulders and said, "Please. You must change it back. Pink is not my color." He emphasized the last sentence most of all. Harry shook his head and said, "It will wear off on its own later. I don't know when though. Probably before summer ends. Now, would you like anything else to become pink or was there something else I could help you with?" Kurt recoiled back a step and vanished away in another burst of brimstone smoke. Logan was the first to respond. "How'd you flick him so fast?" Harry said, "One aspect of my abilities lets me sense energy. I've honed my senses for many years and can sense the change of space prior to a teleporter's arrival." Logan grunted, "That explains how you dodged Scott's optics last night." Xavier asked, "Are you experienced with teleporters?" Harry answered, "Very. I even learned how to do it myself when accessing the right kind of energy." The professor said, "Fascinating. I'd like to hear more on the subject when you have the time." After the dorms were the classrooms and introductions on various subjects taught during the school year. Next came the kitchen, the library, the lounge, and the home theater. Harry wondered if they would be willing to watch another universe's version of Star Wars that had different actors playing the same parts. He'd ask them later. Next they headed underground. According to Xavier, his great-grandfather had a massive fallout shelter constructed beneath the property and it had been remodeled over the course of the last few decades. The first room they entered had a gorilla-sized man completely covered in blue fur wearing glasses and an unbuttoned lab coat with nothing but black shorts and a yellow belt beneath it. Harry shouted, "Oh my god." And after a pause for dramatic effect continued, "Is that oscillating frequency transmission electron spectrometer?" Harry then walked over to the massive piece of equipment in the lab, completely ignoring the giant blue glasses-wearing monster currently staring at him. From behind him Harry heard in a dignified voice, "Why yes it is. How did you recognize it?" The idea of the machine itself was postulated in a science magazine a few months back but the actual construction was easier said than done. It was a very useful machine despite the fact that one could technically do the same thing it could do using 6 other machines which were cheaper to make. However, doing several processes separately couldn't compare to the precision achieved by a single machine doing them all. Harry answered, "I figured I could build one myself if I overclocked a good enough processor, but even the minimum requirement for that kind of tech can only be found in restricted military-grade equipment and I don't have any facilities to make something better at the moment." Xavier rolled in watching Harry examine the theoretical machine like a child looking at a shiny toy. He said, "It seems you already have a rather strong foundation in science, Harry. This was built by Forge, a man who I'm certain you'll enjoy meeting." He then gestured to the monster and said, "And this is Dr. Hank McCoy, our resident geneticist." Harry stopped playing around and went over to Doctor and said, "I'm Harry Potter. It is a pleasure to meet you, Dr. McCoy." Harry took a few more looks around the lab and recognized all but a few of the machines. He doubted Area 51 had toys this nice and it certainly brought up the quality of this place by another level in his mind. Dr. McCoy saw a complete and utter lack of fear in Harry's eyes at his appearance despite his earlier jest. He smiled down at Harry and said, "It is a pleasure to meet you too, Mr. Potter. Perhaps you can assist me with a few projects I have in the future. Another pair of hands that knows how to use this equipment would be greatly appreciated." Harry smiled and said, "I'd love to help. I may even have a project or two in mind I'd like a second opinion on as well." "Is that right? Well, I'd certainly love to take a look at any project someone with a mind such as yours has come up with. Perhaps later this week." "Thank you, I'll organize and submit them to you later." Harry walked back over to his escorts who were still a bit dazed. They knew how intelligent Dr. McCoy was. They also knew that several of the more clever students had tried to be his assistant at one point or another but most were unable to continue working with the high standard of equipment or the precision needed for lab work. There was something about the situation that worried them, but they couldn't quite place it. The end of the hall had a set of stairs going up past a sliding steel door. At the end of the stairs was a lanky man wearing goggles sitting in front of what appeared to be a control system. There was a large pane of glass on the wall behind the control system and once he got closer Harry could see there was a massive room beyond it where 6 teens wearing different uniforms were running around facing mechanical obstacles. Xavier, whose chair somehow had no issue with stairs, said, "Harry, this is Forge. And this is the danger room," he continued, motioning to the room beyond the glass. The man himself seemed to be immersed in something and Harry didn't want to bug him. Logan said, "This is where most of our combat exercises and sparring happens. Wanna join them?" Harry said, "Maybe later." I absorbed a few pounds of pure steel before our fight yesterday and the effect of it already wore off. I'll have a big crate of materials delivered by the end of the week so I can take part in the training. Ororo said with a smirk, so that means you're interested in joining. Absolutely. Did the professor tell you about my power? Logan smirked and said, you absorb metal for a boost in strength and gems for magic tricks. Close enough. I can also absorb food before a fight to grant limited healing and books. If I absorb a book it is gone forever, but I will have the content memorized for a few days before that effect wears off. If I go over it enough I can retain it though, which is why I'm a lot smarter than those of my age. I bought pretty much every college and university textbook around. The professor set his hands together pensively and said, if that is the case, practical experience is more valuable than class work. Once we've assessed your comprehension level, I'll arrange for you to spend time with Dr. McCoy and Forge to gain experience. Both of them are the best in their fields. Thank you, Professor. The fact that he was going to make sure Harry was taught at the proper level made Harry respect him as a teacher, despite the man's obvious flaws. Ping. Quest complete, get drafted with style. Reward, multiplayer unlocked. Harry thought to himself, so that's a thing. Xavier gave Harry a key to an empty room where he would be staying and he headed over to unpack his things. What surprised him however was that the door wasn't locked. Harry entered the room and saw two beds, one of which already had a teen laying down, reading from a book. He looked about 2 years older than Harry with black hair styled back and said, hi, guess you're my new roommate. Harry frowned and said, maybe? I was told this room was empty. The teen sighed and said, not surprising. Hey, there is a piece of paper on the nightstand with a pencil. Write down what I look like on it and you'll figure out what's going on. Harry set Goose down and did as instructed. He wrote the description of the teen on the paper and said, okay, now what? Now don't look at me for 2 minutes. He went back to reading his book. Harry had no idea what that meant, so he set the paper down and let Goose out before he started unpacking his things. Several alarms in Harry's mind suddenly went off. Knowledge he had gained was being erased. He isolated the knowledge and determined it to be his most recent memory. Harry turned to face his roommate who noticed it and said, you remember me? Harry paused and went back into his mind to look through what just happened. Covered obliviations were a real threat in the magical world, so Harry had a few defenses and alarms against memory and knowledge removal or modification, even though it never worked on him before. He determined that the quality of the memory of his new roommate was erasing itself and would be gone in a few hours. The only reason it would even take that long was because of the quality of Harry's mind. A normal mind would probably forget this person's existence moments after being seen, if they could even perceive him at all. Harry unpaused and said, mostly. Though my memory of you seems to erase itself when I'm not looking at you. Is that your power? Indeed it is, my impressive friend, indeed it is. You can call me Forget-Me-Not. My power is imperceptibility. Most completely forget I exist the moment they look away. Even if they remind themselves with a note, they still forget me moments after reading it. The professor said he put some mental timers inside his own head to remind himself I exist, but I guess I can't be too surprised they forgot me too. Harry couldn't hide the horror on his face. The teen noticed this and said, don't feel sad for me, dude. You'll forget me too every time you leave here. Now Harry almost wanted to cry. That wasn't something a person should just accept. It was the words of someone who had his hopes crushed too many times to ever get them back up. He wasn't going to let things stay that way, that was for sure. Harry paused again and went over the possibilities. After unpausing, Harry looked up and said, can I have one of your hairs? Sure. He plucked a hair and handed it to Harry, who set it inside his inventory and turned around. Harry's inventory was a part of him and also time-locked. He innately knew every aspect of every item in his inventory, and he knew that the item he just placed in there was the hair of the guy sitting in the chair behind him. Harry focused on the memory and determined that it wasn't degrading. Harry wasn't sure which aspect of that idea caused it to work, but it did in fact work. After 2 minutes Harry turned around and said with a smile, okay, it worked. I'm now immune to your power. My name is Harry Potter. Forget-Me-Not stared at him and weakly said, what? Chapter 32, Chapter 32 Getting Comfortable. It took about 2 hours of tests for Forget-Me-Not to believe Harry would not in fact forget him. Harry then turned to Goose and said, hey Goose, do the things inside your pocket dimension get absorbed, digested, or get stored? Forget-Me-Not said, wait, are you talking to the cat? Goose conveyed back through their familiar link, just give me a lock of his hair. It will do for your purposes, and I'm not comfortable meeting someone for the first time over and over. Harry looked over to Forget-Me-Not and said, Goose can do something similar with a pinch of your hair. Give me a second, I'll get some scissors. Forget-Me-Not said, at this rate won't I go bald? Harry got a pair of scissors from his backpack and went over to snip a band of hair from his scalp while saying, if one day you have a girlfriend who complains about you being bald, you can say something to me then. Harry then said, you may want to turn around for this. It isn't for those with a weak stomach. I think I'll be fine, he responded back. I don't know how watching a cat eat my dash. Goose's mouth ejected out a mass of purple flesh covered in serrated teeth and wiggling tentacles. From within the void at the center of the flesh came a snake-like appendage of a tongue with its own set of razor-sharp teeth that approached Harry's hand and quicker than a snake strike grabbed the lock of hair before retreating in the pit, followed shortly after by the remaining mass of indescribable flesh that vanished into the Flurkin's mouth. After a moment of silence Forget-Me-Not said, Harry, Yes, forget-me-not. What is that? That's Goose, my familiar. Don't worry, I've already asked her not to eat anyone. Is that supposed to make me feel better? Harry considered it and said, I'm not sure. At least this way, she won't forget you either. I'm not sure how to feel about that. Harry and Forget-Me-Not spent another hour chatting before they both headed out for lunch. So far they were becoming good friends, though Forget-Me-Not wouldn't give Harry his original name, claiming everyone who knew it has forgotten it, so that person was already gone. Harry didn't say it out loud to get his new friend's hopes up, but he was going to work on a way of allowing others to remember him. Harry and Goose both had internal pocket dimensions, though Goose never told Harry how her own worked and Harry had refrained from asking out of politeness. He couldn't expect others to have the same ability, but at least it proved that Forget-Me-Not's power had a loophole, and if there was one, they may be more. Although Harry could have skipped lunch or taken something out from his inventory, he didn't want to turtle up on his first day. According to Forget-Me-Not, there was a rotating roster of kids or adults who would stay in the kitchen for 2 hours cooking during lunch and dinner time. Today's lunch would be served by Jubilee, which meant the soda would soon run out to get the taste out of the recipients' mouths. He said she once set her cereal on fire. The kitchen had 3 kids at the table, with a petite girl of Asian descent wearing a yellow long coat standing over a stove making what Harry smelled to be burnt grilled cheese sandwiches. Harry sat down one seat away from the others and Forget-Me-Not sat down on his opposite side. The one called Jubilee turned around and said, Hiya, will you be having the ribeye, the fresh Italian pasta, the baby lamb, or the lobster? Forget-Me-Not said, I'll be having the rotisserie chicken with mashed potatoes. He pointed at Harry and said, today's his first day here, so he'll be having the special of the day. Jubilee turned back around and said, 2 specials of the day, coming up. The trio sitting at the table looked over from their discussion and one said, You're new here? Hi, I'm Danielle. That's Ronnie and Brian. The others she pointed at smiled back at Harry, who said, Hello and nice to meet you, I'm Harry. The redhead named Ronnie asked, You're British? Harry recognized her clearly Scottish accent that reminded him a little of Professor McGonagall. He answered back, That's right. I was born in Godric's Hollow near Suffolk. She nodded, born in Ullapool myself. In the Highlands? I have a house up there. I actually went to a boarding school in a big old castle built at the base of the Highlands Mountains. Had to leave though because people kept trying to kill me. Ronnie looked shocked, sad, and a little understanding about that last part. Danielle, who seemed to be of Native American descent, said, A good reason to leave. So what's your power? Harry answered, I can turn into an owl. Ronnie and Danielle both said, Really? Harry shrugged, Maybe, I don't know. I probably could. Brian said, Be careful there, Harry. These 2 love animals and toying with them like that will end badly. Harry pulled a piece of smoky quartz out of his pocket and said, In that case, I can grant 1 wish, but only 1 wish, and then I can never grant wishes again. What would you 2 wish for? Brian quickly said, I wish for actual food that will stay in my stomach. Both girls turned to glare at him and Harry paused. He was half joking, but since that was the request, he might as well go with it. Plus, this was an opportunity to empty some of the food in his inventory. Harry picked up the smoky quartz and said, Your wish is my command. He cast a lumos inside the gem to make it glow, which attracted everyone's attention, even Jubilee, who was letting the sandwich on the stove burn for way too long. Harry then cast a wordless Immobilis Maxima on the room, which had everyone frozen in place. Every electronic in the room would fry, but wishes had consequences, so he'd blame Brain for it. First he used telekinesis to lift the burning bread off the pan so it wouldn't catch fire while he was working. Next, while everyone was frozen, he took out dish after dish from his inventory and set it on the table. Harry couldn't put food or water into his inventory unless it was on a plate or in a container, so he had hundreds of plates, cups, bowls, and ECT in his inventory. Each plate even had the proper utensils for the dish. This did make Harry feel a little bad for whoever would be doing the dishes today. When the table had no more room for dishes, Harry cast some preservation and warming charms that would last until the dishes were picked up, and he sat back down in the same position but with the gem placed in his inventory, and he put the burnt bread back on the pan. Last, he cast a large finite incantatum which unfroze everyone who lacked awareness of time while frozen and now saw the table filled with food. Harry wanted to stack another layer of food on top, but his telepathy sensed someone else on their way to the kitchen and he couldn't have them walk in while everyone was frozen. Thankfully that teleporter wasn't likely to show due to the pink hair, though Harry was unsure how many teleporters the Institute had. From their perspective, the smoky quartz in Harry's hand was glowing and now it was gone and the table was filled with food. Jubilee was the first to break out of her stupor and said, Oh hell yeah, and grabbed a plate and started chowing down. She didn't bother turning off the stove, almost like she had forgotten she was making food for someone. Danielle said, What? Is this an illusion? Jubilee said between bites, Best tasting illusion ever. Harry said, It's all real, so please help yourself to a plate. Each of the 3 picked up a plate and took a bite. Ronnie then quickly glared at Brian and slowly said, You stole our wish. Danielle quickly turned to Brian, who realized his joke could now be taken as a declaration of war. He took his plate and ran around the table and was quickly followed by the pair of angry teenage girls. On the first circle he touched the 2 chairs they were sitting in, and then he ran at them, who weren't expecting a turnaround, and touched each of them. A moment later they both were pulled out of the air into their chairs and Brian ran away. Ronnie shouted at the running mutant, Dinna think ya can hide from me? I know you ear scent. Danielle placed her shoulder on the angry Scotswoman, which calmed her down. Danielle said, "Forget about it. More for us." Harry wondered if anyone would remember the burning grilled cheese on the pan, which was now on fire. Forget-me-not sighed. Smoke alarm blares dash. Ronnie shouted over the alarm, "Jubbly, ya forgot to turn off te bloody stove." "OPPs, sorry." She went back over to the stove and put it and the flaming sandwich into the sink, taking a moment to soak them both with water before taking a nearby cutting board and waving it at the smoke alarm until it went silent. The student Harry sensed earlier had arrived in the kitchen and said, "Anything not on fire?" Harry said, "A few things. Jubilee really outdid herself today." When the table was in sight, the newcomer said, "What? No way Jubilee did this." Harry said, "I think Brian did it then." 2 more students came in, though Harry figured they came more to witness the carnage than they came to eat, as the smoke alarm was quite loud. Harry saw that Forget-Me-Not had taken his chair over to the wall and was calmly watching the new arrivals drop their jaws at the table of assorted food while holding the bowl of mashed potatoes Harry had originally set in front of him. Harry pulled his own chair over to sit next to Forget-Me-Not and said, "So you like people watching?" He shrugged, "I guess. Not much else to do. If I tell someone something, they'll either forget what I told them or forget where they learned it at some point during the conversation. Long conversations don't happen often for me." Several of the students started calling dibs on specific plates, such as the meat plates or pasta plates. Some were just admiring it and trying to figure out where it came from, since it was Jubilee's turn to cook. The noise coming from the kitchen seemed to attract more students, which in turn created more noise. One of the students who grabbed a plate, an African-American teen with a crew-cut hair, noticed Harry sitting in the corner with a plate and walked over. "Hey, you're the new guy who turned Kurt pink, right?" Harry was tempted to point out that his name was not Hay, but he couldn't expect everyone to have manners, so he said, "I'm pretty sure that's me, or at least someone going around looking like me. I'm Harry. It's nice to meet you." "Cool to meet you too, Harry. I'm Evan. You play any sports?" Harry shook his head. "Can't say I do. I'm a nerd who spends his days in books and messing with the laws of reality." Evan looked slightly disappointed but still said, "That's cool too. I think our nerds have a study group in the library after dinner, so you should totally meet up with them." Harry smiled and said, "Thanks, I'll definitely show up." Evan nodded and said, "So are you gonna try out for the team?" Harry gave a confused look, which caused Evan to continue, "The third X-Men team. Lots of those here want to be an X-Men, so we train a whole bunch to see who will make the final cut for the third team." Harry said, "If you don't mind me asking, what about the first and second teams?" "Well, the first team is my Anti-Storm, Wolverine, Angel, Beast, Colossus, Gambit, and Domino. There were others, but they either left or didn't make it out of the battle with the Shadow King. The second team is made from the best of the first batch of recruits. Bishop, Shadowcat, Pixie, Marrow, and Blink. They actually got captured by aliens last year and ended up getting dragged into a battle where they defeated a swarm of alien insects and saved a planet. They got an alien ship they used to fly back to the mansion. There was this guy called Warpath too, but he stayed behind. The current roster for the third team is myself, and I'm called Spike, by the way, Cyclops, Marvel Girl, Iceman, Rogue, and Nightcrawler, who you turned pink. So all these kids are trying out for a single team." "Well, not exactly. No one is allowed to go on missions until you're at least 16, and most of us third-gen recruits are 16 or younger. To be honest, the current team is just the guys who are 16 or the guys closest to 16. I'm turning 16 next year." "Ah, me too. Never fought with a team before, so I'll probably try it out." "Oh, you've fought before?" "That's right. I've had a few crazy adventures up to this point." "No way, dude. It's true. You know the red laser eye guy, Cyclops? That's his name? Well, I kicked his ass yesterday." "No way. Seriously? Dude's been spending all day in the danger room like someone set a fire under his butt. Guess that explains why. Well, I'll see you later then. I'm gonna get a second plate." Harry wondered what would happen if he used his new multiplayer feature on any of these teens. Unfortunately, it would not be that easy. According to the FAQ on adding a new player, it was basically Harry directly injected his own Obscurus particles into someone else's body and then having the particles mimic the cells of that person to directly boost their physiology. Doing so would permanently cost him some Obscurus particles and lower his level, forcing him to regain those levels. The weaker someone was, the less he needed to inject to grant them player status. So someone like Forget-Me-Not would probably cost Harry 5 to 10 levels. Someone like Logan could cost Harry over 100 levels. Moreover, the person had to have absolute trust in Harry or they would reject the particles and the process would fail. The only person he might be able to get to trust him that much was the Ancient One, but she would probably cost more Obscurus particles than Harry actually had to convert her, which would take Harry to level 0 and permanently kill him. The process for both parties would also be indescribably painful. Turning someone into a new player would apply some of the benefits of Harry's abilities, but not all. Such a person would be able to absorb the energy of defeated foes, and the Obscurus particles would use that energy to replicate and further strengthen the body, allowing levels ups. If injured, the particles could also take the place of damaged cells, giving the player a limited healing factor dependent on the amount of particles they had. Harry's path system and menu would be applied, so the cells would apply autocorrect to skills they used that were a part of paths they practiced often. They would also be able to choose what stats increased with each level up. There was even a way for them to use battle mediation through Harry to generate monsters matching their level they could fight, but Harry had to be present and couldn't deal any damage himself or else he would get the experience instead of the other player. What they would not be able to gain was the inventory, settings, pause function, or respawn features. Those were tied to Harry's soul and existence, and features like respawn only worked because Harry was 100% Obscurus particles while players would still have real flesh and blood. However, though they were not be able to respawn, increasing their level would increase the amount of Obscurus particles, which would raise the amount of damage they could recover from, which was not a bad consolation prize. Besides the pain, loss of levels, and high trust requirements, another reason Harry wasn't going to just give everyone this ability was because it would permanently connect them to Harry for the rest of their lives. Forget-me-not finished his mashed potatoes and said, "Thanks man. I'm heading back to the room. You should spend the day wandering around and meet more of the guys." Later, Harry wanted to say something but his roommate was already off. He couldn't help but notice that when Evan listed off the members of the first X-Men team, there were a lot, but the second X-Men team had so few and seemed to be the same age group as Forget-Me-Not. He'd ask him about that later. It didn't take long for details about the lunch miracle to spread around and much of the mansion showed up. However, that only amounted to about 20 or so, as it was still summer and more than half the students had returned to their families who lived further out. Evan apparently had a nice family, but they lived nearby, so he would stay at the mansion during the summer anyways to train and play with friends while still going to see his parents pretty often. Since Harry was fully moving in, he had a lot of paperwork to do himself, so he headed over to the library with a large stack of sheets and got to work. Forms for permanent address change were among the easier ones he needed, while forms for further correspondence between himself and the goblins was harder. He would basically teleport to a warehouse they had and give them a large batch of gems and metals, and they would manually ship it to Xavier's Institute twice a month. It would take some time before they had the mundane machinery required for the mass production of large gemstones, so Harry would need to make them himself for now. One upside was that in the last few months before Harry moved to the States, the goblins had come up with a nearly perfect means of shielding electronics from exotic energy up to a specific range. It couldn't withstand direct apparition, but could survive indefinitely in a magic-rich environment without issue. The shielding itself was an inlay of specific metal alloys in specific configurations similar to runes, but in appearance more closely resembled circuitry. The technical term would be metamaterial, as it was a material that had properties outside the properties of the materials that it was constructed from. In addition to shielding the equipment from exotic energy, it also shielded from nearly every other type of energy except for heat. Radiation, radio waves, and even a few forms of extra-dimensional energy could not pass easily through this shielding. The shielding against radio waves meant that it could not transmit or receive signals, but that could be gotten around with a hard line connection or building in a paired set of quantum entanglement transmitters within. A massive benefit for this that Harry saw was that preventing energy coming in or out of the equipment meant it could not be wirelessly hacked, even using technopathy, and wouldn't need to be magically charged. Harry and the goblins, however, agreed this shielding would not be sold to the general public. It was perfectly acceptable to make their own equipment unhackable through any means, but quite a few goblins had become very good with computers and enjoyed the art of hacking others. It was a new battlefield, and though there was far less blood than they would have liked, the battles won in the field of hacking could still grant considerable wealth to the goblin who achieved it. Harry rented out his hack boxes to them to make sure they didn't get traced, though they weren't allowed to hack from important locations regardless. Once finished with his final sheet of paperwork, he made sure no one was around and set it all into his inventory. He'd send it via portkaya to the goblins from his room and give the goblins the magical coordinates of his room so they had a location they could send portkaya mail back to him at their convenience. Harry felt the phoenix flame within him act up and turned to see Jean enter the library and spot him. "Hey Harry, so how's your first day been?" "Well, everyone is certainly very friendly, which is a welcome change. Not that the temple or my last school was cruel, but most everyone there was more or less indifferent to others. Yeah, we really try to be one big family here. Where'd you go before here?" "Well, I spent the last 2 years in a temple in Tibet training in martial arts and the more mystical aspects of my abilities. Before that I attended a boarding school in Scotland for a year. Apparently it was the same one my parents went to, but I got targeted by a terrorist, and though he was dealt with, I decided the school wasn't for me." Harry thought out as well that he memorized the school's library and knew more than many of the teachers, so he had nothing left to learn there. Jean looked like she wanted to ask something, so Harry just said aloud, "I can absorb books, so I ordered a copy of pretty much every textbook the school had, which is how I got all that knowledge." Having her question answered, she said, "Oh, that's convenient. I wish I could do something like that, but I can only read people who are usually not comfortable with being read." Harry considered it and said, "Well, you're still welcome in my head when you wish, and every book I've memorized is within. Would you like a library card?" What happens if I take a book without a library card?" "Nothing. The library card will allow you to find specific pieces of knowledge without having to look for it. However, if you take a book out and open it outside of the little reading area in my head, automated defenses will activate, so be careful. So would you like a library card or not?" Jean looked as if she was mulling it over and said, "I'm not sure it's such a good idea to spend so long in a boy's head." Harry thought wryly to himself that he didn't know she was already considering spending long amounts of time in his head, which caused her to blush when she heard the thought. She quickly said, "I didn't mean it that way, it's just, well, When I'm inside your head, the thoughts of others are gone. I can usually hear everyone's thoughts around me, but for some reason when I specifically go inside your head, the thoughts of others are silent. She had no intention of telling him it also felt warm and comfortable in there, like relaxing in front of a fireplace after a long day. Harry said, that should be an effect of some of the mental practices I use. I can channel Chinook energy like a telepath when I absorb a quartz crystal, and I've used that combined with some esoteric practices I've learned to create a very sturdy mind. Jean thought about that for a moment and asked, do you think I can learn that then? I would love to not have to listen to the thoughts of others day in and day out. Harry held out his hand in a gesture for Jean to take it, which she did after a moment of hesitation. Within the library of Harry's mind, a small card appeared in front of Jean's mental avatar, which she picked up. It vanished and Harry said, library card acquired. Just think about the knowledge you want and the books will appear. Just remember that you can only read them in the reading area. Jean frowned and said, I can't accept that, Harry. I mean, we've only just met and I feel like I'm taking advantage of you. Harry considered it and said, in that case there is something you can do for me. Within Harry's mind, Harry gave a book to Jean, who went over to the reading area and opened it. She gasped, Forget-me-not. Oh, no. The book contained Harry's knowledge on the imperceptible mutant. Harry asked, you remember him? She sighed, not completely. I think I told him I'd try not to forget him, but even then. Oh, he must hate me. Harry shook his head, no, I doubt that very much. Professor Xavier gave me an empty room with him, so he's my new roommate. I absorbed a lock of his hair the same way I can books, and now I won't forget him. Really? That's great. Indeed. However, I want to see if I can figure out a way for others to remember him. I see. That won't be easy. Even his thoughts are practically invisible. I'm not sure if I can't hear his thoughts or if I simply forget them when I can no longer hear them. And, oh no, I won't even remember talking about him later, will I? Harry said, probably. But that's what I'd like to test. With your permission, I'd like to look inside your head as you are forgetting him and try a few different ways to see if I can get people to remember him. Jean thought it was a bit hypocritical that she could see into other people's minds so easily, yet was uncomfortable with someone else going through her mind. That being said, it was for a good cause. She didn't want to owe Harry for letting her use his knowledge and head, and she also wanted to help Forget-me-not. Alright, but don't judge me for what you see and keep anything you find to yourself, okay? No problem. Plus I can help you arrange your mind if you want after you learn a few things. Harry had to purposefully allow thoughts to be heard when he wanted them to be heard by visiting telepaths, so many of his thoughts were not in fact heard by Jean. He was pretty satisfied with his idea and that it actually worked. With this, he would be able to get a closer look at the mental blocks within Jean and figure out a way to safely remove them. He could also test a few means to help Forget-me-not, so it was a case of the proverbial two birds with one stone. Plus he really did want to get to know Jean and didn't mind her looking through his head. She'd find a lot of things that didn't make sense, but in doing so would slowly acclimate herself to Harry's secrets, and when she knew him well enough, he hoped she would trust him to remove the mental blocks once he found a means to do it safely. Chapter 33. Chapter 33, Making Friends. Harry had to return to his room to get more quartz from his backpack, or at least that's what he told Jean when he left and returned a few minutes later. She was both surprised and a little skeptical that Harry's powers worked by just absorbing specific things for specific effects. Harry didn't mind doubts. If he did, he certainly wouldn't have granted a wish in the kitchen, since using a single smoky quartz for something like that was pretty big. He already figured out how to rationalize it to those who asked deeper questions, but the truth was, his cover was specifically for enemies, so if his friends had suspicions, that would be fine as long as they didn't openly share them with outsiders. Harry never had any real intention of holding back while training, he just wanted others to think his powers had a high cost to use, and since it really didn't require that much effort to create such a ruse, it was worth it. To Harry, it was just a very long-term prank. He wondered which of the X-Men would figure it out first. His money was on Logan, but the man looked like he knew a thing or two about keeping secrets close to the vest, so even if he figured it out, he likely wouldn't bring it up, so Harry wouldn't know if he figured it out first or not. Jean spent her time enjoying the quiet of Harry's mind and reading on Occlumency. The book wasn't simply words, it was Harry's own understanding of the practice, perfectly organized for assimilation by others telepaths, making a few pages more informative than hours of lectures and personal studies. 10 minutes into her reading she realized Harry's thoughts hadn't echoed in the library since she started, which made her ask, Harry, can you control which thoughts can be heard by telepaths in your mind? Harry left Jean's mind and answered back, that's right. There is actually a book in the library that constantly updates itself with my thoughts, which is also the practice I use to lock away my thoughts from others by having them written out instead of voiced aloud inside my head. However, when I choose to, my thoughts can echo through the library as well. After considering this for a moment, she smacked Harry's shoulder, which he responded to by giving a fake hurt look. She said, that's for saying I was peeping earlier. It isn't peeping if the person allows you to peep. Harry asked innocently, so if you allowed me to see you undress, it wouldn't be peeping if I didn't ask permission first. Jean smacked his shoulder again and turned slightly to hide her blush before stating, you are not allowed to peep on myself or anyone undressing. Harry added, without permission. Jean tried to change the subject and turn her own embarrassment back on him, so, can my library card be used to find the book with your thoughts or your memories? Maybe find a girlfriend or childhood sweetheart. Harry shamelessly said, "That's right, and feel free to do so. I only ask that you not share with others anything you find." I was just joking. Harry said, "My library card actually can't be taken by someone who means me harm, so the fact that you could take it means you can be trusted with any info you find inside my head. There are some restricted pieces that contain secrets that wouldn't do any good to get out which are kept locked away, but memories and thoughts are not among them." Harry wasn't lying either. His thoughts and plans to gain Jean's trust so he could remove the blocks on her mind were all in one of the books. If she decided to pick it up and read it, she'd know his plans. Harry was curious as to her reactions if she decided to do so, but wasn't worried as he had no ill intentions against her, and Jean learning directly from him about the blocks in a way she knew he couldn't be lying to her would save him a lot of time. He doubted she would though. Harry came off as a pervert, so free access to his deepest thoughts would not be a priority for the young telepath when she would rather be spending her time looking over the books on mental arts she now had free access to. Jean said with just a slight tease to her voice, "Maybe later?" Harry shrugged and said, "When you're done with those books, I recommend this one." One of the books on the shelves flew out and over to the table in the reading area Jean had found a comfortable seat in. Harry continued, "It was written by the master of the temple I was at for the last 2 years and one of the best guides for astral creation. She is so skilled, she can push a person's astral form directly out of their body and even drag it through different dimensions." Jean asked, "Your master was a telepath?" "Wait, your master was a woman." "No and yes. All minds have the potential for Shinix, mutants such as yourself, and the professor just have a head start in the art. As for my master, if possible I'll let you meet her one day." Separating your astral form from your body was difficult even for those who had mastered magic, as it was a Shinix ability rather than a magic one, but for another to be able to separate your sense of self directly from your body required a far higher level of mastery. Jean went back to reading and Harry grabbed another large piece of quartz and put it in his inventory before taking another dive into Jean's mind. When asked how that worked, he basically answered that each piece could allow for a single use of access to specific energies, but as long as it was a continuous use, one crystal was all that was required. He was pretty sure at some point Jean would call BS and look for the book Harry kept the knowledge of his abilities in, but for now he'd keep up the charade. His money was still on Logan figuring it out first though. From what he could see while looking through her head, memories of Forget-Me-Not were like objects with a frictionless surface. If on the floor, they would remain there, but a single jolt in any direction would cause them to quickly slide away. The harder you tried to hold onto them, the faster they left, like gripping a glass egg with wet, soapy hands. A part of Jean's skilled mind tried to gently hold only her recollection of Forget-Me-Not, but it still slipped through the cracks. After an hour Jean's mind had nearly forgotten why she had let Harry in, so he had to remind her. What was concerning was that each time she was reminded, the memories she previously had of him didn't return. She only remembered him when reminded because there were memories of him that were inactive, and once activated, she figured out the rest. However, when she forgot, she also forgot the activated memories. This meant that the more she remembered him, the more of him she forgot. Harry asked and got permission to copy any uncovered memory she had of him so they could be returned to her later. Thankfully, having a piece of Forget-Me-Not in Harry's inventory acted like a tether, so his own memories of Forget-Me-Not were not slipping away. He was tempted to see what would happen if he removed the hair, but the worst-case scenario was that he would instantly lose every memory of Forget-Me-Not, and from what Harry could discern, any memory he lost of his roommate would be unrecoverable. That wasn't acceptable, so he would rely on Jean to do the necessary testing. She was alright with that as long as Harry returned to her a copy of any memory she lost during the tests. While observing her, Harry did his best to, and from what he could sense, succeed in hiding his own awkwardness from Jean. Other than Hermione, this was the closet he'd ever really gotten to a girl around his own age, and this was the first time he'd done so since his hormones started acting up. Though hundreds of years spent in the tutorial and paused helped his mentality mature, it had little effect on his biology, and if caught off guard he'd still blush the same as Jean would do every so often. While shifting around through her mind, he would have to fight his own impulses to look at her thoughts about him, as she could sense what he was doing in the same way he could sense her. Their proximity to each other, the fact that she smelled good, and how beautiful she looked while blushing weren't helping the situation at all. On the matter of the mental blocks, Harry had discovered a few hints as to their nature, but nothing obvious. It reminded Harry of what he did with his own mind, in that the space was rearranged so that certain pieces of information couldn't be accessed without unfolding the space into a maze first. Without prior experience in doing so, Harry wouldn't have noticed the telltale signs of folded space within Jean's mind. However, that means he couldn't have a good look at the blocks without first figuring out how to safely unfold the space. From an outside observer's perspective, both Harry and Jean were in the mansion's library reading a book, though neither would turn the pages. However, neither were unaware of their surroundings, and when 3 students entered the library, they both looked up to find the identities of the new arrivals. 2 Harry recognized, the sunglasses-wearing teen he met the previous night and the no longer pink-haired demon teleporter. The third was an older pink-haired girl with bone-like plates framing her face as well as spikes coming from her back. Jean looked up from her book and said, "Hey Scott, looking for me?" The teen with the red sunglasses took a quick look at Harry, which made him seem like he was struggling not to frown. He answered back, "Yeah, someone ordered a whole buffet or something and there are still leftovers in the kitchen." The older pink-haired teen said, "No one ordered it, Scott. I heard some new kid made it appear, like magic." Scott said, "Look, there's no way dash." Harry interrupted, "Ah, that was me. I was playing around and overdid it a little." The pink-haired girl took another look at Harry and said, "You're the new kid? Well, I'm Sarah, nice to meet you." "Nice to meet you too, I'm Harry." "Well Harry, what are you doing spending your first day here in the library?" she asked. "Ah, there is a project I really need help with and Jean was nice enough to assist me." Sarah raised an eyebrow and asked skeptically, "Homework during summer on your first day here?" "Not homework, a special project. I'm calling it Operation Don't Forget. It has to deal with how some things are forgotten easily while others are not. There's a lot of psychology involved and when I begged on my hands and knees for assistance Jean agreed to help out." Jean gave a half smile at the explanation. Harry wasn't lying about the project, but he was leaving a number of things out. Sarah nodded and said, "Well, make sure to treat out little Marvel Girl right or there will be consequences." Harry looked over at Jean and smirked. "Marvel Girl." Jean let her head fall down to the table in embarrassment which caused Harry's smirk to turn into a grin and caused Sarah to giggle a bit. Sarah said, "That's right, we're all very protective of Marvel Girl, especially Scott here." Before Scott could say anything, Kurt said, "It's true, you should see him every time she gets hurt in the simulation." Kurt dramatically rose his hand into the air looking off into the distance and theatrically cried out, "Geon." Harry met Scott's gaze with an amused look causing the laser-eyed teen to look down slightly. He took a breath and looked back up before saying, "Look, I'm sorry about yesterday. I can't deny that I overreacted when you were just testing us. It's just." He looked over at Jean who was now waiting with a half smirk as well for him to continue his explanation. Scott let out another sigh before continuing, "Jean and I have both been in the Institute for years. Most come into their powers around their teens, but we both have had them for far longer and we were the youngest here when we arrived. She's isn't just a team member to me alright, she's family." Jean gave him a soft look before hardening it and saying to Harry, "And though I've grown up quite a bit since I arrived here, Scott still tends to treat me like I'm still a helpless little girl even though I am fully capable of looking after myself and kicking his ass." Scott looked part offended and part appalled at the language though Sarah and Kurt both laughed with the latter saying, "Ja, it's true." Harry added his 2 cents, "Ah, so the knight in shining sunglasses still seeks to save the fair princess." This got a few giggles from the girls and caused Kurt to start laughing. Before Scott could say otherwise, Harry said, "Jean, perhaps you should dress in a leather biker chick's outfit so he no longer considers you a princess to be rescued." Sarah and Kurt erupted into full-blown laughter and Jean tried to glare at Harry but stifling her own laughter while doing so didn't make it a very effective glare. Scott seemed to realize there wasn't a way to defend himself so he gave up on that and asked Harry, "Look, are we okay?" Harry could tell this was the type of guy who just wanted to be helpful to others. Harry did too, but in truth, that was more of just a hobby he enjoyed, like playing video games. Scott however was different, he emotionally invested himself into others. This would make him a good leader in the future, but it also meant that if he was betrayed by someone he had absolute trust in, he wouldn't take it well. Harry decided to file that obvious foreshadow away for later. Harry held out his hand for Scott to take and when he took it Harry said, "No problem. If you have time later we can spar if you want. Your power is nice for long-distance attacks but you'll definitely want some CQC skills to fall back on." Jean asked, "CQC?" Scott answered, "Close quarters combat. Though I didn't know anyone besides Logan used that term. He told me the same thing by the way. I can't believe you held your own against him." Harry shook his head, "Oh, I didn't. That guy was holding back a lot. I mean he didn't even use his claws until I had him chained down. Last guy I fought with that much skill nearly vaporized me." Kurt frowned and said, "Guys like you remind me that the phrase, 'May you live in interesting times,' is actually a curse. And how did you make that food and turn me pink?" Scott asked, "Wait, you're the one who turned Kurt pink." "It was a reflex. I was minding my own business then this scary blue dude pops out of nowhere and terrifies me." Kurt half shouted, "You liar? You weren't scared, you flicked my forehead the moment I appeared. Then you took something from your pocket and turned my precious hair pink." Harry threateningly said, "Did what I took out from my pocket look like this?" while reaching into his pocket. The blue demon popped away in another puff of brimstone smoke and from what Harry could tell, reappeared behind a nearby wall where he could still listen in. Harry said, "Oh, never mind, I don't have any smoky quartz left on me." "Oh well." Scott's frown could be seen beneath his sunglasses and he asked, "How does your power work?" Jean quickly repeated back what Harry told her earlier. Harry can absorb things which grant temporary effects like increased strength or access to energies he can use to perform magic-like feats. Harry wasn't sure she bought it but it was nice that she was helping him keep his cover since the others were more likely to believe it coming from her than him. Scott asked, "What kind of things?" Harry answered this time, "Quartz gives me access to Chinook energy which lets me do things similar to Jean until I release the connection. Smoky quartz lets me do somewhat random and unstable things and I can't guarantee the outcome or consequences. I used smoky quartz to teleport last night, turn Kurt pink, and conjured an assortment of food. I'm not entirely sure where the food came from though and I may have accidentally stolen it from somewhere." Scott asked in just a slightly higher pitch of voice, "So we've all become accessories to theft?" Harry said, "Doubt it. If I hear news of a theft I'll make sure they're compensated but I don't even know when then food came from, much less where. It could have all been made in different parts of the world at different times for all I know." Scott shook his head and said, just don't do that again, alright? No problem. I'll make it myself next time. Harry felt another area of space cave in close to him and paused again. Harry approximated where the blue demon was likely to reappear and unpaused while moving his hand to the space to his side. Kurt once more reappeared in a puff of blue brimstone-smelling smoke just as Harry's hand stopped in front of him and flicked his forehead again. Ow, vat was that for? He asked, slipping a bit into his German accent. Sorry, still a reflex. Kurt rolled his eyes and asked, are you good in the kitchen? Harry said, I'm good in a lot of places, but yes, I can cook. From the looks on their faces, Scott and Kurt hadn't caught on to the double meaning, but from the way Sarah smirked and Jean turned away, Harry figured they both understood. Kurt said, excellent, then you can take my next shift and make lunch tomorrow. Harry said, sure, and if anything horrible happens to those who eat lunch, I'm sure people won't come after you in retaliation. Kurt considered it and said, on second thought, I'll go ahead and make lunch tomorrow. Sarah asked, so Harry, are you a nerd, a jock, or a pervert? Harry gave a mock thoughtful expression and asked, do I have to choose just one? Kurt said, Neen, he is a prankster. I would recognize one of my own anywhere. Harry said, guilty. Kurt leaned over to Harry and gave a conspiratorial stage whisper, there are things we must discuss later, and then leaned out and gave a wink as if none of the others heard what he just told Harry. Harry gave a sagely nod which sent a shiver up the spine of Scott and Sarah. Jean, for some reason, was looking forward to it. Kurt, Sarah, and Scott took a seat and started talking about the Institute and themselves while asking Harry questions. Kurt asked, how could you live in a temple for 2 years? I would be bored out of my mind in 2 hours. Harry knew what he meant and said, yeah, no one there would have appreciated a good prank, so I have to lay low. The head of the temple did in fact have a sense of humor, but she was the figurehead and had to lead by example, so she couldn't express it outwardly. Jean asked, did you ever prank her? Harry's face scrunched up. Once. Kurt excitedly asked, oh, this I must hear. Harry sighed and said, I have access to certain materials with beyond standard properties. For simplicity's sake, we'll call them magic potions, and if you want I'll tell you more about them later. Now, the temple master is bald, so there was one time I served her some tea that had a little something extra inside so that the next morning she would wake up with a full head of hair. I saw her the next morning and she was still bald, so I figured it didn't work. I mean, magic potions aren't exactly what you would call reliable. Later that week I had tea with her again and she served it. The next day I woke up looking like a Wookiee. The moment that image came to everyone's mind, each of them started madly laughing. Scott had to hold his sunglasses to his face to make sure they didn't fall off, and it didn't take long for Sarah and Jean to have tears leaking from their eyes while Kurt was literally on the floor, rolling around and laughing until he couldn't breathe. After they calmed down a bit, Harry said, I'm just a little regretful I ever told her where to buy stuff like that. Harry was grilled a bit more on the subject but passed it off as a small street in London filled with old, occult shops that either sold fake or real stuff, though that wasn't exactly what he said. He didn't lie, but he did give most of them the impression that it was just a slightly weird area, and not a hidden world. Harry wondered how long it would take for Jean to start looking through his memories for that. The group headed back to the kitchen to grab some of the remaining plates and saw Forge standing in a corner next to an open metal panel. When he saw Harry enter, he said, new guy, did you do this? Harry realized what he was talking about and said, yeah, I'm sorry, it won't happen again. Sarah said, wait, why was this a bad thing? Forge answered, the cameras and sensors fried the moment he did whatever he did. Forge had seen the video log which showed Harry taking out a large piece of smoky quartz, having the quartz glow, and then the feed died. Harry nodded, yeah, that form of energy isn't good around electronics, especially for feats that big. Forge frowned and said, magic? Hope you know what you're getting into playing with stuff like that. Harry asked, bad experience with magic. Forge took off a glove revealing a mechanical hand and used it to knock on his opposite leg, revealing a metal sound. He said, that was that last time I used magic. New house rule, no summoning anything, got it? Harry's look of recognition let Forge know he figured out what happened, and Harry said, got it, no summoning anything. I promise. Forge nodded and said, good. He held his metal hand out for Harry to shake and he did so. I'm Jonathan Silvercloud, everyone calls me Forge though. When the semester starts I teach physical sciences. I hear you know your way around tech. Harry recognized the Native American name and nodded, yes, I'm Harry, and I can write an operating system blindfolded and can probably take apart anything in Dr. McCoy's lab and put it back together. Is that right? We'll see about that later. He closed the hatch and left. It seemed he had just finished. Kurt said, oh, you're so gonna get it. Harry asked, why is that? Sarah answered, Forge probably has one of the biggest egos on the planet, but not without good reason. You basically challenged him by saying you could take apart his tech. Scott continued, that, and he is the one who programs the danger room. Him and Logan are number 2 and 3 of the top 3 people you don't mess with here. Harry asked, and number 1? All 4 answered at the same time, Storm. Harry could easily imagine what a weather sorceress of her power would be capable of, so he didn't question it further. They each grabbed a plate and finished it while continuing their prior discussion. At one point Harry realized something and thought out loud to ask the question if the others knew that Jean couldn't control her powers and was hearing their thoughts as well. Jean gave a quick look at him and shook her head, showing a bit of anxiety. Harry thought that he had no intention of telling others, and as long as she didn't share the information she learned or use it against others, there was no real harm in them not knowing. Jean sent a telepathic message to Harry. It has only been the last couple months that my powers have gotten stronger and this started. They don't know and I thank you for not telling them. Harry thought out loud that it wasn't a problem, but privately he wondered if the phoenix granting him a part of its flame had affected Jean, boosting her own power due to the proximity. If that was the case, it would probably get stronger, which meant Harry had to help her control it faster and remove the blocks before they caused permanent damage to her growing psyche. He did ask if she would be able to reach his mind at night for more time to use his library to study mind arts. Turns out that her own bedroom wasn't too far from Harry's, so it was easy. Harry did his best to avoid the temptation of mentioning how they only knew each other for a day and were already planning ways to sneak into each other's rooms. Mentally at least. After dinner, Harry and Jean returned to the library and Scott, Kurt, and Sarah headed off to do their own thing. The study group assembled not long after, though was smaller than usual as most of its members went home for the summer. The current members included Bobby, Kitty, Soraya, and Josh, along with Jean. Kitty was a few years older, with Bobby being about the same age as Harry, while Soraya and Josh were both a few years younger. Bobby's parents didn't know he was a mutant, so he felt awkward around them, which was why he stayed. Kitty apparently picked up an cat-sized alien dragon when she went to space and brought it back, but her parents wouldn't let it come over, so she stayed at the mansion because she didn't want to leave it. Soraya was Muslim and wore a traditional hijab. She didn't have family and didn't speak of it further. Josh was a young mutant who could heal others, but a few months back he got badly injured and tried to heal himself. It worked, but his skin permanently turned gold in color, which made it difficult to walk around outside the mansion without a few hours of heavy makeup application. Jean was usually the head of the study group, but once they got started, Harry's scholar path got to work and his inner teacher smoothly took over. Jean didn't mind because he was doing well and it gave her more time to spend looking through the books on mental arts in Harry's head. According to Harry's senses, Bobby's cells had a constant connection to a dimension that was similar to Ichthalin's but not the same one. There were countless dimensions after all, and Ichthalin's was not the only dimension of endless cold energy. That, however, meant that Bobby could use the equivalent of ice magic with the power of invocation without giving anything up in exchange. There was no reasonable limit either. If that dimension had no master, then Bobby could potentially channel all the energy of that dimension with enough effort. If there was no one to stop him, he could freeze the planet solid if he wanted to. Harry was quite glad he was a good guy. Harry decided to teach him everything there was to know about thermodynamics. Josh felt strange to Harry's senses. He was actually a bit similar to the energy Harry felt off the Philosopher's Stone, but also different. That matched what Josh told Harry about his abilities. Harry debated giving him some physical books on occlumency, since there was a possibility he could use his healing ability to reshape his own mind to practice the art. If he could, then it was possible to use occlumency to learn vast amounts of chemistry, biology, and human anatomy and physiology. A living Philosopher's Stone with such knowledge would be very interesting. Not even the Flamels knew everything their stone could do after all. Kitty had an interesting power of physical intangibility. Unlike the few dimension-shifting forms of intangibility Harry knew of, hers allowed her to still see and hear things in this dimension while intangible, and she could even affect or be affected by some energies while intangible. She wanted to study engineering, and though Harry was a few years younger than her, she had no problem accepting his input. She used to be Dr. McCoy's assistant and knew her stuff, but it seemed there were some issues with her power and she was kind of a klutz, so after one too many dropped beakers or wrecking expensive equipment by accidental phasing into it, she was let go from that position. Harry didn't know Soraya's power and he didn't ask. Soraya wanted to study law, and though Harry mostly knew business law, he still knew enough criminal law to assist her. When it came to studies, Jean usually studied the mind, but that was more because of the influence of Professor Xavier and her own power than it was for a career. Everyone assumed she would go into the field of psychology, but just because she could go into the minds of others, didn't mean she liked to. Harry found this out while in her mind, but that was mostly because she let him see it. From within her mind, Harry directly said, "Jean, when you're done mastering mind arts, I'd recommend learning about physics, astrophysics, and astronomy." Within her mind echoed the question, "Oh, and why is that?" "Learning about the mind will help you control your powers. Learning physics and astrophysics will teach you new ways to use them. And astronomy." Harry said, "A hunch. You'll need it." Harry didn't continue looking through Jean's mind to see what her answer would be. He gained all he needed for now on Forget-Me-Not's issue and couldn't do anything about the mental blocks until Jean gained the ability to unfold her own mind, which could take several months depending on how much effort she put into it. That day's study group went on far longer than normal due to the progress each made in their own subject, but eventually came to an end and they each returned to their rooms. On arrival, Harry noticed Forget-Me-Not go stiff and stare at him for a few moments. Harry said, "I still remember you, so relax." Forget-Me-Not let out a sigh and said, "Sorry. I've had others say they would remember me too." Harry wanted to tell him of his progress, but there wasn't much to speak of at the moment, so he said, "Can I have one more lock of your hair? I want to try a few things on it." Forget-Me-Not rolled his eyes and took the scissors from earlier and snipped a lock from the back of his head, which Harry took and set aside. Harry asked, "Are you a part of the second X-Men team that went into space?" Forget-Me-Not looked surprised and said, "Yeah, but I don't really want to talk about it." Harry figured the older mutant probably had as little experience talking to people about things as Harry did. Harry took the papers he wrote earlier out of his inventory along with a porte-clés box. He created a magic circle in the air above an empty dresser which expanded and contracted, giving Harry the numbers to write down for the space's magical coordinates. He wrote that down and set it in the porte-clés box before activating it, sending the box to the goblins. Harry. Yes, forget-me-not. What was that? Paperwork. No, I mean the taking stuff out of midair thing, and the glowy circle thing, and the vanishing box thing. Oh, that's magic. Why, you know what? Forget I asked. Chapter 34, Chapter 34 Xavier Danger. 1 week after Harry's arrival he got his first danger room session. That morning an armored truck had pulled up to the X-mansion and delivered several crates of various sizes containing the supplies he asked the goblins to stage the manual delivery of. Setting up such a routine every other month or so would cement the weakness of his power to others watching him, and he had no doubt others were watching him. According to the goblins, there had been over a dozen checks into Harry's background done by various companies and several agencies since the open transfer of his funds from overseas to the States. However, by this point the goblins had had 4 years to create a background and 3 years to create the foundation of his company, so it all looked completely legitimate. The goblins even included several legal issues into the history of his company which looked to be resolved later because a company with a history of legal issues was less suspicious than a company without them. There was a reason that the goblins put so much effort into working for Harry rather than just doing everything themselves with their own gold. Legally speaking, due to a large amount of treaties and agreements made in the past, goblins were not allowed to own land, interact with non-magicals, or work above ground in most areas. At the moment, they weren't breaking a single law. Although just a technicality, every land or business purchased was purchased only under Harry's name. The taxes were a nightmare, but it was perfectly legal. As for the other issues, they were solved by simply using computers or hiring muggleborns or squibs for direct interactions. One would think that it was possible for Harry to betray them, but the goblins had Harry sign a large amount of magical contracts which would pretty much end his life if he did so. Not that he would. Also, the contracts didn't prevent the goblins from trying to cheat him, which they would often make attempts to do, though Harry caught each one. When Harry was sent stacks of paperwork he would just directly put it into his inventory and pause before going over it all, line by line, which was what saved him from a few of the more subtle technicalities and clauses they tried to sneak into some forms for him to sign. Harry knew that the goblins were not his friends, just business partners. One wrong move or misstep on Harry's part and he would practically become a magic-bound puppet to be used by the goblins, yet as long as he stayed a step ahead of them he had a cutthroat workforce more cunning than any lawyer and more vicious than a shark who smelled blood in the water. It was just another battlefield for the goblins and they enjoyed having a worthy opponent. The supplies Harry had delivered included a dozen small crates each filled with 100 or so synthetic gemstones that were flat enough to stack with a shape similar to a full wallet in size. After use hover dollies to transport the crates to the danger room, Harry was immediately told to get out one of everything and head in for an examination of his base reading. Logan said into the speaker system, "All right, Brat, it's finally time to show us what you're made of." The audience included Professor Xavier, Forge, Logan, Dr. McCoy, and a few of the 3rd X-Men team including Scott, Jean, and Kurt. Ms. Monroe was noticeably absent as her attention was already completely wrapped in the book written by her ancestor that arrived with the rest of the materials. Logan said, "First, we're gonna get a base reading on you. So just go through the course." From what Harry learned from Forge, the danger room had 2 modes: obstacle course and combat simulator. The obstacle course was where random obstacles came out of the wall and floor and the students were expected to get through them while running laps around the large circular room. The combat simulator was a newer function they hadn't fully worked the bugs out of yet that made hard light constructs to use as opponents. According to Forge, the alien ship Kitty and the 2nd X-Men team returned to Earth on had a rudimentary hard light system which is basically a combination of holograms and force fields. A force field was usually made to cover a surface and didn't move, but it was possible to create an enclosed space where a force field could be made in midair and moved around. This combined with a hologram made it look like one could create actual constructs. Of course the construct could not exist outside the danger room as an enclosed space was required for their existence, but it was a good way for those with lethal capabilities to test them without holding back. Harry ran 3 laps around the danger room while wearing a cursed ring he made. After learning more about the nature of wizard magic, Harry had delved deeper into making it his own and less chaotic, which led him to create more personalized spells and such. This curse was similar to the momentum-restricting equipment he had before, but far more efficient, and since it used his wizard magic, it was invisible to any form of energy sensing. The curse itself reduced Harry's physical stats to about 30 apiece, which for a soon-to-be 15-year-old was just about peak possible fitness. Logan let him have it on the obstacles as laser turrets, saw blades, and spikes came at him from every direction, forcing him to pause nearly every 3 seconds to check what new gizmo had popped out of the wall. He looked around, well, not paused of course, but that was more for show. Next was a test of Harry's heightened base. According to Harry's explanation of his abilities, absorbing a rare metal could increase his stats for a week while absorbing a common metal would only increase them for an hour, and that these 2 effects stacked. The limit of how much he could increase his base rose with his fitness level. Harry absorbed some bars of platinum which were among the delivered items and reduced the effect of the curse from 90% reduction to 50% reduction, making his physical stats of STR and AGI about 150 apiece. Harry did the course once more, but the delay between the different obstacles popping up had been drastically reduced the moment Logan got an understanding of Harry's strength and speed. And last but not least, Harry absorbed some pure iron bars and he removed the ring completely and showed off his base physique. The ring itself had a notice me not charm on it, so those watching didn't pay attention to the fact that he wore it or took it off. While watching Harry's third run from the observation deck, Xavier asked aloud, "How is he?" Logan answered gruffly, "Strength-wise he is about halfway between me and Sabretooth. His speed is closer to Sabretooth's than mine though. Although he has combat experience, from the way he handles himself, I'd say it's mostly one-on-one. He has little to no experience on a true battlefield." Xavier commented, "That is not surprising. He trained with others to control his power, but he doesn't appear to have experienced war, so there would be no reason for him to fight in a battlefield." Logan agreed with the second part but not the first. He could always tell the difference between those who have killed and those who haven't. There was a fear of death in the eyes of those who have never taken a life and those who have never had someone try to take theirs. He could tell Harry had fought against people who wanted him dead and probably killed them. But he wouldn't say anything, that wasn't his business to share. Forge took over the speaker and said, "All right, now we're gonna test those gems. Wait, Harry, what are the fossils for?" The armored truck dropped off 12 small crates, 3 medium crates, and 2 large crates along with Ororo's book. The small crates had all been opened and contained the various palm-sized synthetic gemstones Harry used, while the large crates contained iron and one of the medium crates contained the platinum. The other 2 medium crates hadn't been opened. One of the 12 small crates however didn't contain gemstones, it contained fossils. Harry answered, "Those are Tyrannosaurus Rex bone fossils. We should save their use for last." Forge was more than a little curious but set it aside for now and activated the combat simulation. The room changed into what looked to be the interior of a large office building as the holograms set the stage and the hard light constructs filled out the room. A collective grimace appeared on the spectators' faces and Xavier asked, "Did it have to be this scenario? He's a bit young to face him." Forge smiled and said, "I'm sure the kid can take it." Harry moved through the rows of empty cubicles and a moment later, the elevator at the end of the hall dinged. The door slid open and out charged a man in a red and black custom riding a minigun-mounted pink unicorn. He shouted, "Bet you weren't expecting me, motherfuckers? Wait, did I just get bleeped? Ahem, you're with a chimichanga." Harry found himself far too stunned to acknowledge what he had said. The pink unicorn's saddle had 2 actual miniguns mounted to the sides and the red guy riding it had swords strapped to his back. "Dufuk." The strange man jumped off the unicorn and said, "Hey kids, I'm Deadpool. And this is Philip." The unicorn let out a growl and the miniguns started rotating. Harry grabbed a citron from his belt and had it glow before putting it in his inventory. Just as the miniguns started firing, chains wrapped around the unicorn's neck and dragged him to the side, aligning his line of fire with Deadpool's back. The man's body partially exploded with a shower of gore and blood and the unicorn was unable to get back up. From behind him, Harry heard someone shout, "You killed Kenny." Harry turned to see another Deadpool standing there and to his side was a third who shouted, "You BAS? Wait, Bass gets censored? What the dash?" Harry used a tourmaline to summon a bolt of heat and light which was sent through the copy's torso before he could finish his sentence. The copy next to him said, "Okay, playtime's over." He drew his sword and ran over to Harry, who pulled out and used a diamond and generated his eldritch heavy sword. Deadpool struck it a dozen times but his sword bounced off, allowing Harry to use it as a shield with his tidal sword style. Each sweep of his weapon changed the layout of the office space, but Deadpool moved around like a monkey on a sugar high. Deadpool jumped back a few steps and shouted, "Get him, Philip." The gun-toting pink unicorn had freed itself from the chains and was revving its miniguns once more. Harry charged forward as the guns went off, using his heavy sword as a shield, though it was slowly whittled away as he got closer. The unicorn charged forward to meet Harry, who jumped to the side and bounced against a wall to face the unicorn once more, and with a clean slice the unicorn was bisected. Deadpool fell to his knees and shouted, "Philip." He then pulled 2 handguns from behind him and started unloading at Harry, who had to jump behind the adjacent desks for cover. Harry pulled out a ruby and after making it glow and vanish he started emitting red light as he channeled strength energy from Sidorak's realm. Harry charged forward through the desks as if they were made of air and tackled Deadpool to the ground before ripping off his arms. Deadpool looked to his left and right and said, "You know, I don't think this is the proper way to disarm someone." Harry headbutted him, which seemed to knock him out as the red glow faded. The elevator dinged once more. 4 more Deadpools came out of the elevator and started shooting Harry at the same time while arguing with each other over who was the most handsome. Harry decided to ignore their conversation and pulled out the Dino fossil and put it in his inventory. Harry channeled his dragon chi, causing golden arcs of lightning to flash over his body. One of the Deadpools shouted, "He's going Super Saiyan. Kill him before he gets sued for copyright infringement." The bullets did nothing to Harry, who took a few moments to compose himself before moving faster than the eye could follow over to the group of Deadpools and smashing into one of them with all the force he could muster. The moment Harry's fist made contact, the hologram vanished and the projection flashed red with a message on the wall, "Error. There was also a 5-meter-tall dent in the wall a few feet in front of where Harry had punched and sparks were coming from the scrap behind it. The message vanished and the danger room opened. Harry looked over at the group and asked, "Who the bloody hell was that?" Logan answered, "Deadpool." mercenary who pops up in unexpected places and is troublesome to put down. I've seen him survive decapitation, so even if you beat him, expect him to return. Harry asked. There's no way that he actually acts like that. Scott shuddered and said, no, it's completely accurate. I've seen him twice. He really does spout off endless nonsense which will throw anyone off if they listen to it. Forge was looking over the damage done to the danger room wall and asked, was that the dino bone? Harry answered, yeah, sorry about that. I can see why you wanted to save that one for last. This will take a week to fix and another week to recalibrate. My system couldn't detect any energy readings off you, which made the sensors give conflicting data. Ping. New quest, greater danger. Help Forge fix danger room. Improve danger room with magic. Help danger room evolve. The quest gave Harry some ideas, so he asked, can I help? Forge looked like he was going to refuse, but after a moment of thought said, all right, but if you mess around even once, there won't be a second time. Got it. Of course, he answered. The following week returned Harry to routine, except he spent 4 hours in the morning and 4 hours in the evening helping Forge. One of Harry's goals in the past was to make his own room of requirements, but more recently he discovered that the core of the roar was a concentrated eye of magic which was actually constructed using instructions from the Dark Hold and was what gave birth the chaotic forces needed to make something so impossible. A side effect of this, however, was that Thon could witness the contents of the roar and all within whenever he wanted. Harry had initially given up on making one, but with the quest he received, he was now considering the means of combining his half-finished roar with the technology of the danger room. The danger room's systems were basically made of spaceship parts. The gravity generator could make the occupants feel like they were standing on a slope when they were upright, and the wiring, air conditioning, heater, and cooling system of the spaceship could be used to make lightning, fire, ice, and wind in the enclosed space. These combined with the hard light projections gave the danger room a lot of possibilities as a training space. However, there was much the danger room could not do. A lot of computing power had to be put into minute details, such as the impact force of bullets to be both realistic and non-lethal to those who failed to dodge in time. Every twitch of the force field while being impacted had to be calculated, and even Forge's best computing system couldn't cope with multiple users fighting within, which was why the combat simulator could only be used for individuals, not groups. There was just not enough computing power. Harry wrote out a ward scheme which used the same systems as the current danger room but focused on control to handle a majority of the computations automatically. Basically, the magic would handle the tiny stuff and the mundane systems would doing the heavy lifting. The only issue was that Harry needed a way to allow the danger room to control the magic without a wizard directing it. He was looking through the software when he noticed something that stood out. Harry took the tablet he was using to look through the software over to Forge and asked, what's with the AI in here? Forge stopped assembling some replacement parts and said, there's no AI in the danger room. The software can adapt, but it can't grow beyond its storage space. Harry said, the timestamps on the program history shows the baseline reaction sensors have been updating irregularly. If you're not the one doing that, who is? Forge grabbed the tablet and looked over the readings Harry noticed. A moment later he marched to the main terminal and looked for the same lines to confirm it wasn't a mistake. 5 minutes of browsing later and Forge shouted, damn it. I can't believe he would do this. Harry asked, who did what? Forge answered, there's a block in my head preventing me from noticing what you showed me. This AI has been here for a while, probably from the ship. All the systems that would show the AI's activities have been placed under hidden files, meaning you can only look for it passively, not actively. You'd never find it in here unless you already knew it was there. The only person who has the clearance needed to do this and place those blocks in my head is... Harry sighed. After a moment he said, if I could figure out why he did it without raising suspicion, would you be willing to help? Forge asked, what did you have in mind? After going over the plan, Forge got one of the professor's spare wheelchairs and Harry opened one of the 2 crates he hadn't opened earlier. They contained vibranium and adamantium. Forge looked over and said, mind if I buy some of this? There are a few projects I could really use it for. Harry considered it and said, only if you let me help you build it. I can swear on my magic not to steal your work, but I'd like to use it as a learning experience. Forge considered it. He was in fact one of, if not the most brilliant inventor on the planet, and personal lessons from him were not in fact inferior in value to the weight of these metals he wanted to use, so it was a fair deal. All right. But you don't need to swear not to use it, just ask permission and give me a cut if you make money off anything you learn from me. And with that they had a deal. Harry used some vibranium and etched it into the replacement wheelchair along with a long-term diagnosis spell. If the professor sat in the chair for a full day, it would give a complete framework of his mind. Forge was quite peeved that he had been manipulated to ignore an AI and had already created an interface to speak with it. The first thing Forge did was ask for forgiveness that he didn't notice it earlier. The AI was pretty pissed, but not at Forge, and when asked for forgiveness it was given without issue. According to her, and Forge was the one who declared it a she, the AI had sent a message to Xavier asking what she was not long after the assimilation of the spaceship into the danger room, and the professor decided to keep it under wraps. He typed in a core command to never harm the students, then locked her away beneath the software. The next day Harry sent a discreet spell at Xavier's chair and fried it without anyone being the wiser. Forge got out the replacement chair and said he'd have the old one fixed the following day. When they got the chair back, Harry looked over the diagnosis spell with Forge. Forge didn't use magic, but that was just preference. He certainly knew how to use it and could read of the diagnosis as well as Harry could. Both let out a depressed sigh at the results and weren't sure what to think. Danger, which is what the AI called itself, had been kept up to date on their plans and wanted to know what they found. Forge summarized it for her, and afterwards even she felt unsure about it. Xavier, it seemed, wanted to become a symbol that others could get behind. He had succeeded in that, without using his powers on others. Many politicians believed in him and stood behind him, which is what protected the X-Men from the extremists in the government. The problem, however, was that he was human. He had his own character flaws which would get in the way of his goals. So he cheated. He used his own abilities on himself to seal away the negative and darker aspects of his personality. And because he believed he succeeded, he subconsciously believed sealing some parts of the mind was a viable solution to some problems. Harry had been trying to figure out how Xavier could have rationalized what he did to Jean, and it seemed that because he had sealed part of his own mind, he wasn't in fact thinking rationally. Thankfully, according to the readings anyways, the only minds he did anything like that to were Jean and Forge. He accessed Logan's mind to try to fix his memories, accessed Beast's mind to walk him through gaining control over his base impulses, and accessed Aurora's mind to help her control her emotions, but did nothing to affect them like he had Jean or Forge. Forge could see this as well from the readings and quickly figured out that Harry had already discovered Jean's tampering, which was why he wanted to do this in the first place. When he asked about it, Harry said he had it covered and Forge didn't bring it up again. Rather than hold it against him, Forge decided to pity the professor. He had sacrificed his own mind to become more than just a man, but in doing so he may have lost a core part of his humanity. He explained his reasoning to Danger, who also decided not to take action against the man, though she wouldn't forgive him so easily. She calculated that one day he would face the consequences of his actions, so there was no need to do anything to him. Such a man was his own worst enemy and didn't need assistance in being torn down. Once Harry understood how knowledgeable Forge was on magic, he directly brought out his ideas for modifications to the Danger Room using aspects stolen off the Room of Requirements. All they had to do was tie the AI Danger to the rune control scheme, and that would allow inhumanely precise control and near limitless possibilities. Danger understood that she could easily use what was being given to her to harm the students. It wasn't difficult to figure out ways around the core command, but she also understood she was being trusted with this power and wanted to keep that trust. Harry and Forge spent nearly every minute of the following weekend in the Danger Room, and food would often be brought to them to ensure they didn't go without. Forge showed Harry how to build what was basically a quantum computing core using vibranium and magic by introducing Harry to some of the properties of vibranium he had no idea were possible. With this, Danger would have more processing power than the rest of New York combined. Much of Forge's tech used the principles of magic, meaning he was far ahead of Harry in that field, which Harry was quite pleased with. No point in having a teacher who wasn't smarter than you. The best part was that Harry had a lot of ideas for things he wanted to make which required processors he couldn't fabricate, but using a magic processor and the adaptation technique Forge showed him he was no longer limited as much. And he now had a perfect understanding for how hard light technology worked. The material required to build it didn't exist on Earth, but Harry thought of a few substitutions he could make using sonic modulation on existing materials to change their properties to match what he needed. In addition to things he stole from the Room of Requirement, Harry also included some rudimentary Time Lord math he stabilized with space expansion charms to make the inside of the Danger Room far larger than it should be. Forge had to check the numbers a few times, and though he didn't understand block transfer computations, he could figure out the scale of the effect and work with it without issue. Of course, it only worked because they used adamantium to inscribe the runes and fifth-dimensional math, which ensured the time-space wouldn't collapse. The final addition was that Harry inscribed Danger's processor with anti-magic shielding. It wasn't the same type the goblins made him swear never to spread, but since Harry already knew 5 different ways to make something magic-proof at this point, that wasn't an issue. This would ensure Danger couldn't be hacked by a technopath or a superior AI if she ever encountered one. The Tuesday after the second weekend since they started, the project was finally finished. Ping. Quest complete, Greater Danger. Reward, Mindscape copy. The pair weren't exactly subtle in their mad scientist montage, and everyone at the school knew they too were up to something, but no one had any clue as to what the result would be. The students and staff assembled outside the entrance to the Danger Room, and with a bit of fanfare, Forge said, "Ladies and gentlemen. And Logan, I present to you, Danger." He opened the door to reveal the same empty space everyone was familiar with. Nothing looked different or out of place. However, a moment later a group of lights appeared and gathered together to create a form which took the appearance of a beautiful Caucasian woman with silver hair. Evan was the first to break the silence. "You built a girlfriend." A few chuckles rolled through the crowd, and Forge said flatly, "Haha, Evangelist Danger is the AI who will be designing new simulations for the X-Men. Cross her at your own peril." Danger smiled and turned around, walking further into the room while motioning for others to follow her. Xavier's concerned face was noticed by Logan and Aurora, but when Forge and Harry walked into the room and the rest followed, they remained silent on it and followed in as well. As they entered, the room changed into a forest next to a lake with a log cabin set at the edge. Logan was the first to notice the difference. Harry had already learned that Logan's senses were superior to others, which was why when he first met him, his illusions had no effect. Logan could smell the real Harry among his doppelgangers. Logan took in an audible breath and examined the trees, birds, and water. Harry walked over and asked him, "How's the smell?" Without showing surprise, he answered, smells like nature. Evan went over to the lake and said, this hologram looks really good. Danger smiled and walked over to him from behind and pushed him into the lake with a smile. Evan fell in with a splash and got out moments later, completely soaked. Hey, what's going on here? Isn't this a hard light hologram? Danger answered in a bell-like voice, it is at the core, but there are now layers over that which far more accurately depict reality. She walked over to Forge and kissed him on the cheek, which the blush he showed made others realize that felt like a real kiss. Kitty walked up to Danger and asked, why do you look familiar? Danger smiled and said, I choose this form myself, though I did use Ms. Monroe as a base. By human standards she is most beautiful. I hope you don't mind. Logan grunted, at least she's got good taste. Ororo smacked his shoulder and answered back, not at all. It is a pleasure to meet you. The group spent half an hour exploring and a few realized the open space was larger than the danger room should be, which confused many of the students and had Dr. McCoy jumping around various trees to analyze the realism of the forest environment. He had nothing but praise for it, complimenting the texture of the wood when he was climbing and the variety of lifelike insects he found through the canopy. After a full hour, Ororo told everyone it was dinner time and said Harry had no choice but to come along as he hadn't had dinner with the others in over 2 weeks. Harry accepted since he needed time to decompress before he started on another project and he had been neglecting the study group. He'd ask for forgiveness and hoped they wouldn't kick him out. Harry was the last to enter the dining room and as soon as he came through, everyone shouted, surprise! Happy birthday, Harry! Harry looked at the colorful streamers, the decoration, and the chocolate cake on the table, and even with all that, it still took him a moment to remember today's date was in fact his birthday. Birthdays weren't really celebrated in Camartage and Harry was always too wrapped up in various projects to celebrate it himself. Sirius threw him a party for his 12th birthday and Hermione and Neville showed up, but this was the first surprise party he'd ever had, and the second birthday party he'd experienced. Harry blew out the candles after the lame birthday song was sung aloud and Harry cut the cake to get the first slice while Beast distributed the remaining slices for everyone else. Harry was barraged with questions about the last 2 weeks, which included a lot of nonsense about if he could do the same for their rooms. Harry noticed Forget-Me-Not in the corner and went over to the table to get a slice of cake for him since Beast forgot to. However, on his way over to deliver the cake, the girl he knew as Rogue came around the corner and they walked into each other and fell over. Harry's hand touched her exposed arm, which caused her to freeze up, but Harry didn't feel anything. The room became silent and several others saw this. Rogue looked down at where Harry was holding her with wide eyes. With this, Harry had decided on his next project. Chapter 35, Chapter 35 Lost Children. Shortly after Harry's party came to a conclusion, Harry was called to Xavier's office with Rogue and Logan. The moment he entered the door, he got a notification. Ping. New quest, Rogue Powers. Assist Anne-Marie with gaining control over her powers. Harry was going to do it anyways, but the quest notification still made him smile. The Ancient One had already concluded that any completed quest would do good for the world, which meant Rogue gaining control over her powers would be a great thing. Harry's trust in the quest prompts was one of the reasons he had rationalized giving Danger so much freedom, and he was quite proud of his accomplishment. After entering Xavier's office, Rogue removed a glove and they confirmed through some simple tests that Rogue's power had not changed, it simply didn't affect Harry. Xavier stated, Rogue's powers have, to this point, been uncontrollable in nature. I feel this discovery may perhaps be a clue to unraveling a means to provide that control. Harry had heard a number of things about her power from a few of the students, especially Bobby. Children gossip after all, it was in their nature. However, he still wanted to hear answers from the source. Harry answered Xavier, maybe, but I'd like a few more details to work with. He turned to Rogue and asked, can you describe your power? Give me as many details as you can, please. The look of both hope and pain in her eyes seemed to be fighting each other, but after a moment of silence she let out a sigh and answered in a Southern Belle accent. Well, when I touch someone, I feel like I become that person, just for a little while. The longer I touch them, the more that person I become and the longer the effect's gonna last. When I do it to a mutant, I get their powers too. Harry mulled over that for a moment and asked, what's it like to become someone else? She shook her head, I don't know, it's like, I go away just a bit and someone else steps in. I'm them. I get some of their memories and sometimes I forget I'm me. Logan added, even after the power or memories wear off, she'll sometimes gain personality traits of those she touches. Those wear off too, but the length of time's not always the same. Harry felt a few dots connecting to a conclusion he'd never have thought of. Harry looked up to Logan and asked with an educated guess, did your personality traits last longer in her than other people? Logan remained motionless for a moment before giving a curt nod. Harry added, do you trust her and trust her with your power? Xavier picked up on the direction he was going and asked, you think the length of the effect is determined by the donor's connection to Rogue? Rogue's eyes widened for a bit and said, that would explain Mystique. Still got a bit of her in here somewhere, she said while pointing at her head. Harry figured that meant she'd copied the shapeshifter at some point and they weren't strangers. He turned to Xavier and said, in any case, the reason she can't get anything from me is simple, my power trumps hers. She turned to Harry with a partially offended look which forced Harry to quickly explain himself to avoid a misunderstanding, I mean I can absorb things as well. She can't absorb from another absorber, it cancels out. Harry was pretty sure they'd buy his excuse since it was close enough to the truth. His mutant power was keeping the energy-infused Obscurus particles that made up his body together in the shape of a human. If Rogue could absorb the energy contained within his Obscurus particles, it would likely cause his form to break down. So his power was directly resisting her power. Not that he knew his power would win out over hers. He was quite worried when he first touched her because the worst-case scenario was that she could permanently absorb all the energy of his particles, leading to a permanent death. Rogue's posture visibly slumped at Harry's answer, but Xavier said, "But it seems you have a few ideas, Mr. Potter." Harry nodded. Dealing with magic is basically just dealing with different types of energies. Rogue's ability to absorb and use energies is not impossible to duplicate with magic. Therefore, there are means of training that could prove useful to her. Logan asked, "There are normal guys who can train to do that?" Harry nodded and explained, "They require a great deal of talent, but in essence, yes. I know of one guy who can permanently drain all the energy out of a person by touching them. Not that he has done so. That is simply an application of what he can do, not the purpose he trains for." Rogue asked, "Why not? Is there a reason he doesn't?" Harry figured she wanted to know if there were consequences to doing so she didn't know about. After considering it for a moment he said, "I'll tell you later. It is relevant to you, but there is no need for others to know his business," Harry answered while gesturing to Xavier and Logan. Neither found it offensive such information was not shared with them as long as he would give it freely to Rogue. It was obvious they both cared about her. Harry and Rogue were excused and Harry took Rogue's ungloved hand and dragged her over to an empty study. He felt the presence of a certain flame as well as the recently caved-in space that accompanied the arrival of a certain blue prankster behind the open door. Harry didn't mind, he just didn't want Xavier to be analyzing the pair as he gave her the info. Harry sat Rogue down and said, "You want to know the consequences of absorbing the energy of someone else? Well, the main issue is the taint. The only person you should be is you. When you are someone else, the real you becomes lost. If that guy I know goes around permanently absorbing the energy of everyone he could, he'd certainly become more powerful, but he would permanently lose himself to the taint gained from others, and at the end of the day, the one standing in his shoes would not be him, but someone else. A stranger with his memories." Rogue looked frustrated and tried to say without yelling, "But they keep tellin' me I need to practice my powers, which means usin' M as much as I can. You're sayin' the more I use M, the less me I become." Harry considered it and said, "Yes, but I don't think it should be that way. Those pieces of others who affect your personality can be considered taint. But this is your power, it shouldn't bring you harm if you're using it right. There should be a way to use it without absorbing taint and remaining yourself." Rogue got up and said, "Don't you think I've been trying? It's all or nothing every time I touch anyone. I can't, She lost her energy and fell back into the couch with a depressed slump. Harry sat down and said, "I don't think it's your fault. You may have accumulated too much taint already. There should be a part of your mind you can use to control your power, but it's so gunked up that it's numb to you, preventing you from feeling it out." Rogue sat in silence for a few moments before saying, "When my powers first kicked in, I was kissin' a boyfriend. It was my first kiss. I didn't know what kisses were supposed to feel like, I just thought it was a hell of a kiss." After a moment of silence she added, "He's still in a coma." Harry let out a sigh and said, "That's probably what numbed you then. So that's it for me?" she asked quietly. Harry shook his head, "No. We need to remove the taint and get you back to a clean slate." "Professor already tried that," she listlessly replied. Harry continued, "He could likely remove the mental aspects, but not the energy, connection, and life force aspects. Taint is not so easily removed. It's supposed to be a consequence of taking what shouldn't be taken. You just got the short end of the straw." "Story of my life," she replied smoothly. Harry took her hand again and said, "Hey, I'm pretty creative all right. Don't give up hope. If nothing else, I promise that if you ever need a hand to hold or a shoulder to cry on, I'll be available, okay?" Rogue turned to Harry with glistening eyes and said, Can I have a hug?" Harry smiled and pulled her into a hug. She felt her first touch of human warmth in who knows how long, and a moment later she started sobbing. Harry patted her back and held her tight until she let it out. Outside the room Harry could tell that Jean was using subtle suggestions to the kids walking around to avoid the room, and Kurt was threatening terrifying pranks to those who looked like they were approaching. They were both making sure no one disturbed Rogue's moment. Harry really smiled at that. This whole place treated even the outcasts like family. When Rogue was done, she apologized to Harry, who said there was nothing to apologize for. She thanked him, and after taking a few moments to dry her eyes, she left. Harry moved his hand to the side just as Kurt teleported in and flicked his forehead reflexively as he appeared. Jean had hitched a ride teleporting in as well after first teleporting out of the hallway to prevent Rogue from seeing the peepers. Jean cried out, "We're not peepers." Harry smiled and said, "I didn't say anything," though he did think it. Jean rolled her eyes and after letting out a sigh said, "Thanks for helping Rogue. A lot of us really know how bad it is to have no control over their powers, and she's always been one of the worst cases." Kurt rubbed his forehead and said, "Yeah, I have it pretty bad because of how I look, but at least I can be touched. Chicks dig the blue fuzz too." He smiled confidently and nodded while Jean seemed to be questioning her choices in acquaintances. Harry turned to Kurt and said, "Forge, and I came up with a few neat breakthroughs with hard light and hologram tech while upgrading the danger room. I'll see what can be done about a hard light hologram disguise for you." Kurt didn't hide his surprise and asked, "You can do that?" Harry gave it a moment to roll the idea through his head and allowed a few points to click together and said, I can try. If it works though, the hard light will press your tail against you, preventing it from swinging around like an extra layer of clothes over everything. It might be uncomfortable. Kurt did a backflip and said, no problem. Going outside nowadays needs like 5 layers already just to hide my features. I'd love an alternative. Harry nodded and said, might take a few months though. Not for the fabrication, but for the program that writes over your appearance. Writing the whole thing myself would take too long, but I set up the program to write itself after preparing a few things. Danger might be able to help, so I'll head down later to ask her. Kit's smile was infectious and he practically cried out, oh thank you Harry. I can't wait. He then teleported out. Probably to tell others. Jean said, for someone who considers helping people just a hobby, you certainly put a lot of effort into it. Harry smiled and said, have you finally gone through the books on my life and my head? Jean turned away for a moment before saying, I'm sorry. For what? I did look at some memories of your childhood. I saw those awful people. Harry sighed and said, my life before the age of 10 wasn't exactly something that you'd find in a children's story. He hoped she'd pick something more interesting than that. Now however she felt guilty for looking at something so painful. When it comes to pain, there are usually 2 types of people. There are those who show off their pain to others hoping to garner sympathy for attention or an advantage. And there are those who hide their pain from others because they feel it makes them look weak. Harry obviously wasn't the former, which usually by default would make him the latter. Had it not been for his hundreds of years enjoying a family in the afterlife, he figured he probably would be. Jean asked, so things got better. Harry hesitated on answering. After a moment he said, look it up yourself. You wouldn't believe me if I told you what happened, but yes, things got better. Deciding to change subjects, Jean started going over her progress in occlumency, imagery practice, and mental discipline. She was slowly, brick by brick, building up a solid foundation of a mind. While thinking about how much work one normally had to go to build things inside the mind, Harry went over the new feature he got from his last quest. Mindscape copy. It basically took all the work he used to have to do and put it to shame. Harry already had started up a primitive mindscape as a form of mental discipline and knew that to make it worth something, he'd have to put months and years of work into it, even using his various cheats. Mindscape copy however literally let him copy something directly into his mindscape. He could already do something similar with items in his inventory, but now he could do so with things that could not be placed inside his inventory. As long as Harry had enough details on something, he could place a copy of nearly anything into his mindscape. While trying it out, he already created a perfect copy of the tutorial village and the surrounding areas, Hogwarts and Hogsmeade, Camartage, and almost the whole of London. They weren't empty either. They had copies of people walking around like NPCs. He could even copy places the Ancient One showed him while exploring the astral plane. Harry even found he could copy things like the Basilisk, Voldemort's Death Eaters, and the monsters he fought in the astral plane and during battle mediation. Of course, they did not yield experience when defeated, but it was useful as practice for fighting. That being said, he couldn't copy Voldemort since it was Goose who beat him and he couldn't copy the Mandarin since Harry never beat him. The most useful aspect was that he could grind his paths through combat with the copies, though fighting something you already defeated yielded very little to path rank advancement, but it did give Harry a practice ground for different strategies. Of course, not everything could be copied. His copy of Hogwarts didn't have a working room of requirements, and if he copied the X-Mansion, it wouldn't have a working danger room. Once Jean had given him her progress report, Harry gave her a new exercise to practice, the art of folding and unfolding sections of the mind. Harry's scan of Xavier showed him how he folded and unfolded sections of his own mind to lock things away. Although he never intended Jean to lock parts of herself away, she needed to learn to unfold her mind using Xavier's method to unlock the phoenix trapped within. Harry explained the dangers of folding the mind permanently and said this was just an exercise that would help her. The following days returned to routine. School would start in another 2 weeks, so it wouldn't be long before more students would be returning to the mansion. Harry finally had near unlimited access to Forge's lab, so he could use the tools to make his own gizmos now, and there were too many things he wanted to make. Harry knew of course that he didn't really need toys. He didn't need sorcery either. As long as the opponent wasn't magically stronger than he was, there wasn't a single opponent Harry couldn't beat with wizard magic. He didn't even need to be fancy. Voldemort and the Tri-Wizard Tournament Cup proved how easy it was to weaponize portkeys. Harry could set a portkey as destination to the middle of the ocean and just throw it at a target. If they couldn't resist the magic, it was instant defeat. Harry could even make a heavy-duty magic cage and set that as the destination. It wouldn't even be hard. If an opponent couldn't resist magic, Harry could stun them, shrink them, turn them into a frog, or remove all their memories. And that was just using the legal spells he had. There were 3 reasons Harry did not. The first was that anyone who did not have magic resistance would be a small fry to begin with. Magic resistance just means the body possesses energy that would resist changes caused by exotic energy. That speedster, Petro, had time energy in his body. It wasn't a lot, but he would likely be able to resist some magic, so even if he touched a portkey, he'd likely be able to resist long enough to release the object and not get sent to the North Pole. Harry also heard about the Brotherhood's leader, Magneto. That guy sounded like a sorcerer highly proficient in electromagnetic energy. he could definitely resist most magics. Not that such people were immune. The ability to resist magic just means that a stunner wouldn't put them down 100% of the time and a cutting curse wouldn't cut as deeply. Strong magic resistance just means it would be a fair fight compared to an easy victory. The second reason was the outward effect. Wizard magic still fried electronics and getting around that was a giant pain. Even danger wasn't a perfect attempt. The wizard magic he gave to her to use would be buried under layers of other things, but if any electronics stayed in the danger room for too long, it would likely have corrupted data. Danger and Forge however felt this was acceptable as it would prevent someone from leaving undetectable foreign hardware within. And the final reason was that he wanted it to be a trump card, or better yet, a prank. Why do things the easy way when he can do it the fun way? Why turn your foe into a frog when you can project a hologram around them making it look like their gender changed and they're in a pink dress? Why teleport someone into a cage when you can traumatize them with pranks into turning themselves in? Of course, that was just for fun. Harry still had a few hundred Portkea galleons with a destination of the North Pole in his inventory. He made them before losing his ability to make portals to be used if needed. If lives were on the line, there would be no shenanigans and no mercy. Until then he was going to continue having fun. Harry's current project was just what he told Kurt. Exterior hardlight holograms. He wanted to make a floating sphere he could throw that would track and follow those he threw it at. If the hologram he had in mind worked out, the sphere would be overlaid with an image of the head of the person he threw it at. It would also be on fire and screaming, though he needed to work on the audio. Harry imagined someone acting like a big, tough, bad guy, and suddenly Harry throws their own flaming head at them which stares them in the eye while flying at them while screaming in horror in their own voice. Spurred on by imaging how traumatizing that would be for others was great motivation and Harry got to work right away. Unfortunately, Harry was interrupted 3 days into his project with a phone call. Only Hermione, Sirius, and the Ancient One had his number, and Hermione called a few days ago and Sirius still hadn't figured out how to use a phone. Harry answered it and unsurprisingly, it was the Ancient One. Through the phone she said, "Hello Harry, Camartage has a mission for you." "Oh, what's going on?" "Well, some of the acolytes brought a matter to my attention that was discovered through the forum of that website you made. Some investigations were being done using the website and from the pictures posted on the signs there is a demon kidnapping children from an orphanage in a small town in Pennsylvania." Harry was already putting away the equipment in the lab as he asked, "You know I'm not going to refuse to help, but why ask me?" The Ancient One answered, "From what I can tell, the children at the orphanage consists almost entirely of mutant children. Due to this fact, rather than sending backup, it would be advisable to inform your new acquaintances and have them assist you instead. Ping. New quest, rescue the orphan mutants from Enister. Protect and rescue the captured orphans before they are sacrificed by Enister. Rescue the remaining orphaned mutants from Nanny and Orphan Maker." "Ah, I got a quest," Harry commented before reading off the details over the phone. The Ancient One said, "Well, that confirms a few theories I had. You cannot get a quest to something that is unrelated to you or something you have no knowledge about." Harry wasn't angry but he still had to ask, "That was a test?" "Of course it was. Knowledge about your circumstances will prove vital to using your abilities wisely in the future." Harry answered, "True. Have you heard of Enister?" Harry had memorized the Grand Grimoire but although that made him an expert of the 72 demons Solomon commanded and a number of others, that didn't mean he knew them all. There were probably more demons than there were humans if you actually did the numbers. Demons existed on many planes after all. The Ancient One answered, "It is not a name I am familiar with in the past or future. That means this is the first time I've encountered it." Harry didn't let that disappoint him and asked, "Is the forum for that post still up?" The Ancient One confirmed it was and hung up. Harry pulled up access to the internet and went into the site before reading the details and printing them out. At the site of the disappearance were some strange symbols and one of the more clever officers at the town searched for similar symbols on the internet which lead them to a match on Harry's website which lead the officer to the forum Harry made sure was followed by some of the more tech-savvy acolytes in Camartage. The officer who posted in the forum also gave some details on some things he saw at the orphanage. They were passed off as something else, but the Ancient One recognized it as signs that the children were mutants. The quest pop-up even proved it. Harry prints out the relevant information and heads over to Xavier's office. As the head of the school so close to reopening, he was quite busy and was currently going through a pile of paperwork on his desk. Seeing this, Harry paused and went over his options. He remembered that most of the X-Men and teachers had actually been out as they were currently being sent to the homes of the students to escort them back to the institute. This was done to ensure the safety of the students and to prevent incidents, but it also meant that the bulk of the veteran X-Men were currently out. Logan remained because he was not a people person and was partially charged with security for the institute. However, him heading out as well would leave the remaining children vulnerable. Harry unpaused and asked Xavier, when is Storm, Colossus, or Domino returning? In Harry's opinion, of the first-gen X-Men who remained at the school as teachers, those three were the best to bring because they were strong and good with children. Beast couldn't act in public until the hard light disguise was working and the less said about Forge and children the better. The man was brilliant and knew how to teach, but he wasn't exactly the sympathetic ear a kidnapped orphan would need. Xavier didn't miss the urgency in his voice and answered, Ms. Monroe should be returning in 3 days while Mr. Rasputin and Ms. Thurman will not be returning until next Monday. What is the matter? Harry sighed and put the papers he'd printed out on Xavier's desk and summarized, there seems to be an orphanage in Pennsylvania that has a lot of mutant kids and someone or something capable of using darker magics have been kidnapping them. My teacher called me and let me know and asked if I would handle it since the victims were mutants. Xavier looked pensive as he read through the papers and commented, I was not aware of any such gathering of mutant children. However, Harry's documents were easy to review and the prevalent points about the orphanage and the signs within certainly seemed to indicate the presence of perhaps multiple mutants. But an orphanage of mutants? That was hard to believe as even the act of gathering mutants was not so simple. He should know. Xavier's chair rolled out from his desk and he said, let's visit Cerebro, have this looked into. I'll have Logan meet us on the way. Harry followed him out of the office and shortly after Logan showed and was handed the papers Harry had given the professor. Down 3 flights of stairs they encountered a massive door that was unlocked by Xavier's biometrics. A synthesized voice echoed out, welcome professor, upon the door's opening which made no sense to Harry. There was no such voice or automated AI system in any other part of the Institute's systems besides danger. Harry sighed and figured it was for atmosphere. Cerebro was a massive hollowed-out sphere with a platform in the center and a single walkway extending to it from the entrance. The platform had a control system in the center and a metal helmet. The trio headed in as the door closed behind them while Logan continued reading. The occasional growls he released while going through the information clearly gave his stance on such matters. A warrior like him had an innate protective instinct for children after all. Xavier put on the helmet and said, this is your first time in Cerebro, please remain still while it is active. Harry gave a bare nod as the room came alive with images. The images themselves were not holograms or electronic displays. They were mental projections of Xavier's senses, enhanced many times over through the massive amplifier and displayed in the empty space for observers to see. Xavier concentrated on the coordinates of the orphanage in Pennsylvania, but once he did, the images around them began to distort. Logan asked, what's going on, Charles? It was apparent he had not seen something like this before. Xavier frowned and said, something is dulling my senses through Cerebro. I need a moment to compensate. The images became clearer then fuzzier then clearer again as he seemed to try different tricks to get around the interference. Moments later the images returned to perfect clarity. Ah, there we go. Now let us see what has been hidden. The images zoomed in and the outline of a building became clear as well as the outline of 24 children, all glowing orange. In the same building in the basement there appeared to be a blue glow and another orange glow, though the shapes of both were distorted. From what Harry could tell, humans glowed blue and mutants glowed orange on this display. Harry asked, can you find any groups of mutants nearby? The building zoomed out and the map grew to display more area, but other than the individual orange dots scattered about, there were no other groups. After another moment of searching, the professor sighed and the images cut as he removed his helmet. Logan asked, what was that about? Xavier answered, there is something in that town which shrouds my senses. Had it blocked my senses completely, it would be more noticeable, but as it only numbed it, I could not notice the mutants within had I not specifically been looking for them in that small area. Logan didn't look surprised, so someone figured out how to hide from you. The tone of his voice made it seem like he'd been expecting it to happen at some point. Xavier nodded and said, indeed, though I cannot be certain if the one they are hiding from is myself or perhaps another. In any case, I was unable to get a reading on the minds of anyone in that town. To gather more information, we'll need a closer look. Logan glanced back at the papers and said, I got a bad feeling about this, Chuck. I don't think waiting for the others is a good call. It might be too late by then. Xavier frowned pensively. He knew this was not going to be easy. Chapter 36. Chapter 36 Monsters and Demons. After discussing the various possibilities and Harry's educated guesses, it was decided to call in Warren Worthington III, also known as Angel, the economics teacher for the Institute. Once he arrived, Angel would take Shadowcat, Pixie, the whole of the 3rd X-Men team, and Harry in the X-Men's jet, the Blackbird, to Pennsylvania. Unlike the other teachers, Angel was not fetching students at the moment. Rather, he was still in New York handling various matters of the business he owned. Harry had learned not long ago that this Angel-winged economics teacher was the owner of Worthington Industries. Since getting into business himself 3 years ago, Harry had pretty much memorized all the largest businesses and their various subsidiaries. Worthington Industries owned the handful of airline companies which produced the most advanced and sophisticated aviation technologies in the world. They also owned several companies that produced alternative fuels which freed their airlines from the oil market. They also owned one company that produced fancy frozen yogurts. Harry was not sure why. After getting into contact with Warren, Xavier confirmed he was on his way and would be arriving within the hour. Harry used that time to look up the so-called orphanage. There were no public records of it, but the records that mentioned it indirectly stated it was set up a year and a half ago and was called Nanny's Lost Boys and Girls. Harry assumed it was a Peter Pan reference, though not exactly clever. Warren arrived after Harry finished what little investigations he could and was given the details. After looking over the paperwork Harry pulled out, Warren said, I've made it my business over the last 5 years to help mutants, but I've never heard of a mutant orphanage, especially not one so close to home. This seems more than a little suspicious. In case worse comes to worse, I'll make a few calls now to ensure arrangements are made. He didn't elaborate, but Harry knew what Angel meant. If they had to take the orphanage down, there would be a lot of homeless kids to take care of. Xavier's Institute was a high school-level boarding school with over 100 rooms, but that didn't give him permission to just bring everyone over. There were legal processes required before such a thing could be sanctioned. Thankfully, money talks. Between Xavier's connections and Warren's wealth, they were going to make sure whatever was done in the best interests of the children. Before heading into the briefing, Harry went to his room to invite Forget-Me-Not. Marrow was with Domino, so the members of the second X-Men team at the mansion were just Pixie and Shadowcat, who were both coming. Harry hadn't gotten a confirmation, but he figured Forget-Me-Not was as well. When he entered the room, Goose was sitting on her enchanted bed and Forget-Me-Not was out. Harry asked Goose, "Do you know where Forget-Me-Not went?" Goose looked up and answered through their connection, "He left a few hours ago." Harry sighed and was about to leave when he turned back and asked, "Hey Goose, do you want to come fight demons and rescue orphans?" After a moment of contemplation, Goose asked, "Are you going alone?" "No, I'll have backup." Goose rolled over to get more comfortable and conveyed back, "Perhaps next time." Harry figured as much but felt she would appreciate being asked even if she was likely to decline. Harry grabbed a backpack and filled it with stuff from his inventory before heading back to the briefing. Warren said, "Now that everyone's here, let's get started." The papers Harry had printed out had been scanned into a projector Warren used to explain the details for everyone. Warren asked Harry, "Do you recognize what kind of magic this could be?" Harry nodded and took out necklaces and cheap trinkets for everyone before answering, "More likely than not, that's demon magic. Everyone please pick something and wear it. It won't provide much protection against demon magic, but it's better than nothing." Kurt picked up a chain and examined it for a moment before stating, "This looks like cheap costume jewelry you see pop-ups to buy on the internet." Kitty said, "Yeah, this is like, tacky." Harry sighed and said, "The symbols on the tacky costume jewelry are legit though. Like I said, it's better than nothing." Someone wearing the charm would be difficult to target with demon magic, which was quite an advantage, though explaining how that worked or that the custom jewelry company that made these were ones he owned was more trouble than it was worth. Warren sighed and put on a charm bracelet and the rest followed. The plan was to investigate the kidnappings, predict the next one, rescue the kidnapped children, and if necessary, take care of the orphanage. Harry added several points to the plan, including some basic spy gear he had which allowed for hacking. This was added to the plan, and once they went over a few contingencies, they headed out to the Blackbird. The Blackbird, according to Warren, was built by his father's company and could be considered the most advanced plane on the planet. More so due to the add-ons forged used spare parts from an alien ship to upgrade it with. Jean's mind was occupied with concern over the orphans, and the fact that everyone else was concerned over the same matter wasn't helping. Harry invited her into his library where she could spend the rest of the flight in silence going over the various books within Harry's mind. Harry himself was going over the interior of the Blackbird and determining how each aspect worked. He could already tell from the coating on the surface that it had active adaptive camouflage and the engine was using fuel in a way that was far too efficient for normal jets. There was barely any heat coming off it, meaning the jet's exterior would be around the same temperature as the air outside. Warren himself was flying with Scott as co-pilot. Warren was trying to dissipate everyone's nervousness by teaching Scott how to fly it himself one day. That thought reminded Harry that he needed to magic-proof Dr. McCoy's spectrometer when he returned. Harry had yet to figure out how to make the ultimate riding broom, and he wanted to use tech to do it. The potion that was infused into a boom which allowed it to use a wizard's magic to fly had been changed over the course of hundreds of years, but that didn't mean there couldn't be improvements. In addition to that, Harry needed to expand on advertising for his gemstone company. The goblins had already openly bought the parts needed to make many machines capable of creating synthetic gemstones, so now that no one was going to ask where they got them, it was time to start producing and selling them in bulk. Harry also needed to network the goblins' computers together. They had to spread out the companies into several areas, and rather than using existing phone lines to connect the computers in different areas, Harry was just going to use magic-powered quantum entanglement connections, just like his hack boxes. The only problem was that he would need to acquire several dumb computers in each office and have them actually wired through the phone lines. If they had nothing to transmit info from one building to the other visibly, then the people who tried to hack them would find nothing to hack, which would be suspicious. Thankfully, the goblins shared his propensity for paranoia and would probably enjoy filing the dumb computers with useless info, false info, and terrible viruses. The flight to the small town was practically shorter than the prep and takeoff time due to the speed of the Blackbird and the meager distance. The Blackbird itself landed in an empty field with its active camo going and quietly landed. Most of the X-Men stayed aboard while Warren, Kitty, Jean, and Harry headed to the sheriff's office. Warren's wings were capable of pressing almost completely against his back, and beneath the long coat he wore, one wouldn't even notice the bulge on his back unless you really looked, allowing Warren to walk around without issue or stares. Unsurprisingly, the sheriff's office was quite busy due to all the recent commotion. The group headed off to the side of the building, and Harry handed Kitty a magic-proof thumbstick drive with a timed port key and said, "Just stick this in the sheriff's computer." Kitty said, "This might take a while cause I really don't want to be seen on camera." Harry nodded and took out a smoky quartz. "Stand still, this will feel like someone is dripping a running egg over you." The quartz glowed with a lumos and vanished back into his inventory as Harry cast disillusionment on Kitty, causing her to slowly become invisible. Harry could still sense her presence in space and knew she looked down at her own hands while Jean gave a smile at the novelty of such a thing and Warren looked impressed. Kitty exclaimed, "Whoa, this is like, so cool." Harry sighed and said, "You can still be heard and you're not entirely invisible. Light just moves around you, so if you stand still you're fine, but if you move, then people will see what looks like a mirage of bending light." Kitty said, "Still, this will totally make this job a cinch." She then walked directly into the wall and Harry pulled a screen and keyboard out of his bag and waited. Moments later the screen showed a connection was established and Harry started opening up and downloading files. The thumb drive had a notice me not on it, and if Harry had not drawn their attention to it when he handed it to Kitty, they would not have even looked at it. A few moments Kitty returned and Harry cast non-verbal finite incantatum to restore her to the land of the visible. To cover it up he said, "Just in time, I wasn't sure how long that would last." Kitty looked surprised and said with a bit of heat, "Couldn't you have warned me?" Warren said, "Calm down Kitty, everything worked out fine after all. Just don't assume you can rely on stuff like that in the future, alright? It's better to rely on your own skills after all." Without looking up from his computer screen, Harry pointed at Angel and stated what he said. Jean noticed Harry had gone through several pages worth of information and asked, "So what do we have?" While still scrolling through the details, Harry answered, "Well, the only kid who was actually taken from the orphanage was taken from the street in front of the orphanage. 2 others were taken from the grade school the orphans are attending and 2 others taken from the houses of friends they were playing or staying with. All within the last 3 days." Kitty sighed and said, "School is starting early here for them, huh? Bummer." Jean rolled her eyes and Warren smirked at the specific detail she chose to pay attention to. Jean looked in the direction of the orphanage and said, "Whatever the professor felt from here is definitely coming from that direction. This whole place feels like it is covered in cotton." Warren said, "So we have our next destination." Harry said, "I'd like to investigate the site of the other kidnappings to see if I can find anything the police missed." Warren considered it and said, "Take Jean with you. If you find anyone who knows anything useful, see what you can dig up." Although the man was clearly advocating the use of telepathy to invade the privacy of the minds of others, no one cared at this point as children's lives were on the line. Harry and Jean headed over to the school and Harry cast a notice me not under the idea, "Do not notice we are not supposed to be here." Once they entered the hallway, Jean asked, "What did you do? I'm not even having to use my powers to get them to ignore us." Harry turned back and smiled but remained silent. They arrived at the location where one of the kids were taken and there was a burnt circle with various burnt symbols on one of the walls. Harry released some mandalas of dimensional energy and had them spinning and scanning the various energies in the areas. Jean watched him do this and flatly accused, "You don't even need those gems, do you?" Harry continued scanning while answering, "Nope." "Then why continue with the act?" "A few reasons. Until I'm strong enough, it's best to downplay my abilities and my threat level. I'm also looking forward to the day when someone tries to take advantage of my reliance on gems and gloats to my face that without them I'm powerless. I promise to show you the memory of that guy's face when he realizes the truth. Wait, it's a prank. Among other things. You'd know that already if you read a little more about me." Harry's mandalas glowed red, then gray, then orange. The feeling of the mandalas also provided sensory feedback which gave Harry far more information than just the color did. Harry let the mandalas scatter and said, "This portal was to a different realm. I can't reopen it from this side accurately so I can't track them down." Harry knew about demons, he knew how to control demons, and he knew how to counter demons. What he did not know was demon magic. Such tomes did not exist in Camartage, so the makeup of demon magic was unknown to him and trying to track the other side of the portal was like reading directions in an unfamiliar language without a map. Jean recognized Harry's frustrated face and asked, "Not good news." Harry filled her in and they headed back to meet up with Warren and Kitty. While Harry had been snooping, Warren had directly knocked on the door of the orphanage and introduced himself and asked a few questions. When they met back up, Warren explained to Harry that Nanny was a kindly old woman who looked very worried and said she had decided the kids would have to stay in the orphanage until the mess sorted itself out. If it were not for what he already learned from Harry's investigations, the place would not seem suspicious. Warren claimed through the door he could see various children doing various activities and playing around. Deciding they needed a second look, the group returned to the orphanage once more. The perimeter had various security cameras so unless Harry made Kitty invisible again, she wouldn't be able to sneak up to the wall and get inside again. However, although they were some distance from the building, Jean claimed she could still get a read on the minds inside if she put some effort into it. They gave her about 10 minutes and when she was done, Harry didn't have to be a mind reader to know she was enraged. Warren took a step back when Jean opened her eyes. Just from an impression of the fury he could tell she felt. Mirroring Jean from earlier, Harry asked, "Not good news?" Jean lost all composure and practically snarled, "That woman is a monster. She and her partner, someone who actually calls himself Orphan Maker, find young mutants and kill their parents. They then use some kind of drug, something she calls fairy dust, to make the kids forget their parents and she takes them with her." Kitty fell backwards in shock. That's horrible." Tears started running down Jean's face as she continued through grit teeth, "My niece and nephew are in that building. They killed my older sister and made my family forget her." Warren nearly shouted, "What?" Jean held back her own sobbing while glaring at the orphanage walls and said, "My sister has been out of contact with my parents for almost a year. They killed her. They killed her and took her children. Harry put his hand on Jean's shoulder and used his own Chinook gift to enter Jean's mind and radiate a field of calm. Harry said directly to her mind, Jean, I promise you, no matter what, they will pay all right. I swear that to you. When Harry felt the peak of Jean's fury recede, he took her into a hug and held her as she started crying over the loss of her family. After Jean recovered, Warren said, the children are our priority here. What exactly is Nanny's plan? She didn't exactly look formidable. Jean answered, what you saw wasn't her. There are hologram projectors on the property. What you saw was a hologram. The real Nanny is in the basement preparing weapons for a counter-attack. Kitty asked, what's her deal? I mean, why would anyone do that? Jean took in a few breaths to calm herself before answering. She doesn't think she is doing anything wrong. She actually thinks she is rescuing children and giving them a loving home. Her mind is broken. It's filled with nursery rhymes and children's stories. Warren asked, what about the other one, Orphan Maker? Jean said, I can't get a read on him. He's in the basement too. He's wearing a cybernetic suit and is loaded with advanced weapons. The suit is built into him. He can never take it off. Kitty asked, why? Jean shook her head. I don't know. There's a reason, but I couldn't get a read on it. Harry looked around and said, I have a plan to rescue everyone, but it's not a nice one and no one is going to like it. His energy senses could tell that the grounds around the perimeter had been altered and he'd spent the last few minutes analyzing it. Warren sighed and called the remaining X-Men from the Blackbird. He didn't want to have to listen to a plan he wasn't going to like more than once. The group gathered on the other side of a hill near the orphanage. There were no buildings or streets, only trees, so it was not being monitored by anyone. Warren went over the details they found at the sheriff's office and the orphanage before Scott spoke up. So what's the plan? Harry sighed and said, there is a transfer circle written into the ground around the orphanage. It's been there for at least a week. It's limited in that it can only be activated at dusk, an hour from now, but when activated, everything within the circle will be moved to the destination point. My plan is to wait at the edge of the security perimeter and gather everyone within the circle before it goes off. That is likely to send us to where the other children were taken and we can mount an offensive to rescue them. Scott immediately objected, wait, you're gonna let the rest of the kids get kidnapped and let them get caught up in a fight between us all? Harry nodded, they're mutants too, they won't be defenseless. Scott replied, they're kids? That's not acceptable. Harry blankly stared at Scott and said, well, since you elected to speak up, you must already have a better idea. I'm all ears. Scott fidgeted and said, well, no, but we're not going through with this plan. We should think up a different plan together. Harry continued staring blankly at him and stated, I can't guarantee the transfer circle will activate if the orphans are missing. That's probably why it hasn't gone off yet. They weren't all there until now. I have no means of knowing where the kidnapped orphans are. I'm confident I can get us back no matter where we are taken, but if we are not taken, the missing orphans are never coming back on their own. This plan takes into account the limits of everyone here. You can't just hope our limits increase because the outcome of those limits are not acceptable. If you think we should rely on a miracle instead of our own abilities, you shouldn't have bothered coming. Scott visibly flinched at that and looked over the group in the hope someone would have a better idea. He knew he didn't have one but couldn't accept that putting the lives of others at risk was ever acceptable. Warren sighed and said, Scott, we don't have another way to save everyone. If you don't like it, then become stronger and wiser, so that in the future you'll have better options. That goes for all of you. He gestured to the remaining X-Men. Harry double-checked to make sure the X-Men each had one of his trinkets and they assembled at the edge of the orphanage's security field. He layered a weak notice me nod over the group and waited in silence. 30 seconds before dusk, Harry signaled for the group to move in. Alarms echoed from the sirens in the property and floodlights illuminated the area. By the time the group reached the building, the last light of the sun vanished behind the horizon and the sky shifted to dark red. Once the scenery changed, Harry got out a diamond and caused it to glow for a moment before he conjured more scanning-type mandalas. Sorcerer magic was very good at scanning dimension and spatial coordinates. The group quickly noticed that the haunting red sky was filled with winged, purple-skinned creatures of various sizes and forms. The moment Harry confirmed his readings, he paused. The location had shifted to a corridor of limbo. It was not easy to directly take mortals to another plane, but this corridor was basically created to be a welcoming mat. That was good news, getting them back wouldn't be difficult. The good news ended there however. Harry was pretty certain anyone who wanted mutant children wouldn't be too high up on the food chain when it came to demons, but he realized he had miscalculated. Limbo was one of the stronger infernal planes and a demon who could make a corridor to limbo was not someone who could be easily trifled with. Harry couldn't move very far while paused, but he was able to get a better idea of the surroundings and the enemy numbers. Thankfully the demons were just grunts. He couldn't spot a single elite in any of the groups he spied. Of course those groups numbered about 5,000, but the situation wasn't hopeless. Demons didn't like to share, so they wouldn't swarm a group in large numbers. That meant it would be a series of group battles. Harry unpaused and shouted, Scott and Jean with me, we're going to rescue the kids. Everyone else, hold the position and protect the orphans. Once we've gotten the kids we can get out of here. Harry technically wasn't in charge, but this situation was simply too bizarre and the group wouldn't panic as long as they had a plan. Warren recognized the situation and shouted, take positions and do as he says. He removed his coat and unfurled his wings in a display that had the demons watching flinch back. Wings like that were intimidating to demons after all. Harry ran forward with Scott and Jean following behind. Harry activated a spell on his backpack which caused all the gems within to fly out and circle him while emitting light with a constant lumos. It had no effect but looked like a special move to anyone who paid attention. Harry figured he'd use this type of setup to go all out when in front of witnesses. Harry released multiple cutting spheres which exploded on contact with demons and shredded anything in the area to ribbons. Scott blasted everything in the direction they were heading to clear the path, and most demons took serious damage from his blasts, though it only had a concussive effect on humans. Jean simply grabbed any nearby demon and psychically threw them into other demons. A minute into their arrival, a massive magic circle appeared over the orphanage and spun around. The walls and roof of the building were torn to pieces and drawn into the spinning circle, leaving the occupants exposed. Harry paused once more and rechecked the layout. He confirmed the point of origin of the spell and the position of the caster. It was about 8 feet tall with blood-red skin and a head that looked like a cross between a horse and a crocodile. Behind him seemed to be a ritual staging area, but Harry wasn't close enough to analyze it. Harry unpaused and said, "That guy's our target, we take him out and we win." Scott and Jean confirmed his position and along with Harry charged forward. Harry paused every couple of seconds to confirm the situation of the various battles. Angel, Pixie, and Nightcrawler had taken to the sky. Nightcrawler couldn't fly, but he could teleport behind an airborne demon, wrap his tail about the demon's neck, then fall, and throw the demon into another demon. Angel's flying abilities did not lose out to the demons at all in air maneuverability, and his punches could knock out any demon who closed in on him. Pixie wasn't a melee fighter, but her pixie dust could cause anyone to hallucinate, and she'd been spreading it around the demons, causing them to either attack the air or attack each other. On the ground, Spike had been providing artillery support to Angel by shooting down any targets Angel or Nightcrawler disabled. Rogue seemed to have borrowed a bit of Iceman's powers, and both of them were making a wall of ice to provide cover and freeze any demons who got close enough in place. Not all could, but several demons capable of magic did try to fire or fry the X-Men, but from the perspective of the X-Men, their aim was terrible and it was not a concern. A number of the orphans were putting up just as much of a fight. There was a giant 10-foot-tall teddy bear standing over one of the little girls that had been grabbing and tossing demons around. A pair of red-headed twins seemed to be working together to freeze some demons in place before shattering them, while another kid seemed to be able to control smoke. Shadowcat was sticking around the orphans, and if one was about to be attacked, she would grab them and make them intangible for a moment. Besides the orphans and X-Men were two rather noticeable figures. One was a person in an egg-shaped suit that appeared to have goggles over it and red lipstick where the mouth would be. The other was coated in metal, which looked similar to how Colossus appeared when using his power. That one was probably Orphan Maker, the one who Jean said was basically a cyborg. His entire body appeared metallic and he wore a protruding mask and armor. In both hands were what appeared to be advanced weaponry. Harry decided to ignore them for the moment, but next when he unpaused, the pair started attacking Shadowcat. The egg person shouted, "You wolves are here for my lost little lambs? Get them, Peter? They wish to take these children away from those who love them." From the metallic suit came, in a voice that appeared to be that of a child's, "Nah, you bad guys aren't taking away my friends." He started unloading shot after shot at Shadowcat, who had to stay intangible to avoid getting turned into Swiss cheese. Harry apparat behind the Tin Man and shot an overpowered stupefy into his back. The force of the magic sent Orphan Maker out of the ruined building into the outskirts, where a group of demons quickly descended onto him. The egg woman shouted, "Peter, no, Nanny is coming for you," and rushed out, but the hordes of demons blocked her path and she could only watch as the demons started ripping the metallic pieces from the immobile cyborg. Harry apparat back and used a vanishing charm on some of the gems around him to make it look like they were spent in doing that. Although energy can resist magic, that was only true for sentient energy, which required life force to be mixed in. This meant that cyborgs powered by external means were as vulnerable to magic as any non-magical if they weren't properly shielded. More so, in fact, as the system which ran that man's suit was now completely corrupted, and unless he was dragged to a computer and had his suit's OS completely reinstalled, he wasn't going to move again unless he was a technopath who could fix his OS without an interface. Jean and Scott continue to clear a path towards the boss demon and finally get his attention. Until this point, the red demon had its back turned and was preparing something within a ritual circle. The creature growled and shouted, "Incompetents and fools, must I do everything myself?" Harry wasn't in the mood for witty banter, so he directly shot out a widespread finite incantatum at the demon and the ritual circle behind him, but it had no effect. The demon shouted, "You dare challenge I, Enister, in my own realm? I shall take great pleasure in destroying you all." The demon, now confirmed to be Enister, summoned black flames and red lightning which gathered around him. Harry spread his arms out and 7 rings surrounded the trio and cancelled out the magics Enister had cast at them. Enister gave a nasty sneer and said, "A sorcerer should know better than to fight a realm master in his own realm." He screeched into the air and the space itself seemed to warp and fold around the group. Harry paused and walked over to the ritual circle behind the red demon. That was twice now Enister had claimed ownership of the realm, but Harry knew that Limbo was Velasco's realm. However, Enister was currently giving a display of space control that only the realm lord should have. Once Harry looked over the ritual circle in detail, he knew what the demon was up to. This was an offering ritual. He was offering the souls of innocent mutant children to Limbo in exchange for its favor, and in doing so he would gain power equal to Belasco's within Limbo. Of course, even if they were equal, Enister would have to fight Belasco for true ownership of the realm, which was easier said than done. Thankfully the ritual wouldn't complete itself unless the offering was accepted, which required more than what it had now. That meant the kidnapped kids were held within and could be rescued. Enister actually shouldn't be able to use a realm lord's power before the ritual was complete, but it looked like he was basically borrowing it in advance. If the ritual failed, he'd suffer a debt, but he was pretty confident in his success, so he probably didn't care about that. Harry unpaused and used another spell from the Grand Grimoire. He'd practiced a few of them using wizard and sorcerer magic with the Ancient One, and was one of the reasons he had confidence he could escape. 6 mandalas appeared around Harry, and scarlet-red ethereal chains launched from them and spread through the air before fading away. The movement of space caused by Enister's domain control slowed to a crawl as the space itself was bound in place. If Enister wanted to fight, he'd have to do it like a man. Scott hadn't been staring off into the distance, and Jean hadn't been filling her nails while Harry and Enister exchanged blows. Scott had been firing his concussive beams at Enister and the demons around him and even the ground nearby, while Jean had been throwing everything at the red demon with everything she had. Enister snarled and conjured black hellfire and shaped it into a massive creature. Enister shouted orders to all the demons around him, "Destroy them now." Their fight, however, was interrupted by the sound of a massive roar behind them. The whole group turned and found a behemoth-sized, misshapen demonic creature that seemed to be devouring the other demons. It didn't eat them, its flesh simply covered and assimilated the demons and became larger and larger. Harry shouted to Scott, "Scott, hold him down for 10 seconds. Scott nodded, and Harry took Jean's hand and entered her mindscape. Within he said, "Jean, synchronize your emotions with mine." Jean didn't argue and felt the righteous fury Harry felt towards Enister, Orphan Maker, and Nanny. The complete understanding that the world was better off without them and the desire to see them burn for their atrocities. Standing behind Scott, Harry rose his hand along with Jean's into the air as a flicker of flames ignited in their palm. Jean didn't know what it was, but it burned with her fury, and she focused her emotions along with Harry's into it, and the flame grew larger and larger. Scott had removed his visor and was blasting Enister with literally everything he had. The wannabe realm lord was forced back a step but was able to shield himself through the use of his black magic and domain control. When the flame reached the size of a pumpkin, Harry said, "Get down, Scott." Scott closed his eyes and collapsed into exhaustion as Harry and Jean threw their arms forward, the flame shooting directly at Enister, who thoughtlessly commanded his own flame creature to block it. The flame passed through the Hellfire construct without slowing down and struck Enister, who thought to block it with a powerful magic shield in his hand. The fire burned through the magic, and in an instant, his arm was set ablaze. He shouted, "No, how can this be?" He tore his own arm off, but his shoulder started burning the moment the flesh was removed. Phoenix fire burnt the body, mind, and soul after all. Enister tore a hole in space and immediately entered it, running for his life. The ritual circle broke and half a dozen children appeared on the ground. Harry shouted, "Scott, guard the kids, we'll get the others to come grab them and get out of here." Scott was used to Harry's shouts by now and called back, "Got it." Harry and Jean ran over to see the titanic creature that was still devouring demons. The army of several thousand had been reduced to only a few hundred. Nanny was on her knees staring at the creature. She said, "My poor Peter." Harry asked, "That thing was Orphan Maker?" Within turning to face him, she answered back, "He was covered for his own protection and for the protection of others. His flesh would permanently fuse with the body of anyone he touched, gaining greater strength and power, but his mind regressed with each person and he couldn't control it. The nightmarish creature would soon finish with the demons and it would start with them." Harry doubted there was a mind left inside that being. Harry held his hand out, palm face up before Jean, and she took it after understanding his intentions. Their righteous fury synchronized once more, and far faster than it had last time, a massive ball of flames emerged. Unlike the demon who Jean didn't like on principle, this Orphan Maker was the one who killed her sister. She wouldn't want to save him even if she could, and he was so beyond saving, there wasn't the slightest trace of remorse for what she was about to do. The reason Harry was making Phoenix fire with Jean was that her Shnik path rank was far higher than his, and even if the Phoenix wasn't awake within her, she was still its avatar, and she was born capable of making Phoenix flames, even if she didn't know how to before. The massive fireball became larger than a house and got the attention of the blob of demonic flesh that was already over 10 stories tall. Slits emerged all over the creature and they turned to mouths which roared at the fire and their presence. Without needing to throw it, the fireball lifted from their hands and seamlessly shaped itself into a firebird and let loose a screech of outrage that embodied Harry's and Jean's fury at the monstrosity. Cords of flesh shot out like spears at Harry and Jean, but the firebird flew forward and every piece of flesh that passed through it was burnt to nothing, not even leaving ash. Harry covertly pulled out a baseball-sized crystal covered in inscriptions and runes and used a switching spell on it with a rock near the demonic flesh to get the crystal near the creature. The phoenix-shaped blaze collided into the flesh and consumed it in fire. The remaining demons that had not already left fled at their fastest speed as the massive creature was rapidly burning away. Harry watched the burning monster and could only sigh. The being hadn't consolidated any of its power, so it was low density and easy to burn, like a giant pile of papers. Enister, on the other hand, was like an ancient tree and far more dense when it came to power and life force. He'd probably survive, though the backlash from the ritual combined with the damage from the Phoenix fire meant he would be rather weakened for a very long time. Harry led Jean back to the others and they ran over to where Scott was and took the children back to the destroyed orphanage. Eventually Orphan Maker had burnt to nothing. There wasn't even smoke or a smell. Without anyone noticing, Harry used the switching charm once more to get the crystal again before placing it back into his inventory. The switching charm usually can't be used on any item with magic, but Harry made the vessel himself, so it was an exception. Phoenix fire burnt anything and the result was pure life force. Harry couldn't absorb it to level up, but he wasn't going to leave such a massive amount of Phoenix fire refined life force for someone else to take. It could prove useful later. The space within the corridor seemed to shudder. Harry did some readings and confirmed that in an hour or so the space supporting the corridor would collapse and force everyone remaining there into limbo. That of course was only if Belasco himself wasn't trying to collapse it from the outside, which Harry wouldn't put past the Demon Lord. Using Kit's teleports, the kids were quickly assembled in the ruined orphanage. Scott looked around the shaking space and said, "Everyone's here, let's go." Harry said, "Okay, give me a moment. Actually there is an extra." Harry sent a banishing charm at Nanny, who was mopping in a corner, and directly ejected her from the area. Before anyone could say anything, Harry created a red mandala which spread out and caused the red sky to shift to a star-filled night sky. Harry's mandala confirmed that 4 hours had passed on Earth while they were in limbo, which was why it was night, though only a few minutes had passed since dusk. Ignoring Scott's ranting about leaving Nanny in hell, Harry directly entered the orphanage's basement and connected to the computers within. The machine fogging up Xavier's and Jean's senses was in front of him and he wanted to know how it worked and who built it. Though the computer had scans of the files which showed the blueprints, much of it was redacted. Harry had to use a few filters to get details from the redacted parts. When he finished, he only had one question. Who is Mr. Sinister? Chapter 37. Chapter 37. You call that unstoppable? According to the bare fragments of information Harry was able to dig through, Mr. Sinister was a researcher and an extremely dangerous person. The designs for the Mind Cloud system seemed to have been stolen from him when Nanny and Peter both escaped from him, though Harry found no details of why they were imprisoned or how they escaped. In any case, Harry made a mental note of the name and returned upstairs. Scott, it seemed, had not decided his rant was over. He nearly shouted, "How could you do that? Just leave her in that place. She was a human being." Harry sighed and decided to close the matter. He answered, "Just because I decided to save the orphans doesn't make me a hero. Helping people is a hobby of mine and I am not obligated to save everyone. Yes, I could have returned her, but that doesn't mean I wanted to." Harry didn't stop Scott from grabbing his shirt and dragging him close so Scott could yell into his face, "How is that different from killing her?" Harry shook his head. It wasn't the first time he'd killed people he didn't have to. He could have left the Death Eaters who tried to kill him years ago alive, but he chose to kill them instead. He did so under the conviction he wasn't a hero. He'd help the people he wanted to help and he wouldn't put any effort into sparing those who acted to kill himself or his friends. Of course he'd only reach that point if someone used actual killing intent. Both times that pyrokinetic threw a fireball at him, Harry could tell the density of the fire wasn't high enough to kill him, so Harry didn't take his life in turn. If someone just tried to horribly mangle, cripple, or injure him or a friend, Harry wouldn't kill them in retaliation. Harry looked Scott in the eye and asked, "If they killed your brother, would we be having this conversation?" Scott quickly released Harry and looked over to Jean, who was glaring at him like he was a hypocrite. Harry had learned that Scott had lost his younger brother years ago. Scott knew these people killed Jean's sister, yet Scott was protesting the harshness of how Harry dealt with them in front of her. Harry continued, "That woman completely rationalized that murdering a child's parents was acceptable because she was better at taking care of children. Perhaps she could have been taken to a mental institution, gone through years of therapy, and been released. But if she relapsed or escaped, the lives of her next victims would be my responsibility for sparing her. Maybe, just maybe she could have become healthy, come to regret her decision, and try to redeem herself. But the possibility of that happening is far too low." Scott yelled, "That's not your call to make." Harry flatly said, "I don't regret my choice. If she had regained her sanity to the point she would be willing to repent, she would also have to live with the guilt of what she had done for the rest of her days. That guilt, however, would only emerge if she regained her sanity. That is the reason it is unlikely she'd ever willingly become sane. She'd be a mental patient living in her delusions all her life, waiting for a chance to escape and orphan more children." Scott took a step back at the sheer weight of the cold logic. Harry had not pushed Nanny out on a whim. He'd paused and considered all the possibilities and the weight of each of those possibilities. The best case scenario for the world if he spared her would be if she could regain her sanity, but that would not be the best case for Nanny herself, as she would have to live with the guilt. She might even take her own life if that occurred, and there was no way her mind could heal without accepting that sort of guilt in the first place. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Since she was damned either way, Harry decided to reduce the possibility of her orphaning children in the future to the smallest acceptable level he could without directly beheading her in front of the X-Men. Jean had walked over to Scott by now and said, "Look Scott, I was in that woman's head. There wasn't the slightest trait of remorse for what she did. She even took pleasure in killing, thinking that it was evil for non-mutant parents to raise mutant children and she was simply ridding the world of evil. I didn't find any trace of her mind that even wanted to heal." Scott tried to argue, but Jean, she was dash. He was cut off when Jean shouted, "She was not human, Scott. She was a monster. And if Harry had taken her back with us, I would have put her down myself." Warren and a few of the other X-Men that weren't comforting the children had heard Harry and Scott's exchange. Warren seemed conflicted but decided not to say anything. If Harry really had just left her there out of malice, he would have had words with him, but since he clearly thought out the consequences of his actions, there was nothing more to add. One consequence of this was that although Harry would not be punished, in the future, he would not be regularly invited to outings with the X-Men. If Harry didn't feel obligated to save even those who didn't deserve saving, he'd be a liability on the team. Harry had considered this as well and didn't have a problem with it. He never intended to become an X-Men after all. Warren used a cell phone to call up a few groups he'd set up earlier that had been waiting on standby. 2 hours later, several vans and personnel from Child Services showed up and were briefed on the details. Harry had run diagnostics on the children and determined that without a weekly dose of fairy dust, their memories of their families would slowly return. He'd already found a sample and determined its ingredients earlier. The recipe was similar to some potions but the ingredients had no exotic energy and the processing was far more complicated. Harry figured he might be able to create a potion that could immediately negate the effects, but after some consideration he decided it would be better for the process of returning memory to be more gradual. Although their memories were suppressed, their minds still possessed them and Jean was able to look through their minds, one by one, to learn where they lived and what their names were. Nanny, it seemed, gave them new names after taking their memories. Jean's nephew for example was named Joseph, or Joey, but had been called Tommy in the orphanage. Using this information, Child Services would look for other relatives to see if they could be taken in. For those lacking relatives or had relatives that refused to take them in, special priority would be given to grant Charles Xavier guardianship. Jean had already had a tear-filled call with her parents about her sister's death and they agreed to take care of their grandkids. They might have been a dull and dreary couple, but they were still proper humans and cared for their family. Although she was in pain, Harry watched Jean smile when she was looking after and playing with the orphans. He thought her smile was beautiful and wondered if he was falling in love with her. Harry knew that he liked her and knew he enjoyed spending time with her. He knew that even after her issues with the Phoenix were resolved, he'd still want to be a part of her life and when he thought of the future, he saw her standing with him. Of course he also knew that love was not so simple to quantify. He wouldn't force it but would let it be without interference. Jean had the children write letters to the friends they made in town and at school which would explain that the orphanage was broken and they would be moving away. When the kids had been relocated, they could send another letter and if the kids at the other end responded, they could continue as pen pals until they had a cell phone. Once the last of the kids were loaded up, Harry got the ping he'd been waiting for. Ping. Quest complete, rescue the orphan mutants from Enister. Reward, Belasco's Ancient Book of Spells. Harry paused and went over the book that had appeared in his inventory. His quest didn't really have much to do with Belasco, meaning the book had been acquired from Enister. That meant the Red Demon had likely stolen the book from Belasco himself. The book contained a heavy assortment of black magic but Harry couldn't use it. Black magic was called black magic because it required negative energies to power the spells and Harry didn't have any negative energies. Even the soul energy he'd gotten from the slain Dementors had been purified through his own patroness before he'd absorbed it. Harry considered using the coordinates of the infernal plane to head over and kill demons and use their tainted energies to level up. He could do it too once he'd gotten his portal situation resolved. The energy of the few demons killed by his wizard magic when he was heading over to Enister were absorbed by him so it was an option. However he decided against it. All magic had a cost and black magic's cost was far steeper than normal. Even if Harry absorbed the negative energy, he'd have to put effort into keeping it negative, lest his own positive energies purify it. Harry remembered that Sorceress Supreme from the future had been filled with both negative energies and positive energies without one cancelling the other out, but Harry expected such a situation did not come naturally and required special circumstances. In any case, the details of the book would be useful as reference and would allow him to become familiar with demon script should he encounter it again. Most magics had areas of overlap so the insights into tricks for how black magics worked could help him in other areas. Harry didn't have any dark energy from the dark dimension but he still memorized the dark magics in the Book of Cagliostro which gave him insights into the workings of time and space. On the theoretical level, only the Ancient One was superior to him when it came to knowledge on energies on the mortal plane. Harry had spent untold centuries studying the texts within Camartage's library while paused after all. At one point to break the tension, Kurt asked Harry, "What was that glowing thing you did earlier? It was really funky looking." Kitty said, "Yeah, you did a whole bunch of crazy stuff back to back while those rocks spun around you like a rainbow." Harry lied through his teeth, "Just a trick I can use for a couple of minutes. Though I can't use my power again for a few days after doing it." Kurt gave a sly smile Harry caught and told the blue prankster, "Anything you try before I recover, I will return several-fold." Rogue walked up and said, "Wait, so you just used all those gemstones at once?" Harry shrugged, "Yep, that fight cost me about $65,000. Or at least that is how much it would cost to buy all the large gemstones he'd vanished while fighting from his company. His backpack had about 30 of them and since he vanished them instead of putting them back in his inventory, he wouldn't be able to reuse them, they were gone forever. Still, for rocks of that size, it was pretty cheap. His company already had the best machines to mass-produce large gemstones after all. No one had anything to say about that. Although Harry had done a lot, it looked like he'd spent a fortune to do it. As the group departed for the Blackbird, Jean telepathically asked Harry, "Can I ask you what that flame was? I've never been able to do something like that before, but it felt." Harry replied, "It felt natural, like something you were born to do." Jean turned to Harry with a raised eyebrow and telepathically sent back, "What do you know?" Harry cheekily answered, "Jean, what I know could fill whole libraries." Jean rolled her eyes at the answer, but Harry continued, "I know exactly what that flame is and where it comes from. Yes, I could tell you, or you could look in that book over there in my mind and it will give you everything I know on that flame. But, you'll gain more if you learn that piece of knowledge yourself rather than learn it from me." Jean replied, "Is that what this has all been about? I know you've been keeping something from me and daring me to ask you what it is, but have you been trying to get me to find the answer myself?" Harry nodded back. He knew he wasn't being subtle, especially when he told her to practice the mind-folding technique he stole from Xavier to practice mental discipline, while also telling her not to permanently use it on herself to repress any part of her mind like Xavier had with his own darker impulses. Jean sighed and conveyed back, "All right Harry, I'll trust you on this." Harry smiled and replied, "Don't let that stop you from reading about my life. You stopped at the bad part last time and it really did get better after that." It didn't take long for the group to return and Warren met up with Logan and Xavier to give his report. It was decided that Harry's inclusion in X-Men missions in the future would be as needed only. Logan had no problem with what Harry had done, but he knew the X-Men were being taught to be symbols, not soldiers. Surprisingly, Xavier never asked Harry or Jean what that flame was. Harry figured the professor must have thought it was some kind of magic and didn't dwell on it further. The following week passed by in silence. Harry still spent most of his time in the workshop either on personal projects or working with Forge, but he still spent the evenings in the study group helping everyone while Jean read through his library. Harry knew even when he was taking his 4 hours of sleep, Jean could still access his mind, and he knew she often did so when she was having trouble sleeping. The final weekend before classes started had most of the teachers except Logan once more out and about, escorting the last of the students back to the institute. In the meantime, Harry had been making excellent progress in 2 areas. First, Harry finally had access to portals again. Using some tricks he learned from his insights into black magic, Harry could once more create a ring which allowed passage through space. The ring itself, however, was still a combination of sorcerer and wizard magic. It was different from normal sling ring portals. The first difference was that it had the appearance of a glowing silver ring instead of a swirling vortex of rust-colored light. The next was that Harry didn't have to swirl his hand to make the portal. Instead, he could use a simple motion to stamp it into the air. When he moved with the intent to form it, a silver light would appear midair and it would expand into a ring-shaped portal at his will. Harry could control the size and even make it large enough to drive a semi-truck or a tank through. Opening it, holding it open, and allowing passage, however, all used magic from his internal reserves, so it had some practical limitations compared to normal sling ring portals. Distance, it seemed, was not necessarily one of them. However, because it was merged with his wizard magic which was still invisible, his portals wouldn't be sensed by any direct energy sensing means. The second breakthrough Harry completed was he had an approximate understanding of Forget-Me-Not's power. His power basically caused him to not exist at the same time he existed. It was as if a parallel universe where Forget-Me-Not did not exist seemed to actively overwrite the traces of his own existence in this universe. However, it worked through Forget-Me-Not himself. If he died, his power would actually stop working. The problem was that unlike Rogue, who unconsciously could not turn off her power, Forget-Me-Not's power was completely involuntary. It was the universe itself that was trying to erase him. Harry did discover some limitations of his power. If Forget-Me-Not himself met someone and forgot them or didn't pay attention to them, they would forget less of him than someone he paid attention to. This variable meant Forget-Me-Not's power had a controllable trigger. Using that as a base, Harry determined that Forget-Me-Not had 2 sets of memories, from both the universe he was in, and the universe he didn't exist in. When he met someone, his own memories of them were actually the first thing to get erased, and their memories of him were erased along with it. His second set of memories was fine though, so he didn't even notice this. This was the key to controlling his powers. If his first set of memories getting erased caused others to forget him, then as long as they were preserved, he would not be forgotten. This, however, was the tricky part. The universe itself wanted to erase him. Harry tried copying Forget-Me-Not's memories onto an external magical artifact, but those were still erased over time. Even if Harry took materials from another dimension, they would still get erased because that dimension was still a part of this universe. The only way to build something that would not get erased was to use something made of materials from a completely different universe. Had this been anyone else, that would have been the end of it. There was no safe way to acquire material of any kind from another universe. Harry, on the other hand, had 6 DVDs of Star Wars from another universe. He'd copy to content elsewhere so it wouldn't be lost, but the DVDs were in fact pieces of matter from another universe and would not be affected by Forget-Me-Not's power. It would take time to turn the DVDs into a magical memory storage device he could wear, but if it worked, Harry could have Forget-Me-Not's memories stored on them and have them constantly refresh his first set of memories, preventing him from forgetting them and preventing others from forgetting him. If Harry could make the external storage interactive, Forget-Me-Not could choose who forgot him and who didn't. It was a useful power if it could be controlled after all. Of course Harry would have to make it indestructible, impossible to get stolen, recoverable if stolen, and make a spare in case it was completely destroyed. Some might call Harry pessimistic and paranoid. He preferred to think of himself as prepared. There was one aspect about Forget-Me-Not's power Harry had discovered and considered a use for. He had been holding back on it for a while, but he decided there was no longer a point in waiting around. After cleaning up his workstation, Harry went over to the gym he'd discovered Forget-Me-Not often spent time at. Forget-Me-Not, I got a favor to ask. The 17-year-old with the slicked back hair took a step back and said, "You're not going to ask for more hair, are you?" Harry shook his head and answered, "No, I want to ask if you can let Rogue use your powers. Hers is kinda broken, and I've figured out how to use a copy of yours to fix hers." Forget-Me-Not appeared surprised at that. "You can fix Marie? Well, yeah, I'm in." Harry smiled and led him over to where Rogue was. Forget-Me-Not was a remarkably caring person for someone who got such a bad draw in life. Harry hadn't told him about his progress because it still required a lot of work and he didn't want to get his hopes up only for a delay to occur. Harry considered getting Xavier to supervise but recalled that he was out of the mansion and meeting some politicians at the moment. Harry didn't need the man, but Xavier witnessing what Harry was going to do would prevent questions about it later. Rogue was watching TV with a few of the other kids and Harry shouted to her, "Rogue, come over here, we're gonna fix your powers." Rogue looked over at him incredulously and asked, "What?" Harry didn't answer and went over to an empty room while motioning for Rogue to follow. Unsurprisingly she got off the couch and followed him inside along with Forget-Me-Not. She asked with an accusatory tone, "What's this about fixing my powers?" She didn't want someone to get her hopes up for nothing and didn't have a lot of faith anything could be done for her. Harry pointed at Forge-Me-Not and said, "This is Forget-Me-Not, remember him?" Rogue looked over him then blinked again. "Forget-Me-Not? Oh, wait, I think I do." Forget-Me-Not smiled and shook his head. Harry continued, "You remember what I said the problem was with your power? Yeah, you said there was too much gunk in there for me to feel how to control it." Harry nodded and said, "Well, one application of Forget-Me-Not's power would allow you to, under controlled supervision, completely erase other people from your own head." Forget-Me-Not asked, "Wait, really?" Rogue asked, "What do you mean, supervision?" Harry turned to Forget-Me-Not first and answered, "Yes really, I've already figured out a lot about your power and have a few leads on how to get around it without cuticle assimilation." He turned to Rogue and said, "I'm going to go inside your head after you absorb Forget-Me-Not's power and assist you in directing it in erasing the remnants of those you've absorbed." Forget-Me-Not asked, "Won't other people forget her?" Harry said, "Their memories will fade a bit, but they'll return when they see her after the power is gone." Rogue looked pensive for a moment before giving a determined nod. "So what do I do?" Harry said, "Well, first ask permission to use his power. I suspect if permission is asked and not refused, your power will work better." Rogue took in a breath and said, "All right. Forget-Me-Not, please let me use your power." Forget-Me-Not smiled and held out his hand saying, "I freely give permission to use my power." Rogue took off her glove and after a moment of hesitation, touched his finger. Harry had seen her take other powers before and usually, both parties flinched. Forget-Me-Not however just looked a bit uncomfortable and after 2 seconds, Rogue released contact. Harry asked, "Do you feel like Forget-Me-Not or have any of his memories?" Rogue's eyes shot up in surprise and said, "No, I can feel him, but I'm still me." She looked up at him and asked, "How are you feeling?" Forget-Me-Not looked at his finger and said, "Not bad." He looked over at Harry and asked, "Why was that different?" Harry answered, "Mindset. The difference between taking without asking and taking after asking. That should be the proper way to use her power, though we'll deal with that when she learns to turn it off and on." Forget-Me-Not nodded and said, "All right, keep me updated," and headed out to give them some privacy. Harry sat down with Rogue and had her relax. He used his Shinik abilities to connect to and enter her own mind. Rather than do anything himself, Harry concentrated and pulled Rogue herself into her mind where she stood within her own mental space next to Harry. She asked, "This is my head huh? Kinda empty I suppose." The space itself was dark, quite dreary, and had something of an inky texture to the floor and sky. Harry knew it to represent Rogue's sorrow and inner self-loathing over her powers. He said, "It will look better later. Let's start." They wandered a bit and found what looked like the ghost of a wild animal covered in metal spikes. Rogue took one look at it and said, "Logan." Harry said, "Concentrate on that connection you made with Forget-Me-Not and use it to ignite a silver flame in your hand. This is your mind so all you have to do is imagine it and it will happen." Rogue was neither slow nor stupid and had to mature rather quickly due to her circumstances. She was in fact very smart, though due to some much gunk in her head, she was not always able to show it. Within moments a bright silver flame emerged from her hand and without Harry having to tell her, she pressed it against the shadow and it dissolved away. Rogue felt the effect immediately. She said, "I can't feel him anymore." It actually worked, she finished in shock. Harry nodded, "I suspect he's not the only one in here. We have to get them all for you to become a blank slate." "Well, what are we waiting for?" She ran off to find more remnants and one by one dissolved them away. The inky black sky slowly started clearing up and the ground started showing more and more color. When Mystique's shadow, a constantly shifting amorphous blob, was dissolved, the ground turned into lush grass and stars began to shine in the sky above. Eventually she found the last one. This one was not a ghost. It was a young teen who appeared to be merged into the ground itself. Rogue knelt next to it and mouthed a silent apologize. Harry pretended to not notice and she dissolved his remnant as well. The empty plot the boy vanished from suddenly sprouted flowers which spread around the field and gently reflected the light of the moon that appeared in the sky like a sea of silver. Rogue stared wide-eyed in shock at the beauty of the scene before her. Harry smiled and commented, "Not so empty now, is it?" Rogue turned to Harry and jumped him. They fell to the ground and Rogue took his lips in a passion-filled kiss. One side effect of Shinix was a strong sense of empathy and it was far too easy to feel the emotions of those close to you. Rogue's emotions had overcome him in the kiss and he unconsciously kissed her back laying down in the field of flowers. It only took a moment for Rogue and Harry to realize what they were doing and they immediately separated, each blushing the same shade of red. Harry had the mind of an ancient, but his hormones were still that of a 15-year-old teen, the same age as the girl he was with. He could talk big but he had no experience. Rogue quickly said, "I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me." Harry sighed and said, "Your mind has been freed from taint for the first time since your powers awoke and you're not used to your own emotions. It's fine." He wasn't going to tell her that was his first kiss. Rogue looked over in the distance and saw someone standing there. She got up and walked over followed by Harry and together they found the figure was none other than Forget-Me-Not. Harry asked, "You're still here?" Forget-Me-Not answered, "Well, I did give Marie permission to use my power. Did you still need it?" Rogue shook her head and said, "Not right now." Forget-Me-Not nodded and said, "Well, if you need it again, just ask." Harry said, "Wait, so you're gonna just stay here in Rogue's head and if she needs to use your powers, she just has to ask you in here?" Forget-Me-Not said, "Yeah, this place isn't so bad. I'll leave if you want me to, but I'll stay here otherwise. Later." He turned and casually walked away and looked like he wanted to enjoy walking through the field. Harry wondered if through the nature of his own power would he vanish along with Rogue's memories of him or would he remain. Only time would tell. Harry left Rogue's mind and they both found themselves back in the empty room. Harry said, "Before you decide to ask for the powers of our friends, you should take some time to feel out the off switch of your powers." Rogue nodded with a light blush and got up to run out the door. Ping. Quest complete, Rogue powers. Reward, +2 Scholar Path rank. This was the first time he'd been awarded a path rank for a completed quest but his Scholar Path increasing from 42 to 44 was actually a very large increase and very, very useful. His last Scholar Path rank increase was from making a website which had been considered a lesson to the world. Harry wondered if something on that scale was required to continue increasing his path. Something to think about later. Harry returned to his workstation to see what progress he could make on his other projects. Halfway through the day, the Brotherhood of Mutants started randomly trashing parts of Salem so the 3rd X-Men group was called to head over. Rogue stayed behind because she wanted to practice more before heading out and when Scott learned what Harry had done, he agreed spending time practicing was better than dealing with the Brotherhood who only acted up because they were looking for a fight. 30 minutes after Scott's group left, the Institute's sirens went off. The sirens were a security system that went off when an incoming threat or danger to the Institute was detected. Harry ran out to the TV room where the TV screen would automatically change to the security camera feed and show the incoming danger. The threat that set off the alarm was not an army or assembled group armed with weapons. It was a single man of staggering size. Almost completely covered in bright red armor was a man approximately 9.5 feet in stature including the dome-shaped helmet he wore. Harry watched the monitor feed of the man casually smashing through the wall and moving forward without faltering at the barrage of weapons fire from the turrets that emerged all over the grounds. Harry went over to a wall panel in the TV room and pulled it back to reveal a phone. He picked it up and pressed a few numbers before it rang and was answered. Harry asked, "Forge, who or what is that?" On the other side Forge answered, "That is Kane Marco, the professor's stepbrother. Also called the Unstoppable Juggernaut. Stay away from him, Harry. Magic is completely ineffective against the guy and nothing can halt his momentum." The monitors already showed Logan had rushed the guy, but his armor held against Logan's adamantine claws and the massive brute was faster than he looked. Forge said, "I've already recalled everyone so backup should arrive shortly." The line went dead and Harry hung up from his side. After casting a Notice Me Not on himself, Harry entered to an empty room that didn't have any cameras and stamped a silver portal connecting to outside the grounds. When the sirens went off, the mansion went on lockdown meaning the doors were heavily bolted shut, as were the windows so Harry had to leave using non-standard means. From a distance Harry immediately recognized the strength energy from Sidorak's realm. Harry figured Marco had Sidorak's crimson gem, making him the Elder God's avatar on Earth. Thankfully he only seemed to be using a few % of that power. The full power of the gem would grant the power to rewrite reality with every step he took. Strength energy was not about literal strength. It was about dominance and overcoming obstacles through force. Since Marco was the gem's possessor, he had a direct, unbreakable connection to Sidorak's crimson cosmos and the strength energy within. From what Harry read, the gem also provided its user with a field that basically attacked magic with overwhelming force causing magic to dispel on contact. The strongest defense is a good offense approach. Even Harry's dimension splitter which wounded the immortal black dragon wouldn't have an effect on Sidorak's chosen. Of course, that was only if Harry used magic to attack. Marco's ability to use the gem was practically insulting. Harry got a dozen smoky quartz from his inventory and placed 3 spells on them. The first would cause them to freeze in place in the air when thrown. The next would cause them to glow with a time-delayed lumos the moment they froze in the air. And the last would cause them to vanish with a time-delayed vanishing charm 2 seconds later. Marco had made it through the trees and turrets and Logan wasn't able to do much to slow him down. Harry got out $100 bill and smiled. It was time for a prank. He shouted, "Hey, Mr. Unstoppable, I bet you $100 can't get past me." The massive juggernaut looked over at the kid standing between him and the institute, waving a $100 bill in the air, and he gave a feral grin beneath his helmet before he started charging. Logan half shouted, half growled, "No, get out of here." No one noticed the bag Harry held in his other hand until he swung it into the air and out fell the 10 palm-sized smoky quartz crystals, each frozen in place surrounding the charging juggernaut and glowed brightly. Harry used that moment to cast a massive transfiguration on the ground. The space 50 feet in front of him had suddenly dipped down as if it was collapsing and the smoky quartz vanished from the air. The juggernaut lost his footing and tripped, rolling into the center of the pit before coming to a stop. The flat ground had turned into a 50-foot diameter perfect hemisphere-shaped pit, and the moment it finished shifting, the surface of the pit changed to a completely smooth texture. Harry had transfigured the pit into stone with a 6-inch layer of completely smooth rubber over the stone. Harry then threw another crystal into the pit where it stopped in place, glowed, and vanished as Harry conjured a large amount of water to fill the pit and drench Marco. Marco got up and looked at Harry staring down at him from the edge of the bowl waving the $100 bill in the air. Harry sat down to observe Marco, who started roaring in rage. Harry was not completely exhausted, but he still used almost all his magic reserves on this prank. There were easier ways to do it, but Harry couldn't guarantee the gem wouldn't break any portal Harry tried to send Mark through, and it had been far too long since Harry was able to prank an asshole who deserved it. Marco of course tried running up the rubber hill, but he didn't make it very far before his momentum faltered and he slid back into the puddle of water that reached his ankle. His wet boots provided not an ounce of traction against the smooth rubber surface. Such basic use of Sidorac's strength energy only preserved a single vector of momentum. If it was a straight line, he could charge through 10 feet of rubber and stone without much of an issue. But each step up the bowl shifted his vector to a new angel, preventing him from building unstoppable momentum. Because it was a perfect hemisphere, there was no way to travel in a straight line. The best he could do was run up the other side and run down to use gravity to assist his momentum. It was only a half sphere after all, and any skateboarder would know how to escape. Of course that only worked if he didn't slip while running through the puddle of water in the middle. Marco tried to do a straight run 3 times before he realized the problem and shouted at the top of his lungs. Logan had recovered and walked around the hole over to Harry, who was still sitting at the edge of the pit. The warrior observed Marco's attempts and the result with a wary expression. He apparently didn't expect something like this to work. Once he reached Harry, he said, "Why can't I smell him down there?" Harry calmly answered, "There is an invisible plate of glass over the hole and the pit is filled with carbon monoxide." He's too angry to notice how short his breath is, and by the time the effect wears off, he'll be unconscious. The reason his magic reserves were almost empty was because he'd cast 2 overlapping transfigurations to make the pit, and when he threw the water as a distraction, he conjured and immediately rendered invisible a 50-foot diameter circle of glass and a lot of carbon monoxide. Marco seemed to have figured out the skateboarder trick and was running up and down the walls. Though he had no traction, it was still possible to run without slipping if you have good balance, and Marco had surprisingly excellent balance for a 9.5-foot tall mountain of a man. Even if he reached the top, he wouldn't have enough momentum to break through the glass on the first try, and if he tried a second time, Harry would break out a ruby and make a shield using strength energy himself. Though since the juggernaut was literally running on fumes, Harry doubted it would come to that. Marco's strength gave way and he collapsed onto his back. Harry took out a diamond and used lumos on it before putting it back in his inventory and conjured a scanning type mandala in front of his hand. Harry kept it up and said, "He's still conscious. Give it another 30 seconds. Logan didn't say anything but watched the juggernaut closely. 23 seconds later Logan said, "He's out." Harry nodded and threw his last crystal into the air and cast finite incantatum on the whole area. Thankfully it was easier to break your own magic than it was another, so the last of Harry's energy was enough to remove the glass, the gas, and return the ground to normal. Harry then collapsed. Ping. Magic path has risen to rank 40. Harry smiled at that. His magic path had reached 39 and his tech path 32 while upgrading the danger room, and now his magic path had reached the next threshold. A small airborne drone flew over from the mansion and took a moment to observe Harry, Logan, and the unconscious juggernaut on the ground. 10 seconds later the continuous sirens halted and the lockdown was removed. Harry was curious about something and used his Shinix to send a mental message to Rogue. "Come outside, there is something I want you to try." Harry put a hand in his bag to use as a cover while he pulled out a potion from his inventory. After removing his sense of taste from his settings, he popped the top and downed the whole bottle. It was something of an experimental magic recovery potion. Usually he would just wait to recover naturally instead of wasting such a potion, but the ward he'd secretly placed around the institute picked up 2 intruders, not 1. The ward was set within the perimeter and zigzagged a bit to avoid the hidden turrets, but was placed safely enough to avoid harming the electronics of the area. 5 minutes after Marco entered, someone else did as well and was still inside. Harry's ward would stick to the intruder, so he knew that person had entered in spite of the lockdown and was currently heading down the basement stairs. Forge came over from the mansion first and said, Harry, you fried every camera and the targeting system of every turret in 100 feet. What did you do? Logan flatly summarized. Kid turned the ground into a hole filled with gas the Juggernaut couldn't climb out of. After he passed out, the ground changed back. Forge did a double take and said, oh, well, alright then. Rogue came out along with a few of the kids who followed Forge after the lockdown was removed. Harry said, hey Rogue, ask this guy if you can use his powers, the same way you did earlier. Rogue did her own double take at the unconscious brute and said, wait, really? You think that'll work? Harry shrugged. If not, you can erase it the same way, right? Rogue nodded and took off her glove and walked over to Marco's shoulder. She asked, what's his name? Logan was watching with interest and said, Kane Marco. Rogue took in a breath and said to the unconscious man, all right Kane Marco, please let me use your power. She waited a moment before touching his shoulder. She held it there for another moment before retracting her finger and closing her eyes. When she opened them, Harry was the first to ask, well, Rogue said, it sorta worked. Marco here is only okay with me using his power to wreck stuff and fight people. Like he won't let me use it to build hospitals or help little old ladies cross the street. That sorta thing. Harry nodded. That fell in line with his theory. Rogue was a sorcerer, but one who made contracts with humans instead of gods. Gods wouldn't let mortals use the powers they lent for things they didn't approve of. Marco, for example, was also unable to use his strength constructively. If he tried, the power of the gem would wane until he did something destructive again. Sidorak was a destruction-loving god after all. Harry had considered letting Rogue make contact with the Crimson Gem itself to see if she could directly forge a connection to the Elder God, but becoming Sidorak's avatar was not a good thing and using the power through Marco was far safer. Though if Marco lost the gem, Rogue would lose the ability to use that strength as well. Dr. McCoy showed up with some syringes he had been working on since Marco's arrival and pumped the unstoppable force with enough drugs to keep him out until Thanksgiving. As the crowd dispersed, Harry headed over to the intruder who was now making their way back up the stairs. It seemed the person had just paid a visit to Cerebro. Harry hid behind a corner and when the student he didn't recognize passed by, Harry sent out a stunner directly at his head, dropping him to the ground. Harry used telekinesis to lift the kid up and take him to another room where he opened the kid's unconscious eyes and used legilimency to find out what he was doing. Harry smirked at the results. This was Mystique. She had released Juggernaut as a distraction to break into Cerebro so she could get in and copy the tech. Forge had revamped it several times and it was a very sophisticated piece of technology. Harry sent another mental message to Rogue, got another second room from the foyer. While Rogue was on her way, Harry took the hard drive from Mystique's bag and took out his own computer screen and keyboard from his inventory. He easily connected to and copied the content and was trying to decide the best move next. Rogue showed up and asked, who's this? Harry smiled and answered, Mystique here has been a naughty girl. Rogue's eyebrows shot up before she glanced back down at the unconscious kid and let out a sigh. She said, Mystique, please let me use your power. After a moment she touched her and released. She didn't say anything afterwards and left. Harry didn't ask. He already figured out they had a past and whatever the Mystique in her mind said, Rogue probably wasn't willing to share it. After pausing for a moment of contemplation, Harry opened up the original file of the scan and made some edits. He was surprised how much the geometry used to build Cerebro could be mapped out using arithmancy and by using the same formula, Harry figured out what to change to have Cerebro show something completely different. Harry was very satisfied. This was 2 great pranks in a single day. When finished, Harry put the hard drive back and moved Mystique over to where he knocked her out. The hall was empty since everyone was checking out the fallen Juggernaut. Harry stood her up using telekinesis and cast Renervate along with a mild Confundus charm to make Mystique ignore the feeling that she had just been knocked out and awoken. Harry was thankful he'd cast the stunner at her head earlier and not the backpack or else the hard drive would have been wrecked. Harry actually wanted to have a good look at Cerebro for a while but doubted he would have been allowed access even if he asked politely. Mystique shook her head and continued walking out, making her way to the exit. As someone with a very high vitality and the ability to control her own cells, her resistance to magic was much higher than a standard muggle or mutant reaching as high as a normal wizard. However, Harry was quite a bit above normal wizards himself so his magic was perfectly effective against her, making it almost too easy to deal with her. If she were a video game class, she would be a warrior or monk. High resistance against physical damage but nominal resistance against the arcane. The only reason she had resistance against Shinix was because she'd manually adjusted her mind against it. Perhaps if given time, she could do something similar with magic, but until then, 1 stunner was all it was ever going to take. Since the fun was over, Harry returned to his workshop. He'd learn later that Scott's team had quickly found out from the Brotherhood that they were only a distraction while Juggernaut was destroying the mansion. They tried to return but the Brotherhood had put a lot of effort into stalling them. When Scott's team arrived and found that there was no damage and the Juggernaut was out cold, they were appropriately speechless. When Xavier returned and had been briefed, he requested Harry to come over to his office to speak with him. Harry entered and found Xavier alone with another pile of paperwork before him. Xavier gave an honest smile when he saw Harry and said, I saw Rogue earlier today. She touched me without harm. Harry smiled at that. Seemed Rogue had figured out how to turn off her powers already. Xavier continued, she informed me of your part in the training of her powers and I have come to a decision. Xavier pulled out a file stamped with an official logo of one of the nearby mental institutions and opened it before sliding it to Harry. Inside was a picture of a young girl with brown hair and red bangs. Xavier said, "Her name is Wanda Maximoff. She is a mutant gifted with a power she can't control, a power that greatly resembles the magic you've shown yourself capable of. I'd like you to meet her." Chapter 38. Chapter 38 Schooling with the X-Men. The first official school week started at the institute and Harry attended a class with each of the instructors while getting to know the various kids who returned from summer break. Harry's experience with traditional schools ended when he was 9, but he didn't find Hogwarts all that different from normal teachers. From what Harry recalled, standard teachers would introduce information from a book, then get the students to employ various means of memorization through lectures, notes, assignments, quizzes, homework, and exams. They taught uniformly, and if the average student reached the minimum acceptable standards of comprehension, the teacher was considered competent. Harry felt he should have seen this coming, as each of the teachers were from the first X-Men team, but each had a completely different style of teaching. Domino, also called Ms. Thurman, was the math teacher. Her own mutant power, according to her anyways, was luck. She demonstrated this by flipping 10 coins in the air and having them all land on her desk. Heads up. Harry's senses told him it appeared to be a subconscious-based psionic field that telekinetically made adjustments to things within her line of sight that were advantageous for her. The subconscious was a lot more powerful than the conscious, so it was a very impressive and subtle power. Rather than give the class 100 math problems and have them solve them all, she would give a single math problem and then tell a story about something that happened to her during a mission or event which had measurements that matched the story. After going over the story and solving the problem while doing so, she'd ask the class if a specific variable was different, how would the outcome have changed both in the equation and the effect in the story. Rather than just memorizing procedures, this got everyone to use all of their brain in thinking over the procedure itself, making it easier to retain. Dr. McCoy taught biology and chemistry. In his first class, he brought out a tank with a meter-long squid and said the squid would be his teaching assistant. This caused everyone to laugh until Dr. McCoy left the room and the squid started talking and telling them what they would be going over that day. Dr. McCoy's preferred method of teaching was to draw out the innate curiosity towards the wonders of science to get his students interested in them and become more invested. This didn't work on everyone, of course, but it was certainly far from boring. World history class with Colossus, known in class as Mr. Rasputin, was actually one of Harry's favorites. The man's distinct Russian accent actually made the subject easier to listen to, and Colossus did not teach history in any way Harry was familiar with. Rather than reading off each section of history piece by piece and expecting the kids to memorize it, Colossus divided history into a series of choices made by specific people and specific countries and the consequences of those choices. It was an approach Harry had not seen before, but made history itself more interactive, as Colossus would often ask the class if a specific person made a different choice, what could have happened as a result. In addition to making history easier to remember this way, it also showed everyone the long-lasting impact of choices and their consequences. Not that it was always large things. Colossus had a great sense of humor and would often point out small and humorous facts in history and their consequences as well. Like the fact that Benjamin Franklin was not allowed to work on the final draft of the Declaration of Independence because they feared he would slip a joke in there no one would notice until it was too late. Or that time when Napoleon Bonaparte and his top brass were thoroughly defeated by an army of 3,000 bunny rabbits which used military tactics against Napoleon and his men because they were farm-raised bunnies instead of wild rabbits. Or the fact that Hitler's over-reliance on quack doctors and their drugs made him terribly gassy. Mr. Rasputin's class would often be filled with laughter, and Harry was not the only one who enjoyed it. Ms. Monroe didn't allow others to call her Storm in the classroom and taught English class, which everyone had to attend at various grade levels, though she also taught several other languages as electives. What was interesting was that a large number of students had noticed that she became more expressive and overall happier looking, which made her classes more fun to attend. Although she had not yet mastered the tricks written in the text Harry had given her, just what she had already accomplished allowed her more ranges of emotion without affecting the local weather patterns. Forge didn't care if you called him Professor Silvercloud or not, but anyone who goofed off in the physical sciences class would suddenly find themselves volunteered for a practical demonstration of whatever they were teaching that day. There were times when Forge would actively look over the class, hoping for a volunteer to present him or herself, meaning the students were by far the most well-behaved in that class. Something Harry liked about Forge was that the man himself didn't like science books. Such texts had pictures and graphs and pages of information, but retaining such information through such media was difficult for most types of learners. Instead, every other class Forge would switch back and forth between a live demonstration and a lab environment. Basically, I'll show you first, then you do it. There were still students who had problems learning like this, but they often found themselves volunteered to assist in the following class, where Forge would thoroughly demonstrate through the volunteer how the subject they were having issues with worked. By the end of class, it was guaranteed that the volunteer would certainly comprehend the subject. Students who had trouble on their own would either have to study harder or risk getting volunteered. Physical education was of course taught by Logan. Sometimes the age groups would participate in sports like basketball or volleyball. Sometimes the groups would be thrown into the new and improved Danger Room, where Danger herself worked with Logan to make sadistic obstacle courses and hazardous environments for the students to navigate through. Harry didn't make too many friends in that class when they found out he was the one that helped Forge upgrade the danger room. Mr. Worthington taught economics in a somewhat similar way to Mr. Rasputin in that he gave histories of various companies and the decisions those companies made and the consequences of those decisions. And of course, Professor Xavier taught a mandatory ethics class. In addition to requiring the class to familiarize themselves with specific source material, Xavier would often introduce an ethical dilemma a mutant with a specific set of powers might face and have the class discuss the long-term and short-term consequences of the various choices that could be made. Xavier and Forge were the only two teachers who you could use the professor title with because they had both produced works which had been published. Dr. McCoy had as well and could technically be called Professor McCoy, but he preferred the doctor title. 3 days into the classes, the teachers unanimously decided to change Harry from student to teacher aide. Most of the teachers had such aides and they could always use more. After a round of discussion, they decided Harry would rotate between them. Technically he should have been assigned to just Dr. McCoy or Forge, but the group discovered Harry simply knew too much. In his first class, Aurora asked Harry to list off how many languages he knew and then proceeded to quiz him on them. Although his accent needed work because he hadn't been to the regions, his pronunciation and ability to read and write each of the languages he listed off were all acceptable. He even listed off languages she didn't speak herself. Aurora didn't even know snakes had a language and had never heard of Gallifreyan. Similar situations occurred in the other classes and Angel and Domino agreed they had nothing to teach him when it came to their own subjects. When asked about it, Harry told them he was interested in teaching as well and wanted to learn more about the teaching styles of the X-Men. That was the final say which led the group to agreeing to share him as an aide. Of course, since Harry actually had things he could learn from Dr. McCoy and Forge, they had priority. It was decided Harry would follow a 2-week rotation schedule where Tuesdays and Thursdays, Harry would assist Dr. McCoy in the morning and Forge in the evening. The other days of the 2-week schedule would have Harry assist the other teachers on various days and assist with setting up lesson plans and grading papers. This would continue for 1 or 2 semesters and next year Harry would be the full-time assistants of Dr. McCoy and Forge and work on his own degrees. Rather than go to a college or university, both Dr. McCoy and Forge were fully accredited to give out master's degrees if Harry studied under them, and if Harry produced a doctoral thesis that got published afterwards, he could theoretically get his own doctorate without stepping foot in a college. After classes, the library study group would still form and Jean introduced Harry to everyone who easily took over for study head, though she became a bit worried when she learned of Harry's transition to teacher's aide. Jean asked, "Are you okay with staying with the study group? I mean, you're already pretty busy." Harry easily answered, "Teaching is one of the things I like and something I could easily see becoming a career for me, so this sort of experience is actually pretty good." Jean didn't look convinced and conveyed telepathically, "Are you sure you're not just saying that to get me to like you?" Harry showed some real surprise and smiled back before thinking aloud, "I really do like teaching, but now it seems I really can't stop. Since I've found that I really like you as well, I see no reason to stop doing something that helps you like me." Jean rolled her eyes and turned away to hide her light blush and thought, "As if you needed help." Then her eyes shot up and she turned back to see Harry's smile, which made her realize she'd conveyed that instead of thought it to herself. And she promptly moved over to another desk. Harry's smile didn't wane as he pretended to ignore it and continue answering questions in the study group. It didn't take long for the returning members to figure out Harry was a grade A know-it-all but didn't speak with any condescension when asked a question or when walking someone through an answer. Some of the kids were a bit peeved when they asked Harry a direct question and he showed them a different way to find the answer instead of just giving it to them, but they couldn't exactly fault Harry for that. Saturday morning of the following weekend had Logan driving a nondescript car with Harry and Xavier to the West Salem Mental Institution. Harry had gone over Wanda's file and her reported abilities. High-tech machines going on the fritz or exploding in her vicinity, structures breaking down or shifting when she got emotional, and strange phenomenon occurring when she fought back. These all looked like a severe case of accidental magic of a magical child. The thing was, however, the Macusa never came for her, meaning her magic didn't register. She wasn't a witch. At least not in the traditional sense. Harry was the first, and as far as he knew, only magical to awaken an X gene. There was no record of Wanda dying at some point, meaning she was likely a mutant with a power that resembled witchcraft rather than a witch herself. There were other possibilities, of course, so Harry wouldn't jump to a conclusion before meeting her. Logan explained how on the way, they would be checked for anything and would not be allowed to bring anything inside. Harry considered this and took out 2 smoky quartz from the bag he'd brought along. In front of Xavier, he made one glow and vanish back into his inventory and cast a disillusionment charm over the other, causing it to become invisible. Harry showed his empty hand to Xavier and asked, "Should I bring this along to use as an example when I meet her?" Xavier experimentally poked the invisible stone and after a moment of consideration answered, "Yes, I think that would be acceptable." After parking outside, Logan got Xavier in his chair and the 3 headed into the facility. Once they reached the gate, Xavier said, "Don't make sudden moves and follow us inside. They won't question your age if you don't bring it up." Harry nodded back. A 15-year-old was not an acceptable visitor for someone considered to be dangerous inside a mental institution, even if that someone was also 15. On paper, Xavier and Harry filled out the forms correctly and were properly documented, but Harry's admittance should have been rejected. The only reason Harry could be brought here was because Xavier was willing to use his own powers to break the rules for him. Harry figured this decision did not come lightly, or else Xavier would have introduced him to Wanda much earlier. Harry considered the reason Xavier was willing to do so at all had to do with the quests Harry had done since arriving. Harry's original recruitment quest stated he had to show Xavier his magic, something he had not intended on doing earlier. Since then he used magic to upgrade the danger room and had successfully taught Rogue how to use her powers, which Harry stated resembled magic he was familiar with. 3 quests with 3 results which combined gave Xavier a great deal of confidence Harry could in fact assist Ms. Maximoff with her control problems. The Ancient One and Harry knew the quests would have a further reaching impact than just the success of the required task. This meeting was certainly one of those impacts which to Harry meant that the quest giver wanted Xavier to ask Harry to help Wanda. Logan remained outside the security area because he didn't get along with metal detectors, and Xavier was led to a small room to wait for Wanda while Harry silently followed. After 30 minutes, the door was opened and a teenage girl who looked more than a little sleep-deprived wrapped in a tight straitjacket was brought in. The moment she entered, cracks started forming in the room and the door itself seemed to be heating up as it were going to melt. The guard moved to restrain her, but Harry interrupted by grabbing and holding onto her instead. She flinched back and struggled to get away, but not out of fear for herself. Her magic started attacking Harry and she knew he would get hurt if he didn't let go. The guard knew this too, and the sight of Harry hugging her sent a lot of alarms off in his head and he moved to get her away. Xavier noticed Harry's calm demeanor and motioned to the guard, "Wait." Wanda's magic sent the equivalent of a dozen spells with curse-like effects into Harry which should have twisted or burned his organs, shocked his skin, or broken his bones. Wanda kept trying to get away, fully aware of what was happening, but Harry didn't let up. She said, "Stop, you'll get hurt." Harry answered back, "Haven't you noticed yet? I'm completely fine." Harry's magic defense didn't see much use, but it was still much higher than his physical defense. Wanda's magic wasn't weak, it was at the level of a 6th or 7th year student, which was remarkable considering the fact that she had no training, but Harry barely received any damage from it, and what little he did receive was too small to observe and healed almost right away. Wanda froze for a moment and paid attention to Harry for the first time, noticing that nothing happened to him no matter what her powers did to him. She met his gaze and didn't see any fear, only a kind smile. Even Xavier didn't completely lack fear in her presence. Her power was simply too dangerous and would make anyone unconsciously wary. Even her father, the self-proclaimed mutant messiah, feared her and put her in this place due to that fear. Xavier smiled and motioned to the guard, "You can go, everything is under control." The guard didn't argue and left without saying anything else. Harry released Wanda but took her hand and held it tight. In her eyes Harry saw a terrified little girl crying for affection she could never have, which was why Harry wanted to show her she wasn't dangerous. Wanda didn't move to shake off Harry's hand, though she was still confused by it. Xavier said, "Wanda, this is Harry. He is a mutant as well, and I believe he can help you with controlling your powers." Wanda's frown seemed almost instinctive. She couldn't believe anyone was able to help her, and she retorted back, "How can he help? No one can help me." Harry put the hand containing the invisible smoky quartz behind him where only the professor could see it and had it glow with lumos for a moment before he put it back in his inventory. Wanda hadn't noticed the glow behind Harry's back before Harry waved his hand over the door and walls, which seemed to slowly fix themselves into their prior state with his reparo charm. The room they were in had no cameras since Wanda's power would bust any within, so Harry didn't have to hide his magic here. Harry turned back to Xavier and said, "Can I talk with her alone for a few minutes?" Xavier nodded. He already had quite a bit of trust in Harry, and Wanda was still staring bug-eyed at the door Harry fixed. When Xavier left, Harry put a silencing charm around the room and transfigured Wanda's straitjacket into a dress. He then conjured 2 comfy chairs, and for his finale, he conjured a corgi which appeared in his lap and gave Wanda a happy bark. Wanda fell back into the chair from shock and after a moment asked, "Is this real?" Harry considered it while petting the fuzzy smiling corgi in his lap and answered, "That's a complicated question. But at the moment, the answer is yes." The corgi let out another happy bark. Harry continued, "Although not exact, I can pretty much do what you can do, except under controlled circumstances. With training, you can also do what I can do." Wanda stared at the smiling corgi staring back at her, and when Harry released it, the fuzzy doggo jumped into Wanda's surprised lap and curled up. Wanda unconsciously started petting it and couldn't help smiling. Harry continued, "There are a few reasons you can't control your power. The main reason is that you have no training, but the training else would be difficult because you are tied down by your hatred of your father." Wanda froze at the mention and the chair she was in started to smolder. The corgi in her lap stiffened, which reminded her there was a dog with her and forced her to take a breath to prevent herself from harming the conjured dog. Harry shook his head and said, "The file I read on you says they've just been telling you to get over your anger of him, but your powers are fueling your memories of him, which are in turn fueling your powers. I'm sure you've tried, but without a miracle or a telepath to deal with the memories, staying here isn't going to help you control your powers." Wanda wanted to get angry, but she didn't want to hurt the doggy, so instead she started to cry. "I know. I've always known. I want out of here. But no one is willing to take me away. I'm too dangerous." The corgi in her lap got up and climbed over her chest to set its head at her neck while laying over her torso. Wanda continued crying and wrapped her arms around the dog, who knew she wanted a hug. Harry paused to go over what he could do. First of all, it was obvious why the universe wanted her trained. Her magic had Than's signature. She was the one Than intended to make a vessel. Harry hadn't caught it at first, but her file actually said she and her twin were born on Empty Wound Daggery, the place then spirit got sealed the last time he tried to take over Earth. That meant it was likely the Elder Demon God had a direct hand in the shaping of Wanda's power. From what Thin had mentioned about how chaos magic and wizard magic were pretty much the same, Harry understood now why Wanda's magic looked like wizard magic and why she was so powerful without training. Although it was the safest option, the idea of harming Wanda was never considered. He would ensure she was trained and able to resist Thin should the two ever meet. The only question was how to do so effectively. Harry spent a long time going through each possible method and their long-term implications before eliminating the other choices and arriving at the best one. After unpausing, Harry said to Wanda, "How would you like a 100-year-long vacation?" Wanda's crying stopped and she looked up at Harry in disbelief and directly asked, "Are you crazy?" Harry answered, "There are several ways to dull your anger, but most of them require messing your head in ways that neither I nor Professor Xavier would ever consider an option. The only other method left to deal with that kind of anger is time. I have a way for you to live 100 years of peaceful time, doing whatever you want, and it will only take the span of a few moments. In that time, I could train you or teach you or just take you on walks on the beach and fill your head with experiences of you living a life. Once you've lived long enough, the memories of your father will be diluted enough to fade the bite of anger you have for him." Wanda frowned and said with heat, "I will never forgive him." Harry replied, "I'm not asking you to, but you can't let your anger at him determine your future. He is not nearly important enough to have such a large effect on your life." That caused a light chuckle from her, which Harry thought was quite the improvement. After taking a few more moments to pet the corgi, she asked, "How would we do it?" Harry smiled and said, "I'll come back in a week and we'll do it then. I need to get some things for prep work." Wanda looked disappointed she would have to wait but accepted it. Harry asked, "Is there any place you'd really want to visit or live for that time?" Wanda thought about it and answered, "Surprise me?" Harry nodded and got up from his chair. The corgi faded into the air as it was dispelled and Wanda got up just as the chair she was under faded as well. Harry noticed her depressed expression, looked over her attire before saying, "Take off your shoe." Wanda gave a questioning look but did so. Harry cast a series of spells on it before finishing with a satisfied smile. Harry said, "Come here, Twinkie." The shoe suddenly transfigured into a corgi. Harry petted it again and said, "Back to bed, Twinkie." The corgi returned into a shoe and Harry handed it back. Harry explained, "Using those commands aloud will change your shoe to and from a corgi." Wanda raised an eyebrow and asked with a smirk, "Twinkie?" Harry smiled brightly and answered, "Golden on the outside and white on the bottom." That and corgis are in fact Twinkie-shaped. Wanda rolled her eyes but her smile brightened and she put her shoe back on. Harry said, "I'll need to return the jacket too." Wanda sighed and nodded. A moment later her dress returned to the form of a straight jacket. Harry removed the silencing spell and opened the door to invite Xavier back in, who had been chatting with the guard. Harry said, "I have a way to help Wanda get control over her powers and even help her anger, but it will take a week to prep, so I'll need to return next weekend." Xavier looked over Wanda and instantly noticed a change in her demeanor. She almost looked like she had been smiling earlier. Xavier still asked, "What way is that?" Harry answered, "I've already discussed all the details with Wanda and it is a way I know you would approve of. However, the actual means is something I can't tell you." Xavier looked over at Wanda and asked, "And you feel it is safe?" Wanda sighed and said, "It sounds 1,000 times better than anything else I've tried. And if what he says is actually true, then I think it actually has a real chance of working." Harry noticed Xavier wasn't exactly intruding on his mind but was checking his overall mindset to determine if he was lying. Xavier more than anyone knew the dangers of quick fixes. Of course there was nothing quick about this particular fix, it only seemed that way. Xavier seemed satisfied and said, "All right, we shall return next week. Can you behave yourself, Wanda?" Wanda unconsciously moved her foot and said, "I think I'll be fine, Professor." With that, the group departed. Harry was aware that her heavily enchanted shoe would still fry every electronic within a meter of her foot, but since her power seemed to do so anyway, no one would really notice. The enchanted corgi had a constant silencing field around it so others would not hear its barks unless they were within a foot of it. There was another spell that would activate when someone came close and would cause the corgi to automatically change back into a shoe and slip itself back onto her foot. Of course, a shoe is not a fantastic material to stick such heavy enchantments to, but the effect would at least last a few weeks and give Wanda some company. Harry wasn't sure if he could stop himself from breaking her out if she was just going to go back to being all alone again. Rather than return to the Institute, Harry said he wanted to head to New York to get the materials needed to help Wanda. Xavier and Logan knew Harry didn't need a car to get around, so they let him out on the road. Harry found a spot out of sight and opened a silver portal to a back alley near the New York Sanctum Sanctorum. The alley had a few sorcerer spells that kept others from hanging around it, as it was the standard arrival destination of sling ring portals for the area. Harry used his inventory to change into his robes before knocking on the door and waiting patiently. An African man in a fitted martial gi answered the door and Harry said, "Good morning, Master Drum." The master smiled and said, "Apprentice Harry, welcome back. Is this a social call?" Only the Ancient One knew Harry had reached the master level and their pair had no intention of spreading that fact around. Harry shook his head, which caused Master Drum to smile back. "It never is," before gesturing for him to come in. He said, "I heard about that matter with the demons. Most impressive." Harry answered back, "The group I'm working with is very skilled. I'm learning a lot from them as well." Master Drum nodded back and returned to his own affairs, leaving Harry to head over to the portal to Camartage. Sure, Harry could portal directly there, but that was a bit rude, and since he was here to ask a favor, formalities should be observed. Especially since the Ancient One couldn't see Harry coming, so it really would be rude to come over unannounced. After making his way in, he asked Master Wang if the Ancient One was available. He was one of the few who knew that Harry was invisible to the sight of Ancient One and confirmed she was at the temple. Harry then asked politely if he could check if she had time to speak with him about a sensitive matter. Wang returned a few minutes later and escorted Harry over and left the room. Harry took a steaming tea set out of his inventory and poured a cup. The Ancient One took a sip before giving a light smile and stating, "You must want to ask me something if you're using this tea. It is not so easy to find after all." Harry nodded and poured himself a cup. To those he trusted, he was an easy man to see through, as he disliked deception not based around a prank. Harry sat down and directly stated, "I found Thin's future vessel and want to borrow the Eye of Agamotto to speed up her training." Although it looked like the Ancient One was taking her second sip of tea, she had in fact only put the cup to her lip, fully expecting Harry to say something outrageous. This meant Harry didn't get any good spit takes, which his prankster soul always insisted on trying for. The Ancient One ignored the attempt and put down her cup and asked, "How will the use of the eye be of assistance?" "Well, I wanted to invite her mind into my own and with the eye, use mental infinity." The Ancient One's eyebrows shot up and she revealed a slight smirk. Mental Infinity was not a training tool, it was an attack spell she created using the eye and occasionally used on Harry when they sparred. Very few beings had resistance to time magic, and Mental Infinity sped up the speed of thought by a billion times. One would think this granted the target an advantage, but in fact it would practically cripple the target. The body would be able to process such fast intentions and would not respond to the will to move. A person hit by the spell couldn't do much more than stand still and pray it ended. The spell itself was quite cruel to use on anyone without a highly developed mindscape, as it would trap them within their own body in a frozen world where they could do nothing but wait for the effect to end. Less than 3¼ seconds under the spell would have the user experience 100 years of frozen time. Harry, however, was so used to pausing, 100 years of silence didn't affect him much. He'd already figured out the trick to moving his body in real time with accelerated senses and could dispel the effect when used on him. The Ancient One got his permission before using it on him, of course, and learned that when Harry reached level 300, he would likely start fighting monsters made of time energy, so he would likely have to face such effects eventually, and the sooner he started to adapt, the better. The reason, of course, Harry never used such a means to train himself was that pausing was infinitely superior and didn't require the Eye of Agamotto to use. However, Harry could not take the minds of others while pausing, even if he used multiplayer with them. This was the only means he could think of. Harry explained the details to the Ancient One, and after a moment of contemplation, she answered, "No, I will not let you borrow the eye." Chapter 39, Chapter 39 Time in a Bottle. Harry sighed but accepted it. He had some backup plans as well, which was why he said he needed a week to prep, but he'd hoped he'd be able to do it the easy way. However, the Ancient One continued, "Rather, you don't need to borrow it. As you have regained the use of portals, just tell me when you plan on performing the mind training and I'll come over and use the spell myself." "Really? Of course. My main concern is that if young Wanda's mind enters your own, her body will be left undefended. The chosen vessel of Thin should not be left empty so easily, even if only for a moment. Although unlikely, it would be prudent to ensure nothing happens, so I will be present to cast the spell and ensure nothing occurs." Harry let out a breath of relief and said, "Thank you." He had considered that as well, and many of the materials he intended to fetch were for that very purpose, but there was a difference between a week of prep and having the Sorcerer Supreme watch over you. Together they went over the various details and made a plan. Harry left Camartage by portal and spent the next 2 days sightseeing. The Mindscape copy perk allowed him to perfectly replicate areas into his mind, and since he was going to have a guest, he wanted to make sure she would not get bored. Harry spent a few hours as a snowy owl with a Notice Me Not flying around New York and eventually got a copy of almost the entire city in his mind. He returned to human form and entered many of the places of interest to copy the interior as well, and visited every beach in 100 miles. Thankfully it was only August and the water was cool but not cold. Harry used a portal to visit several nearby forests and a lot of scenic areas. He made sure to copy the sky next to the beach when the sun rose, which, although not as great as a sunset, was still pretty good. After that, Harry used a portal to return to Tibet and used his fastest flying speed as an owl to fly directly to the mountains and copy them directly into his mind as well. He flew along the hiking routes and tourist sites and spots of interest. Last but not least, Harry used a portkey his godfather, Sirius Black, had handed him and used it to go to Black Island, his godfather's vacation island. Sirius wasn't there, which didn't surprise Harry, as the married man was quite busy fixing the wizarding world. Last Harry heard, the man was going to be, against his will, elected Minister of Magic. After getting a copy of Black Island, Harry used a portal to return to the Institute. Something Harry liked about his new portals was that because he didn't have to swing his hand around to open one, he could make one even as an owl. Once things had settled down, he would take the time to visit every part of the world he could think of, so he could copy the nice things into his head and be able to open a portal there when needed. The next week passed by mostly uneventfully as he followed his new routine except for one encounter. One morning when Harry woke up from his 4 hours of sleep, Jean telepathically conveyed to him, "You actually died? You said it got better." Harry smiled. He wondered how she would react to that one. He thought back, "You saw the stuff after that, right? It did get better." "Well, I mean yeah, but you died. Usually you don't come back from that?" Harry thought back, "Didn't you come back from death a little before that?" Jean's shock could be heard through her thoughts. "How did you know about that?" "A little birdie told me." "Keep reading, Jean, it's all there." Harry could swear he heard a sigh before she conveyed back, "All right, but I'm skipping the endless video games and TV time. I feel a bit weird reading the personal stuff about your parents, so I'll be skipping that." "That's fine. Skipping the whole tutorial won't change my story much." "What? No way. This gamer stuff is actually pretty interesting. Can you really respawn if you die?" "Yeah, but other than using it as a tasteless prank, I'd rather not demonstrate that." "What kind of prank would require that?" Harry sent a visualization of himself having a serious conversation with someone he didn't like and then exploding in a shower of gore in front of them, leaving the poor victim destined to require endless therapy for the rest of their days. Jean sent back, "Yeah, that would be pretty tasteless." Jean and Harry continued to chat about various subjects both strange and mundane. Jean finished reading about the tutorial and started into Hogwarts on Friday. The following Saturday morning, Rogue went looking for Harry and after finding him leaving the kitchen, she grabbed him and gave him a giant hug. Harry hugged her back of course, and when she released he asked, "Not that I mind, but what was that about?" Rogue smiled back and said, "Cody Robbins. The boy who I put into a coma. I found out he woke up." Harry smiled back and said, "That's great. The connection between you two has been severed so there wouldn't be any lasting effects." Rogue nodded and looked down for a moment before gently asking, were you planning on doing anything today?" Harry honestly answered, "Well, I was planning on spending a 100-year-long vacation with a girl I met for the first time last weekend so I could help her learn to control her own powers." Rogue looked more than a little flabbergasted at that and Harry added in jest, "Why, did you want to join us?" Rogue froze for just a moment and nodded, "Yes, I wanna go." Harry did a double take and asked, "Really? It's 100 years, you know. She has some issues that can only be resolved with time, so I'll be using magic to accelerate time and put 100 years of training and experiences in her head to help her out." Rogue looked a bit pensive and replied, "Well, I need training too. I've already asked most of the X-Men to lend me their powers, but using them with each other is gonna take me a long time to master. Can I practice as well if I were to go too?" Harry considered it and determined that she would in fact be able to use her powers in his mindscape. Time would be slowed but not halted, meaning the connections she had to others would not be interrupted. That meant she could also practice the use of her powers. Harry was not one to go back on his word, so he asked for confirmation. "Are you absolutely sure? You won't be able to quit halfway through, you know." Rogue nodded with certainty, "I'm sure." Harry let out a sigh and said, "All right, wait in your room and I'll call for you in 2 hours." Rogue smiled and hugged Harry again before heading into her room. Harry wondered if she knew what she was getting into but figured it would be all right. Although Harry wouldn't be able to kick her out if she got tired of it, he could freeze her mind until the time ran out, so there was no real harm if she wanted to come along. Giving Wanda some female company wouldn't be a bad thing either, since they had a number of things in common. Harry stopped for a moment and considered inviting Jean, but decided against it. The faster she removed the seals on the Phoenix, the better, and spending 100 years training with a locked mind would not do her any favors in the long run because she would not be able to unlock her own mind while it was in Harry's. There were a few variations he could try that might help, but after going over them one by one, Harry determined it still was not to her benefit to be included in this. Once more, Harry was driven over to the mental institute with Xavier and Logan. Harry considered telling Xavier he needed a few minutes alone with Wanda for his plan to work, but he could not think of a way to ask that of him without Xavier jumping to the wrong conclusion. Instead, he decided to wisely remain silent and explain the details when they got there. The group went through the same procedure as before, with one difference. One of the doctors showed up to meet Xavier and stated that Wanda seemed to have shown great improvement in the last week. Harry loudly thought a message to Xavier that he wanted imparted to the doctor. Xavier complied and told the doctor they had a breakthrough last week and he should expect even greater improvements very soon. The doctor looked both skeptical and interested. A wait-and-see approach. They returned to the small room from before and 10 minutes later, Wanda entered. This time the door didn't melt. When she saw Harry had actually come, she looked like she was going to cry as she couldn't believe he had actually returned to fulfill his promise. Harry hugged her again, which she enjoyed this time, and Harry said to Xavier, "This could either take 3 minutes or up to 10 minutes depending on the resistance her powers puts up, but I have confidence that when finished, it will become manageable. That being said, it would be better to have a bit of privacy." Thankfully Xavier didn't take it the wrong way and agreed, leaving the pair alone and closing the door. He was probably satisfied by hearing Wanda's progress. Harry knew of course that spending a week with a loving corgi you didn't have to feed or clean up after would do wonders for any grumpy person. Harry created an illusion of Wanda sitting cross-legged and Harry sitting behind her with his hands against her back in what looked like some kind of treatment. That was to be used if anyone opened the door's viewing window and peered through. Harry then transfigured Wanda's jacket into a red long coat with a t-shirt and jeans beneath it. To the side, Harry opened a silver portal and walked through. Wanda followed behind into what appeared to be a ritual chamber. Harry then opened another portal which showed Rogue's room. She looked shocked at the silver doorway, but upon seeing Harry on the other side, didn't hesitate to jump in. A moment later, the robe-wearing, shaved head, Ancient One walked in and said, "Hello friends of Harry, I'm his teacher, and I'll be helping out with this little project." Harry stated, "Thanks again for agreeing to assist. This is Wanda and Rogue. Rogue asked for training as well and will be coming along. That way Wanda will have some female company." Rogue introduced herself and Wanda reciprocated. Rogue also asked if she could use Wanda's powers, and Wanda, not really knowing what to say, answered yes and got a light finger touch from Rogue. She figured if Harry was going to train Wanda, then if Rogue could use her powers, she could get training as well. Harry said, "We don't have much time, so please sit down in the center and we'll start." The ritual room was perhaps the most magically guarded room in Camartage and used to both prevent entry and exit. Harry could only create a portal into it because he had a key. Otherwise the room was rather impregnable. Of course it was overkill for what they had in mind, as they were not actually performing a ritual, but neither had a problem with overkill when it came to placing safeguards against an elder demon god of chaos. Wanda and Rogue sat down in the middle of the room. Had they actually been performing a ritual, there would have been lines of candles and stuff, but all of that was placed at the side, so the room looked more like a storage room in a church than it did a place where mortals formed connections to that which was better left untouched. Harry concentrated his shinix and connected to both Wanda and Rogue. Rogue accepted the connection, and after a moment, Wanda did as well. Rejecting wouldn't have been difficult, but both knew Harry didn't have any bad intentions. This was a variation on the Ancient One's trick of pushing the astral form out of a body and directly into the astral plane. Harry could not do that, but he could drag a person's astral form into his own mind if he wasn't blocked. Once he successfully pulled both Rogue and Wanda into his library, he signaled for the Ancient One to cast the spell. After making several hand signs, the center of the eye she wore opened and the time stone within was revealed. A wave of green light shot out towards Harry and the girls as the spell was cast. Although the Ancient One had never let Harry use the Eye of Agamotto, he knew what it really was. It was a common misconception that the eye was a tool that used the time stone to manipulate time. It was not. The time stone doesn't need assistance to manipulate time. What the eye actually did was hide the stone and limit its power. When the eye was closed, Harry could not feel the time energy contained within even if he stood next to it. Even when opened, the time energy that should have rushed out like an endless sea was reduced to a meager trickle. Of course it was possible to override those limits and safeties and use the full power of the time stone with the eye, but doing so wouldn't be any different from broadcasting to the whole of the universe that there is an infinity stone present and invite those who sought them out to come and take them. All magic had a price after all. The use of the eye was no different. Wanda and Rogue found themselves in Harry's library, and Harry himself materialized within and said, "Welcome to my head. Please leave all questions until after the tour." Harry showed them to a door which opened to reveal a round room that contained many silver portals. These were imitations of Harry's portals and a setup that others wandering around his head could use to go into the different areas. Harry showed the portals for New York, London, Tibet, Hogwarts, the tutorial village, Black Island, and many scenic areas such as grasslands, beaches, forests, and mountains. He took them to New York, which looked identical to the real thing, and stopped at a coffee shop where Harry ordered tea and asked what the girls wanted. Wanda asked for hot chocolate and Rogue asked for a muffin. Moments later the waitress came over with their orders and a check, and Harry began drinking his tea and said they could start with their questions. Wanda started, "Is this real?" Harry smiled and said, "Depends on your definition of real." Rogue asked, "Is it like the Matrix?" Harry considered it and answered, "Somewhere between the Matrix and a video game. The people around us are NPCs. Please treat them as you would real humans." Wanda asked, "Why?" Harry replied, "Habits. We'll be here for a while, and if you treat them as anything other than real people, you may find it difficult to treat actual real people as real people when we leave. Consider it practice." Rogue looked at the check that the waitress left and asked, "How will we pay?" Harry handed both girls a wallet which contained an ID card, credit card, and library card. Harry's library card could not be taken by someone who would use the information gained from his mind poorly, so he waited to see if both could claim it and was more than a little relieved that they both took it without issue. Had they been unable to take the card, his training sessions would have been far more awkward. Harry said, "Again, the act of paying is just because we're going to be here a while, and if you spent 100 years going to a coffee shop without paying, you might forget to pay in real life." Wanda was still looking around and having trouble accepting that something so real was literally all in their heads. Harry got out some folders and passed them out before stating, "Now although we have 100 years, that doesn't mean you can do nothing the whole time. Again, if you spend 100 years doing nothing, you'll find it hard to get motivated to do something back in the real world. So we are going to keep busy. Here are your schedules." Both opened the files and they had what looked similar to a school schedule. Neither felt this was going to be fun. Harry's first goal was to help Wanda catch up on her studies and basically teach them both until they had nothing else they wanted to learn. Wanda wasn't thrilled, but Harry basically explained that the entire point of this, in addition to making use of the valuable time, was to keep her mind occupied for so long, she basically forgets to think about how much she hates her father. Wanda accepted such a feat would truly take a long time and decided not to argue with it. The first thing that Wanda discovered which surprised her was that her powers worked just fine in the mindscape, and when she got angry, her powers reacted the same way. Although the people she hurt were not real people and the places she destroyed were not real places, they still looked and felt real. Harry also insisted that the damage done be left as is, and when she mastered her power she could use those locations to practice repair magic later. Harry could have fixed it himself of course, but having damage done vanish as if it never happened without her own input was not realistic, and Harry didn't want them to get used to the idea that things they broke would fix themselves later. The reason Harry had to put so much effort into logic was to ensure that logic was correctly imprinted into Wanda's head. If a user of chaos magic could not tell the difference between fantasy and reality, things would go downhill fast. Harry's answer to this was for them to consider the possibility that everything was fantasy, but regardless, treat it as if it were reality. As long as Wanda treated everything like reality, even knowing it could be fantasy, she would not be able to unconsciously trick herself otherwise. Of course, as was the same with reality, Harry was still unaffected by anything Wanda did, so he would often remain near her to remind her that she wasn't dangerous. At some point Rogue had taken Wanda to the side and they toured New York without Harry and spent many hours performing the dreaded girl talk. Harry did not in fact spend every moment monitoring the girls, so he would do his own thing when the pair went off on their own. Due to the fact that most malls, stores, and restaurants were either faithfully copied or at least imitated to the point they were functional, the pair would not be deprived of things to enjoy. Harry's own project for the next 100 years was something he had been considering since his decision to use gemstones and tech. Harry decided to invent a new branch of science. None of the current branches could properly explain extra-dimensional energies, and to avoid using the word magic, Harry had to properly formulate the observable reactions of these energies which could be reproduced by others. Of course, the observability of such energies would require technology which didn't exist yet. Harry would make it eventually, and when he did, people would be able to measure energies from other dimensions and learn how they interact with different fields and materials. Harry had something of an innate understanding of the energies already, but he needed something that could be taught to others and tested using machines. Of course, the only materials capable of interacting with these energies naturally would either be rare and esoteric materials like vibranium, or the gemstones Harry's company would alter using sonic technology. As long as no one else cracked material manipulation using sonic tech, Harry's company would have the monopoly on the source of all materials needed for what would soon be the world's most advanced tech. The reason Harry needed to write out the science though was because he needed the science behind his tech to be understood by others so it could be approved of and sold. It was fine if others knew how his stuff worked and how to make it themselves. Unless they got the key materials from Harry's companies, they could only twiddle their thumbs. Of course, there would be those who tried to buy large amounts of products containing those specialty materials in order to use them to build devices of their own designs, but Harry had his own plans, or should he say, pranks for such people. In addition to basic and advanced subjects, Harry taught both girls occlumency. Chaos magic was close enough to wizard magic for Wanda to use it, and since Rogue could use both Wanda's powers or Jean's powers, she could use them to build up her own occlumency as well. Harry also encouraged both to acquire a hobby. Both tried cooking, but both decided it didn't agree with them. Wanda decided to try painting and found she liked it, while Rogue took up reading and playing video games, much to Harry's amusement. When Rogue got bored, she would fight the copies of monsters Harry faced in battle meditation, or she would fight Death Eaters. It hadn't taken her long to find Harry's life story, the one Jean had been reading in his library, and after a few weeks she finished the whole set, catching up to Harry's present. Harry noticed that once finished, Rogue would often go find the copies of the various foes Harry had defeated, such as the monsters from his battle meditation or the Death Eaters or that basilisk. When she was feeling adventurous, she would try facing the Black Dragon and die a noble death against it. She once complained to Harry that she wanted to face Voldemort or the Mandarin, but Harry said that Goose technically killed the former and Harry barely survived the latter, so his mindscape copy didn't have enough information to reproduce them. When channeling the powers of others, there were some powers she could channel completely and other powers that she could only use a fraction of. She could use 100% of the Juggernaut's strength, but she could only teleport a fraction of Cut's max distance. She could use Bobby's power without issue, but Evan's spikes were uncomfortable to use and less effective compared to when she stole his powers. Scott's power was ironically rather easy to use, but Logan's was a bit moody. In order to use Logan's healing factor, she had to heavily focus on using it, which prevented her from multitasking while healing. Harry determined the difficulty was based on the origin of the power. Scott's, Bobby's, and Marco's powers seemed to all be extra-dimensional. She was just connecting to the same extra-dimensional source, using them as a reference. Kit's teleporting was something Harry suspected was influenced by his bloodline, something Rogue did not share with Kurt. Spike and Wolverine both manifested their powers from their own biology, meaning Rogue's body had to mimic their cells, which was harder than channeling energy. Harry suggested practicing with Mystique's power, as getting used to the feeling of her cells changing should help use the powers of others. Rogue found that if she shapeshifted into Logan, Kurt, or Evan, using their power was much easier. But she wanted to use her power in her own form, so that became her goal for practicing. With Harry's help, Rogue also practiced chaos magic. Wanda didn't particularly like her powers, so Rogue helped Harry figure out the properties of it so Harry could create a proper training routine when Wanda finally came around. 5 years after entering the mindscape, Harry called Wanda over and told her, "It's time to practice the use of your power." Wanda frowned at that and asked, "Why now?" Harry asked, "When was the last time you thought of your father, and when was the last time your anger caused an accident?" Wanda thought about it and realized it had actually been a full year. Occlumency hadn't been easy to learn, but she had eventually used it to do as Harry said and removed her father's ability to infuriate her. Harry was right about that. He wasn't important enough to be allowed to affect her life so much. Wanda looked at the painting she had been working on and said, "I just want to learn how not to hurt people. The only person I want to use my powers to tear up is my father, but since there is only one of him, I don't see much of a point in training to use my power in other ways." Harry sighed, but it wasn't his decision to make. If someone wanted to live a peaceful life, that was their choice. Rogue heard about her decision later and took her out for some more girl talk. When they returned, Wanda agreed to get trained and do everything she could to become stronger. Harry wasn't going to ask what they talked about, but he was happy she made that choice. Thanks to trial and error with Rogue, Harry had created what he considered the perfect training regime for chaos magic. Much of it he created with his subconscious, as his mind contained both the Book of Vishanti and the Dark Hold, the later being the premier text on all things chaos magic. Harry initially wanted to remove Than's signature from Wanda's magic and have her imprint it with her own. This would completely cut off Wanda's potential as the perfect vessel for Than, but Harry easily found out how impossible this was. It was not just a mark left on her by some remnant of Than, it was an actual piece of himself he personally placed in her at the moment of her birth. Through some testing, Harry determined that Wanda's mutant power should have been a form of energy manipulation. Than had likely seen this as the perfect opportunity and used it to change the energy she could manipulate from normal energy to chaos magic. Because of this, there was no way to change what she could manipulate from chaos magic to wizard magic. However, since Plan A wasn't viable, Harry decided to go with Plan B. If Than was going to give her a great talent and potential at manipulating chaos energy, then why not have her perfect it to the degree she should be able to overpower Than himself if she faced him? Of course, that didn't include facing him in his own realm, but outside of that, any version of Than she met would not be capable of absolute control over chaos energy. If Wanda's control could exceed or at least match whatever avatar of Than she encountered in the future, she would not be overwhelmed and would have a fighting chance. Of course, Harry would never intentionally allow her to confront Than, but there was no harm in planning for the worse. Harry's lesson plans for chaos magic was a step-by-step introduction on pretty much everything that chaos magic could do and an explanation of how it did it. Since most aspects of chaos magic were identical to wizard magic, Harry used that as a base. According to Harry, wizard/chaos magic was based on probability manipulation and reality overriding. For example, the basic unlocking charm. There was a set non-zero probability that someone would forget to lock a door. The unlocking charm set that probability to 100% and overlapped that with reality, thus causing the door to unlock itself in order to correct itself to a state where someone had forgotten to lock it. Without a lock that was enchanted to resist such an effect, the unlocking charm could potentially unlock any door that was capable of being unlocked. The key to using chaos and wizard magic was not manually searching for that probability when casting the spell, but allowing your feelings and instincts to guide you to that probability and use that as the target for overlapping reality with. Once Wanda got the hang of it, she took to chaos magic like a fish to water. It only took a few months to catch up to where Rogue had been, and after half a year, Wanda was the one teaching Rogue. The reason she was teaching was that Harry insisted on it. He plainly stated that few things allow someone to learn more about something than teaching it to someone else. By figuring out the best way to teach the less talented Rogue how to use chaos magic, she was getting a cleaner feel for it herself. After they had finished with their base schooling, their schedule changed to include daily outside vistas, hiking trips, days in the city, walks along the beach, or even just making a bonfire in the woods. The girls started to really show how much they were enjoying spending time around Harry, and when someone enjoys being around you, it wasn't hard to enjoy being around them. 20 years after the start of their training, Wanda's skill at chaos magic officially surpassed Harry's skill with wizard magic. Wanda was capable of using an unlocking spell without any excess chaotic energy in the spell. This meant that Wanda could use the spell on an electronic lock without frying it and have it actually open. Even Harry couldn't do that. Harry's overall power was of course much higher, but his precision lost out to Wanda's. 50 years into the venture, Rogue and Wanda both asked to go on a date with Harry. By now Wanda had also read the books on Harry's life, and they both knew he was in love with Jean, but they also knew they had fallen in love with him as well and knew the feelings were mutual. Harry was surprised that they stated they would be willing to share Harry with Jean, and Rogue stated that she knew for a fact that as long as Jean got enough love, she would be willing to share Harry as well. Wanda admitted that the only reason she worked hard to master her powers was because Rogue had told her that in the future, Harry would have many powerful enemies trying to control him and would need help to face them. Paying Harry back for everything he'd done for her was her motivation to become stronger. Harry had no way to argue with that and agreed to take both on some dates. Over the years they grew closer and he fell in love with them both. Though since all three were virgins, Harry had no frame of reference in his mind for going further than making out, which was fine for the girls. Harry stated he wouldn't cross that final line until he was 16 and they had moved out of the mansion. When asked why, Harry stated that Logan would definitely know every time they did it, and Harry didn't feel comfortable with that. Rogue immediately agreed, as Logan was basically the surrogate father figure for many of the students, and the fact that he would know every time they got busy would kill the mood dead. Over the course of many years they learned that Harry had many flaws of his own. He had become over-reliant on pausing, and because he didn't pause this whole time, he would often spend too much time thinking over a trivial issue or would remain indecisive about something which should be a straightforward choice. Harry had never had an outsider's perspective look at him for some long and until then had remained unaware of those issues, and Harry resolved himself to get better about those issues. At the end of the 100 years, the trio found themselves back in the ritual room. Ping. Scholar path has risen to rank 45. Rogue looked around and asked, "Is it over?" The Ancient One answered back, "Yes indeed." Rogue and Wanda both walked over to the Ancient One and gave a bow before saying together, "Thank you for taking care of Harry." She nodded back with a smile and said, "You're welcome to visit the sanctum in the future. But now, it's best you were off." The trio nodded and headed off. The portal to Rogue's room and the mental institute were still open, so they left and the portals closed. Wanda took a look around the small room and waved a hand to dispel Harry's illusion of the pair that had remained. She took a deep breath and then dispelled the transfiguration on her straitjacket, which coiled back around her, binding her arms in place. She was fully capable of removing the jacket at any time. She was also fully capable of teleporting using her own version of apparition, and no locked door could hold her. Due to all this, she could leave any time she wanted to. Harry, however, insisted she take the time to consolidate her own mind and feel out her powers before rushing to use them at the level she could towards the end of the 100 years. Before opening the door to let Xavier back in, Wanda gave Harry a pleading puppy dog look he had grown so used to over the years and lifted her up to give her a passion-filled goodbye kiss. Technically this was his first kiss not in the mental plane, and Harry didn't have any complaints about it. When Xavier entered and saw the pair, he had to do a double take on Wanda to make sure it was the same girl. Xavier had an innate passive sense of empathy and could feel many layers of emotions off the various people around him. The Wanda in front of him was a completely different person than the woman behind the door 5 minutes ago. Harry smiled at his shocked expression and said, "Complete success, Professor." Wanda nodded and said with a light smile, "He's right, there won't be any more uncontrolled outbursts or accidents." Xavier smiled at her confidence and said, "I cannot tell you how pleased I am to hear that. As long as that proves true, I can promise that you will only remain here for another month or two for observation before you will be released." Wanda nodded and replied, "That's fine. I've got all the time in the world ahead of me, so a month or two won't kill me." The guard listening in couldn't believe what he was hearing. He was also having trouble seeing the smiling girl in front of him as the same teen who had nearly set him on fire half a dozen times over the last few months. He would be more shocked later when he received an apology from Wanda for her behavior and a genuine thank you for helping her. The remaining staff who would receive the same apology would be just as surprised. Chapter 40. Chapter 40 Worst Nightmare. Over the course of the next 2 months, Harry had 2 projects to complete. The first was the typing of what would later become textbooks for his new branch of physics, metaphysics. Technically, the current definition of metaphysics was considered a branch of philosophy without ties to actual reality. Harry intended to change that. Sure, he could have gone with extra-physics or outer physics, but this term would be used to quantify the abilities of metahumans, so he'd rather use this and have others change the definition of metaphysics than use a term that made superhumans look alien. Harry's second project required a weekend spent at one of his companies assembling the world's first sonic screwdriver. There was a lot of overlap in the 2 projects, and the coding required to make the screwdriver was only possible after Harry had assigned the needed constants, variables, and formulas associated with the various energies that the machine would be dealing with. Now it wasn't actually a screwdriver, nor could it fit in the palm of a hand or a pocket. In fact, it was the size of a semi-truck and could only use nonlinear sonic oscillation harmonics to change the material physics of gemstones, and only gemstones. But the properties that could be gained by gemstones that had undergone sonic treatment were non-reproducible through any other means on the planet. The first batch of treated gemstones were emeralds Harry would take back to the Institute. Harry had shown the goblins the step-by-step requirements for assembling the machines, and Harry's scholar path shined through in that he could perfectly teach them how to properly assemble and use it in a single weekend. The emeralds were the key to Harry's second project, his hardlight hologram disguises for some of the students. The reason that only the Danger Room had a hardlight platform was that the unique materials required to create the hardlight system obtained from the Shi'ar-designed spaceship were all used up in its creations. These modified emeralds, however, could act as replacements for the core components of a hardlight generation platform which couldn't be acquired anywhere else on Earth. In addition to creating hardlight disguises for the kids, Harry also intended to install a hardlight platform in Forge's classrooms. A number of his demonstrations and labs required assistance, and he never had enough helpers for that, so Harry wanted to have his lab generate them for him. Harry already obtained permission from Danger herself to install a quantum entanglement connection from the Danger Room to Forge's classroom so Danger could act as an assistance. Forge could also reproduce material-intensive experiments through a hardlight demonstration rather than burn through funds to redo the same experiment over and over. After a month and a half, Wanda Maximoff was successfully released from the mental institution and enrolled into Xavier's school. Wanda's release was expedited through several donations made to the institution as praise for successfully healing such a profound case. Not that Xavier was aware of that. Harry wasn't going to leave it to chance, and he ensured Wanda's progress report leaked and that the doctors got lauded mountains of praise, which in turn made them want to show off her success even more, which in turn lead to more donations. Her release had a nice, fat donation to tie the whole thing together and also sped up a process that should have taken 6 months to a quarter of that. Because of Rogue's power, she always had her own room, but when Wanda arrived, she immediately kidnapped her for a roommate, which Xavier was happy with. He had noticed both Wanda and Rogue's personalities had changed drastically, but there were changes for the better and both involved Harry Potter, though Xavier was unaware of the details. Harry used some precise magics to recreate some of the artwork Wanda had been most proud of from the 100 Years. Not all of her favorites though. Wanda was explicit that some of those works were meant for their own enjoyment and not for the eyes of others. One of the larger changes to Harry's personal schedule since then was that he would now spend 8 hours a day in bed instead of 4, but he only slept every other day. He would spend either 8 hours or 4 hours each night using battle meditation, which he had been slacking on lately due to lack of time. The reason was that both Wanda and Rogue had expressed interest in using the multiplayer function, so Harry agreed to use it when he reached level 220. However, at his current rate of about a level every 2 days, they would likely have to wait until December. He was almost to level 200 at the moment. Harry Potter. Level 199, age 15. STR 275, AGI 310. Int 450, WIS 410. Luck 20. Warrior Path rank 27. Scholar Path rank 45. Magic Path rank 40. Tech Path rank 32. Business Path rank 22. Crafting Path rank 23. Dragon Path rank 6. Chinook Path rank 20. Harry often had to resist looking at his stats and paths because it was too easy to distract himself from his current projects. Sure, he wanted to get his Warrior Path, Dragon Path, and Chinook Path to rank 30, but they would not grant any great assistant in a fight. Although his Dragon Path gave him enough strength to break the old danger room, if he wasn't holding back, he could do even more with strength energy. And of course anything he could do with brute force, he could do even better with spells. The so-called unstoppable juggernaut against Harry's magic was completely defeated after all. Both Wanda and Rogue agreed to keep their relationship with Harry a secret until Jean was on board. They wanted Harry to spend the nights cuddling with them, but in a house with a prankster teleporter, 2 telepaths, and a man who could smell what you had for breakfast yesterday on your breath, keeping such a thing a secret was impossible even with magic. Harry made it up to them though by setting a few adamantium plates inscribed with Time Lord math into their closet to enlarge the space inside by 10 times. Since it used block transfer computation instead of an undetectable extension charm, there was no exotic energy within, so it was safe for tech. Wanda quickly started back up on her art in her free time, and Rogue occasionally went to the mansion's game room and destroyed anyone who went up against her. How she suddenly became a god of games was something no one could understand. The Halloween of the year was on a Wednesday, and though many were too old to trick or treat, no one had the heart to stop them. Especially Kurt, Josh, and a few of the other kids who would not earn a second glance this night except for someone shouting they had an awesome costume. Wanda and Rogue dragged Harry out to have fun as Jean had just turned 16 and had volunteered to babysit her niece and nephew for their first trick-or-treat with her parents. Scott had stayed at the mansion to supervise a Halloween party, but Harry's girlfriends did not want Harry's first Halloween in the States to be dull, so they took him out to see the sights and decorations. Wanda's costume was a cute witch's outfit complete with a wide brim hat and toy broom. Rogue wore a vampire outfit with a cape and fake fangs. Harry's outfit was chosen by the girls. He wore a fur vest and had a blonde wig with a large prop bastard sword tied to his back, making him Conan the Barbarian, the hero of some of the world's oldest stories, which may have been true. The trio were on their way to view more Halloween decorations when a fireball flew past them and a certain teen with a near Australian accent shouted, "I must be getting rusty to miss at this range." Although Harry wasn't a speedster, his observation and information processing speed was far superior to a normal human. When Pietro Maximoff ran down the block and right up to him, Harry's eyes followed him easily enough. It was too dark for the silver-haired teen to notice that as he ran past Harry and nabbed the belt Harry wore containing all his gemstones. Pietro stopped next to the ones Harry recognized as Lance and John. Off to the side were 2 he did not recognize but had heard of. A scrawny lad crouched on a wall with larger than normal eyes was the one called Toad. Next to him, a teen nearly as wide as he was tall, was Blob. Of course, Pietro, Lance, and John were called Quicksilver, Avalanche, and Pyro respectively. "Oh, look what I got! Emeralds, and diamonds, and rubies, oh my, ahahaha." Pietro noticed Harry and Rogue in costume, but he hadn't taken a second look at the witch currently glaring at him. Pietro shouted, "Not so tough without your shinnies, a pay to play." Harry shook his head with a smirk and said, "I doubt you're going to believe me, but I'll go ahead and say it. This is the part where you should be running away." The group paused for a moment before they each reeled back and started laughing. Pyro flicked his lighter and created a fireball while calmly asking, "And why would we do a thing like that? I've got you right where I want you, and it's payback time." Rogue coughed loudly to get their attention as she was already getting peeved that she was not being taken as a threat. Lance turned to her and said, "Check out our costumes, little Miss Runaway." The light from Pyro's fireball stretched over the group and revealed each of them were in their Brotherhood costumes, and none had any exposed skin other than the face. They even appeared to be wearing gloves. Pyro laughed haughtily and remarked, "You're not gonna be able to touch a single hair off our heads." The group continued to laugh and walked closer, slowly encircling the group. Their laughter died with a single sentence. "Hello Pietro." Wanda's voice was smooth and clear, the kind of voice Harry knew he could listen to every day for the rest of his life. It was also very distinct, and though the male Maximoff twin had not heard it in years, he instantly recognized it. Pietro's eyes widened in shock at horror once he got a look at the face hidden under that wide-brimmed witch's hat and he stuttered out, "W Wanda." Wanda smiled at his terror and waved her fingers before him. Pietro's costume suddenly expanded and then twisted around him, wrapping him from head to toe and causing him to fall over. This froze the rest of the group. She then looked at Pyro's fireball and threw a bolt of red energy at it, causing the ball to explode in Pyro's hand, setting his gloves on fire and giving him actual burns and causing him to cry out in pain. He dropped his lighter and used his ability to snuff out the flame, but with a wave of Wanda's hand, Pyro's own clothes transformed the same as Quicksilver's and in a moment he was bound as well. Avalanche rose his hands up as if he were lifting a great mass with a poor posture and the ground started trembling. Wanda threw a half-dozen marbles from her pockets and with a wave of her hand, they transformed into chickens which landed in front of Lance. The Terrakinetic sneered at the chickens and once more began to make the ground quake. The moment it did though, the chickens simultaneously turned their heads to face Lance and shouted together, "But GOK." The chickens started flapping and flew over the trembling ground directly at Lance's face. When he realized they were aiming to peck out his eyes, he released his hold on the earth and started running, but the chickens were very fast. Blob started charging as well, but another 4 marbles thrown led to the immovable teen being surrounded by 4 wolves, each snarling at him with glistening teeth. Seeing the direction of the wind, Toad decided to exist, stage left. He was unable to avoid Wanda's attention however, and with a scarlet bolt of light, he was turned into a large toad that fell to the ground and gave a large croak before continuing to hop away. Harry watched the show with a smile. The marbles were a gift to Wanda from himself. They had a core of life force infused iron within a crystal sphere and were very easy to transfigure into live animals. They even had a timed portkaya to return them to her room if they ran too far off. Of course there were limits. When it came to conjuring or transfiguring animals, the closer the probabilities of that animal actually appearing at that location were to 0, the harder the spell was to cast. So it was easier to conjure a wolf than it was a rhino unless you were in Africa. The creature with the lowest probability of appearing Harry was able to transfigure something into was a mammoth. He couldn't conjure or transfigure something into a dinosaur. Neither could he conjure or transfigure something into a creature that has never existed on Earth like many of the creatures he faced in battle meditation. The screams of agony of Avalanche in the distance and the cries coming from Blob from the pain of being bitten and the fear he will really be devoured by wolves had Pietro and John panicking. Wanda walked up to the bound pair and said with a smile that was not a smile, "Hello brother, it's been a while. I'd ask you how you feel, but being bound and unable to move while surrounded by people you're afraid of and lacking any control over your life is something I know far better than you, so I won't bother to ask." Pietro started rambling, "Wanda, wait, please. It wasn't my fault, I didn't want to leave you there, but father didn't have a choice." Wanda's not a smile strained as she continued, "I will have some choice words for father next I see him. All it took for me to learn to control my powers was someone who wasn't afraid of me. Father, your self-proclaimed leader, was too much of a coward for that. I don't know how any of you can justify following that hypocrite." Wanda's hand rose menacingly over Pietro and she said, "Now, shall I start with you, or perhaps your friend?" Pietro cried out, No, wait, please, I'm sorry." Wanda theatrically stopped herself and like a perfect actress appeared to be giving it some thought. She said, "Well, I'm not sure if I believe you. How about this? Let Rogue here touch you for a moment. If she feels you really are sorry, then I promise to let bygones be bygones. I'll forgive you and you won't have anything to fear from me." The sound of Blob screaming made Pietro quickly answer, "Yeah, sure, no problem." Rogue walked up to Pietro with a smile and bent down to touch his face. However, she stopped for a moment and said as if thinking aloud to herself, "Actually, I have some homework I gotta get back and finish, so I need to get back to the mansion fast." She then looked back at Pietro and sweetly asked with a smile, "Pietro Maximoff, can I use your power?" Pietro nodded and said, Yeah, anytime." Rogue touched his face for a moment with her ungloved hand and walked over to John and said, "Didn't you say I wouldn't be able to touch a hair of your head?" Wanda said, "So what should I do with you? Turn you into a pumpkin? Maybe set you on fire and disable your power? Oh, I know, I think I'll make you permanently bald." John had been getting more and more pale with each threat and at the last he shouted like a little schoolgirl, "No, please no, anything but the hair." Rogue said, "You know, we'll need to put out the pumpkins when we get home, can you offer him the same deal?" John noticed that Pietro didn't look winded when Rogue touched him, and had he been thinking clearly, he would have thought more of that than simply it wasn't a bad choice. John ended up agreeing to give Rogue his own powers as well in the end. After touching his face and plucking a strand of hair out of pettiness, Rogue finished up and Wanda said to Pietro, "Next time you see father, tell the coward to walk the long way around me if he ever sees me, and I'll consider leaving his punishment until a later date." Harry casually walked over to where Pietro had initially been bound and picked up the belt of gemstones he dropped at the time and put it back on. Harry bent down to him and said, "I remember you saying last time we met I was as crazy as your sister. Wish I'd asked you more about her then because I think I'm in love. Quicksilver, the fastest mutant around, froze at Harry's admission and a moment later, his eyes rolled back and he fainted. Rogue and Wanda smiled and Harry walked back up to the group and they headed out. Harry almost had to wipe a tear of pride from his eyes after witnessing the pair in action. Not from how they dealt with the Brotherhood, but because of their prank on Pietro and John. Harry had of course taught them his love of pranks over the course of 100 years and they had many pranks wars between them and were far more experienced than most when it came to the art of pranks. He was so proud of them. Of the Brotherhood's powers, Pietro and John's were the strongest, which was why Rogue had telepathically gone over this plan with Wanda before they started. Blob's was alright but it was practically a weaker version of Juggernaut and Avalanche's powers were far too destructive. Of course they could have knocked them out and taken the power after asking the unconscious mutants, but Rogue stated that although the power was not affected, the effort was. She realized it took far more effort to use Mystique's and Juggernaut's power than it did any of the X-Men who consciously agreed to give her the use of their power. As for the Brotherhood themselves, they would be fine. The transfigured wolves and chickens had illusion spells on them which made the damage inflicted on them feel and look real. Blob would look covered in blood and be in a lot of pain, but when the spell ended, neither he nor Lance would have any wounds and eventually Toad would turn back to normal along with John's and Pietro's costumes. On the way back home, Harry had a bad feeling. Rogue and Wanda noticed it of course and they returned to the mansion wearily, but nothing unusual occurred. A number of the kids had returned as well and were comparing their loads of candy with one another. Kit's pillowcase was the largest. He looked like a demonic Santa Claus carrying that thing on his back. Harry spent 4 hours sleeping and another 4 using battle meditation. However, in the middle of his session, the battle meditation broke and Harry saw an image of Jean being manhandled by men in suits and crying, calling out for help. Harry quickly left his room and went over to Xavier's door. Before he reached it, the door had opened and Xavier was on his way out with a worried frown. He noticed Harry and said, "You felt it as well then? I'm heading to Cerebro now to check on Jean." Without another word the pair quickly descended the mansion levels and entered Cerebro. Xavier put on his helmet and searched for Jean's mind. The map of the world displayed by Cerebro would zoom in on an area then zoom out as if bounced off. It would zoom in again on a different area and then zoom out again. Xavier's frown deepened and he commented, "I cannot get a lock on her. She was going to stay at her parents' house. Let's see what happened." The map zoomed in on New York and quickly to her parents' house where both parents were standing at their door speaking with 2 others who from some of the images appeared to be police officers. Xavier zoomed in on the minds of the twins and more images surfaced, their memories of what had happened. Images of trick or treating and Jean's smile while in a princess costume. Then 4 strangers showing up and fighting against Jean. She fought back but was overwhelmed. The group ignored the twins and grabbed her and left. Harry's own glare at the men in the images turned to ice. Jean had been kidnapped. Xavier felt Harry's rage and said, "We'll find her, Harry." Harry said with steel in his voice, "You won't have to." He took out a diamond and made it glow in front of Xavier before making a portal and entering it. The portal led to the area Jean had been kidnapped. There were still a few police at the scene and damages caused from the fight, though most of it from the assailants. No one noticed Harry snooping around and no one noticed the red mandalas he conjured to scan the area. It didn't take long for Harry to determine the group of kidnappers had a teleporter. The problem however was that it was a Sonic teleporter. Such people could create a map of shortcuts in their head and instantly travel from one to another in what would be mapped out as a zigzag route, though they would arrive instantaneously. However, Harry had no way to track such a teleporter. Harry paused to consider his options. First of all, why didn't he get a quest? A quest would include a map pointer which would let him track her down in minutes. Even on that orphan's quest there was a map pointer to the orphanage, which was why Harry snooped for and found the hidden transfer magic circle. Why not now? After a few considerations, Harry realized why. He had a way to track down Jean, but that method would have permanent consequences. Without a map pointer, he would absolutely use that method. Perhaps those consequences were not a bad thing, so he wasn't given a shortcut around them. If that was the case, there was no need to hesitate. Harry made another portal into Wanda and Rogue's closet. He wasn't going to go directly into their room no matter the emergency, though he did knock loudly on the closet door. Moments later Wanda opened the door and said with a bit of an edge, "This had better be good, Harry." Harry said, "Jean has been kidnapped. I need yours and Rogue's help to find her." From her own bed Rogue said, "Give me a minute." The pair got ready and Harry made another portal to the mansion's back area that was lined with trees. Harry already got out a backpack from his inventory while in the closet and filled it with materials so the cameras in the area would not see him using his inventory. Harry pulled out 5 large crystal spheres from his backpack and placed them in a circle. He then got out a large jar of pure, white sand and began to pour it while walking around the circle. Though the pour looked sloppy, Harry was using telekinesis to make perfect lines between the crystal spheres. After drawing out the pentagram for a base, Harry then poured out a dozen thinner, more intricate lines and symbols. The formation Harry was making used the same arithmancy as the designs of Cerebro. It was a Sonic enhancer powered by magic set specifically to locate a specific mutant Sonic. If Harry had any of Jean's blood, he would not need this, but he had been reluctant to ask that of anyone up to this point. He fully intended to get samples of everyone's later once this was over. Once the sand formation was aligned, Wanda began chanting and charging the crystals with her chaos magic. Although she had not seen such a magic circle before, she had spent decades studying rituals so understood its use very quickly. Her own talent in art made her own rituals very precise and formidable, and the pair had many discussions on rituals and ritual magic. Harry sent Rogue a telepathic message of what to do and she agreed without issue. Once the charge was complete, Harry entered Rogue's mind and together they found the echo of Jean that would often let Rogue use her powers. Harry said to it, "Jean, your body has been kidnapped and is being hidden just like those kids at the orphanage. We're going to amplify your connection to find you through that connection." The echo of Jean looked surprised and then worried before giving a firm, conviction-filled nod. She knew what this meant, but it was a better alternative than being kidnapped. Within his own mind, Harry concentrated on the phoenix flame and its resonance. The echo of Jean did not react, but Wanda caught the feeling though the ritual as her K and activated the ritual. She directed her charged powers into Harry and into Rogue, which then entered and supercharged Jean's echo. The pentagram on the grounds lit up like the sun, but Wanda held her concentration, using her power to amplify the connection to Jean. The echo of Jean suddenly lifted into the air and a red glow surrounded it. The piercing cry of a phoenix echoed. Harry followed the resonance and opened his eyes. "I've got a lock." Harry swatted the air and opened a portal. On the other side was Jean, bound to a metal table and screaming. A metal helmet was strapped to her head. Harry jumped in and paused. He did his best to calm himself with the promise of what he was going to do. The room had 2 floors with an observation deck and a stairway up to it. No windows, but the number of vents on the upper wall suggested the location was underground. The people around him were dressed in lab coats and none of them seemed particularly interested in Jean's screaming. Especially the one standing next to her with the large needle that Jean was screaming at. Harry memorized the position of every person in the room and after unpausing, shot each with a stunner in under 5 seconds. Harry looked back through the portal and saw that both Wanda and Rogue were exhausted. He couldn't see through portals while pausing, so he had to enter before scouting. After every person in the room fell down, Harry ran over to Jean and transfigured the iron bands holding her down into clay and ripped them off without hurting her. Jean met Harry's gaze the moment she realized what happened and she wrapped her arms around him and started crying. Harry would have found the fact that he princess carried her after rescuing her while she was dressed as a princess a lot more ironic were the situation not so humorless. As he walked her over to the portal, he cast a gentle sleeping spell on her and handed her to Rogue, who could easily carry her using one of her powers. Harry said, "Take her to McCoy and clean up here please. I'll clean up on this side." Harry had absolutely no emotion as he said the last line and as the portal closed while he remained on the other side. Neither Wanda nor Rogue questioned what he was going to do.